The Dawn Age is the earliest known era in the history of Westeros, stretching back into a time before recorded history, ending roughly 8,000 years before the present day. Almost everything we know about this period comes from myths and scattered evidence, making it one of the most mysterious periods of time in Westeros. At the very beginning of the Dawn Age, long before humans arrived in Westeros, the continent was inhabited by two races, the Children of the Forest and the Giants. The Children were small, magical beings who lived in forests, caves, and hidden villages built among trees. They worshipped the old gods, which were believed to be the spirits of nature itself, present in trees, rivers, and stones. Their sacred weirwood trees, carved with faces, served as both religious symbols and conduits of their magic. For greenseers, who were gifted individuals capable of prophetic visions and supernatural insight, the Children could seemingly see through time and nature itself. They used weapons made from wood, bone, and dragonglass, relying heavily on their deep connection to magic and nature. By contrast, the Giants lived a more primitive way of life, with them being massive, powerful beings who roamed the wilderness, wielding enormous weapons and living in small tribes. Around 12,000 years before the present day, the first men crossed into Westeros from Essos via a land bridge known as the Arm of Dorne. As they spread across the land, they began clearing forests for farming and settlement, bringing them into immediate conflict with the Children. The destruction of weirwood trees deeply offended the Children, turning tensions into a war that lasted for thousands of years. The first men held advantages in numbers, size, and technology, using bronze weapons and cavalry. The Children, however, relied on their deep knowledge of the land and powerful magic. In an early attempt to stop the human invasion, the Children used their magic to summon the Hammer of the Waters, a catastrophic event that shattered the Arm of Dorne, breaking the land bridge between Westeros and Essos and forming the Stepstones. However, the first men had already established a strong presence in Westeros, so this act did not stop their advance. As the war dragged on and the Children continued to lose ground, they turned to even darker and more desperate magic. According to ancient legend, the Children created a species known as the Others, who are also known as the White Walkers, as a weapon against the first men. In the television adaptation, we see that this process involved capturing a human and using powerful magic, including dragonglass, to transform them into something entirely new, a being of ice capable of raising the dead and wielding supernatural power. The intent was to create a force that could halt or destroy the human invaders. The Children also made another attempt to halt human expansion by using the Hammer of the Waters a second time, targeting the narrow land bridge leading into the north. This created the neck, flooding the region and turning it into a vast swamp. While this did not completely stop the first men, it made movement through the area extremely difficult. In the aftermath, some first men chose to settle in this harsh environment, eventually becoming the Crannogmen, a mysterious group that adapted to life in the swamps. After thousands of years of war, both the first men and the Children grew exhausted. Around 10,000 years before the present day, they came together to negotiate peace. This historic meeting took place on the Isle of Faces, an island located in the center of the God's Eye Lake. The island was sacred, filled with weirwood trees, each carved with a face to bear witness to the agreement. The treaty they forged became known as the Pact. Under its terms, the first men were allowed to keep the lands they had already settled, primarily the open fields and plains, while the Children remained in the deep forest. The first men also agreed to stop cutting down weirwood trees, acknowledging their sacred importance. As part of this cultural exchange, many first men adopted the worship of the old gods. The Isle of Faces itself became a holy site, watched over by a mysterious sacred order known as the Green Men, who are said to have dark green skin and antlers, still guarding the island and its weirwoods. Even thousands of years later, the island remains a mystery, hidden in mist and rarely visited. The signing of the pact resulted in the official end of the Dawn Age and the start of one of the most legendary eras in Westeros history. The Age of Heroes began roughly 10,000 years before the present day, lasting until the coming of the Andals about 6,000 years ago. At the beginning of this era, Westeros entered a fragile period of peace. After the Pact, the first men and the Children were able to coexist, and the foundations of early human societies in Westeros began to take shape. However, this peace did not last forever. The Long Night, a winter unlike any other in Westeros history, took place and lasted for a generation. During this time, darkness fell over the world for years, and the Others emerged from the far north, returning as an uncontrollable force of destruction, raising the dead and bringing unimaginable suffering to all living things. They were a threat to all life in Westeros, forcing the first men and the Children to unite against a common enemy. This alliance led to what is remembered as the Battle for the Dawn. Though details vary depending on the source, legends tell of a figure known as the Last Hero, who played a crucial role in ending the Long Night, who many believe might be the legendary figure from Essos, Azor Ahai, a warrior who wielded a flaming sword called Lightbringer. Westerosi accounts do not always mention him, but they do speak of the eventual victory of the living, as the Others were were driven back into the far north. Despite their victory, the children suffered many losses and started to disappear from Westeros. In the aftermath, one of the most important figures of the Age of Heroes emerged, Bran the Builder, the founder of House Stark. He is credited with constructing the Wall, a massive barrier of ice stretching across the northern edge of Westeros, designed to prevent the others from ever returning. According to legend, the wall was built not only through human labor, but with the assistance of giants as well as the children and their magic. According to some, Bran was named the first king in the north, as he is said to have founded Winterfell and possibly even helped construct other great structures, such as the High Tower of Old Town. Alongside the wall, the Night's Watch was formed, in order sworn to guard the wall and protect the realms of men from threats beyond it. The wall itself became lined with castles over time, beginning with the Night Fort, which has served as the headquarters of the Night's Watch for nearly 6,000 years. Meanwhile, the first men who were north of the wall when it was completed became permanently separated from the rest of Westeros. Over generations, they developed into the Free Folk, maintaining their independence and their devotion to the old gods, though those south of the wall came to view them as wildlings. Another legendary figure from this era, though much darker, is the Night's King, the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, who fell in love with a mysterious woman he found in a forest north of the wall. She was said to have bright blue eyes and skin as pale as ice, seemingly being a female White Walker. He declared himself king and ruled from the Night Fort for 13 years, committing atrocities and human sacrifices for the others. Eventually, he was overthrown by a joint effort between the king in the north, Brandon the Breaker of House Stark, and Joramun, the first king beyond the wall. His name was erased from history, and he is remembered only as the Night King. Following the Long Night, Westeros did not unify into a single kingdom. Instead, it became full of small competing kingdoms, each led by powerful families whose origins were often tied to legendary heroes. Over time, these figures became the founders of the great houses known in later history. On the Iron Islands, the Grey King became an important figure in Ironborn mythology. He was said to have slain the sea dragon Naga, taken a mermaid as his wife, and ruled for 1,000 years. He also established many Ironborn traditions, including seafaring practices. The Ironborn also entered a period of expansion, raiding and conquering large stretches of the western coastline. However, as other kingdoms grew stronger and more organized, they gradually pushed the Ironborn back to their islands. After the Grey King's death, his many sons fought among themselves, dividing the Iron Islands. In the north, House Stark gradually rose to dominance. They expanded their influence through war and alliances, eventually becoming the kings in the north. Some northern houses, for instance House Umber, united with them voluntarily. King Roderick Stark is said to have at one point competed with an Ironborn in a wrestling match, winning Bear Island back from them and giving it to House Mormont to rule. King Rickard Stark fought against the Marsh King of the Crannogmen in the Neck, and after their defeat, the last Marsh King's daughter was married to Rickard to cement the Starks' annexation of the Neck. The Starks' greatest rivals were House Bolton, men who are said to have flayed the Starks and worn their skin as cloaks, whom the Starks fought for centuries before finally forcing them into submission. In the Reach, Garth Greenhand was said to have taught men agriculture and fathered countless noble lineages, with half of the great noble houses from the Reach claiming descent from him. It is believed by some that he led the first men into Westeros during the Dawn Age, while others believe he even predated them, being the first ever human to walk the land. One of his sons, Garth the Gardener, founded House Gardener and built Highgarden, eventually uniting the Reach into a powerful kingdom. In the Westerlands, House Casterly was formed by a man known as Corlys, a hunter who tracked a lion that terrorized his village to a cave. It is said that he killed both the lion and its mate, but spared the cubs, and this pleased the old gods, so they sent a beam of sunlight deep into the cave and turned the stone walls to gold. Corlys began mining the gold and built a fort at the top of the mountain, with this fort eventually becoming the castle known as Casterly Rock. He and his descendants ruled the Westerlands for thousands of years, until it was swindled from them by a man known as Lan the Clever, who some say was a descendant of Garth Greenhand. There are many conflicting myths surrounding Lan, but in nearly all of the stories about him, he is remembered as a master of wit, deception, and strategy. He apparently seized Casterly Rock using only his wits, although how he did it changes dramatically depending on the story being told, with some claiming he used rats or lions to infiltrate the castle to drive out House Casterly. The more grounded and realistic story explains that Lan was likely a man who lived in Casterly Rock. He is said to have impregnated the daughter of Lord Casterly and married her, and from there he positioned himself as the heir. After he took Casterly Rock, House Lannister was eventually established. Over time, the Lannisters used their wealth and strategic marriages to dominate the region, forming the Kingdom of the Rock. In the Stormlands, Durin Godsfried founded House Duradon, and according to legend, he fell in love with a woman named Eleni, the daughter of the sea god and the goddess of the wind, defying her divine parents by marrying her. In response, the gods unleashed devastating storms, destroying his castle and killing all within, except for Durin, who was protected by Eleni's love. Enraged, Durin declared war on the gods themselves, repeatedly rebuilding his fortress only for it to be torn down again. After 6 castles had fallen, Storm's End was constructed, finally withstanding the fury of the storms. Some say this was due to magic from the children, while others claim a young Bran the Builder helped construct it. Meanwhile, Old Town emerged as the first major city in Westeros, ruled by House Hightower. It became a center of learning, where a guild of scholars eventually developed into the Order of Maesters. From their headquarters at the Citadel, citadel, the Maesters would go on to spread knowledge across the continent. The Age of Heroes was essentially a Bronze Age society with no unified political system. Concepts and traditions like guest rights, sacred oaths, and the belief that justice should be carried out personally by those who pass judgment all trace back to this time. Despite this period's importance, the Age of Heroes remains difficult to verify. The first men did not have a fully developed writing system, and most accounts were passed down orally for thousands of years before being recorded. As a result, many of these legendary figures and events may be exaggerated, altered, or entirely symbolic. Beginning around 6,000 years before the present day, the coming of the Andals era saw a massive migration and invasion of a new people from Essos known as the Andals. They originated from a region in Essos known as Andalos, located east of the Narrow Sea near modern Pintos. The Andals followed the faith of the Seven, a religion centered around a single god with 7 faces or aspects. These 7 faces include the Father, representing divine justice, the Mother, representing mercy and peace, the Maiden, representing purity and love, the Crone, representing wisdom and foresight, the Warrior, representing strength and courage, the Smith representing creation, and finally the Stranger representing death and the unknown. According to their own tradition, an ancient Andal king known as Hugor of the Hill was blessed by the Seven. Followers believed that Hugor was crowned by the Father himself, and most importantly, the Seven promised him and his descendants a kingdom in a foreign land, a prophecy that led them to migrating to Westeros. Some Maesters argued that the Andals were actually driven westward due to the expansion of the Valyrian freehold, who were dragon-riding conquerors taking many lands in Essos. Many Andal warriors displayed their devotion to their faith by carving the 7-pointed star into their foreheads. Driven by their faith and a desire for conquest, the Andals began crossing the Narrow Sea in large numbers, landing first on the eastern shores of Westeros. One of the most significant cultural changes brought by the Andals was the introduction of the faith. As they conquered new lands, the Andals actively suppressed the worship of the old gods, cutting down sacred weirwood trees and forcing conversions. This had devastating consequences for the already diminished children of the forest, who were seen as abominations by the Andals. The few remaining children were hunted down and killed, with the last survivors fleeing beyond the wall into hiding. The Andals' initial foothold was established in the Vale, specifically in the region known as the Fingers. Due to Westeros being divided into hundreds of small kingdoms and having an overall lack of unity, it was fairly easy for the Andals to conquer territory piece by piece. The First Men were also still relying on bronze weapons, whereas the Andals had iron and steel, giving them a significant edge in combat. They also brought a new style of warfare centered around heavily armored cavalry, early forms of what would later become knights. The beginning stages of the invasion were very brutal. In the Vale, House Royce was a main part of the First Men resistance, especially King Robar II Royce. Under him, the First Men momentarily pushed the invaders back, but when the Battle of the Seven Stars took place, the Andals achieved a major victory, with House Aaron leading them. The First Men survivors were driven into the harsh mountains of the moon, where their descendants lived on as hill tribes. The Andal leader Artis Aaron, known as the Falcon Knight, was a prominent Andal leader during the conquest. It is said that Artis flew to the top of the mountain upon a giant falcon and defeated the last Mountain King in single combat. Artis was then crowned the king of the mountain in the Vale, with the remaining houses bending the knee, and he eventually named the region the Vale of Arryn. Here, the castle known as the Eyrie was eventually constructed over several generations by Artis' grandson, King Roland I. As the Andals spread westward, they soon entered the Riverlands, establishing small kingdoms. Due to them not unifying under a single kingdom, a brutal era of constant warfare began. Some of the great First Men of this region attempted to unite against the invaders. The greatest resistance of the Andal advance was from King Christopher IV Mudd, one of the last Great River Kings. Allied with House Tully, it is said they fought 100 battles, winning 99 of them. A major victory came when Christopher defeated Roland II Arryn, resulting in his capture. He was taken to Oldstones, the seat of House Mudd, where Christopher personally beheaded him. Unfortunately for him, in the 100th and final battle, 7 Andal kings joined together in a coordinated assault against him, leading to Christopher's defeat. The Mudd dominion quickly collapsed under pressure from the Andals, leading to the remaining First Men houses to submit and intermarry with their conquerors, with Andal culture quickly taking over the area. After conquering the Riverlands, they eventually reached the Stormlands, which were now long ruled by the ancient kings of House Durrandon. After countless battles over many generations, conquering Storm's End seemed impossible for the Andals. Instead of continuing endless war, they began to peacefully integrate. Intermarriage between Andal warriors and First Men Stormlords became common, and some Storm Kings even took Andal brides. Over time, the Andals swore fealty to the Storm Kings, accepting their rule rather than trying to overthrow it. Dorne remained unconquered in the ways that other regions were due to the deserts and mountains that the region was made up of. above, making complete conquest impossible. However, an Andal house known as the Martells eventually secured lands near the mouth of the Greenblood. This region, more fertile than much of Dorne, was of great strategic and economic importance, and its control helped lay the foundation for the Martells' future prominence. When the Andals first attempted to land upon the eastern shores of the north, they were met by unified power under House Stark. The Andal warlord Argo Sevenstar led an invasion into the north, and he was met not only by the forces of King Theon Stark, who was known as the Hungry Wolf, but also other notable houses such as the Boltons, resulting in the Battle of the Weeping Water. Despite this win, King Theon knew this was only the beginning. He chose to take the war directly to the Andal homeland, sailing across the narrow sea to Andalos itself. Argos's corpse was mounted at the front of his ship as a symbol of his victory. When the Northmen reached the Andal coast, villages were burned, hundreds were slaughtered, and strongholds fell to his assault. When King Theon returned to the north, he ensured that his message would endure. The spiked heads of his slain enemies were displayed along the northern coastline to deter any future invaders. Within his own lands, he crushed rebellions, ensured internal stability, and extended his authority beyond the wall by aiding the Night's Watch in a generational defeat to wildling forces. After suffering defeat after defeat, the Andals were forced to end their conquest of the north. As a result, the north remained the last stronghold of First Men culture, continuing to worship the old gods and preserve many ancient traditions. After the Andals secured dominance in the Vale and the Riverlands, they turned their attention toward the Westerlands. When an Andal warlord attempted to establish a foothold, King Tybolt Lannister defeated him, halting the initial advance. Later invasions met similar fates, as the Lannisters and the other houses loyal to them defeated the Andals. However, unlike in the north, where geography helped play a major factor in stopping the Andal invasion, the Westerlands were surrounded by the Vale and the Riverlands, which were all now Andal-controlled territories. Later Lannister kings such as Tyrion III and Gerald II began to peacefully integrate the Andals into their realm through diplomacy. Marriages were arranged between Lannister bannermen and the most powerful Andal warlords. At the same time, the children of the Andal lords were brought to Casterly Rock. Officially, they served as wards, raised alongside the children of the Westerlands nobility. In reality, they were also hostages, guaranteeing the Andals' loyalty. However, when King Gerald III Lannister died without an heir, his daughter's husband, an Andal knight named Sir Joffrey Lyddon, ascended to power. Instead of establishing a new dynasty, he took the Lannister name, becoming the first Andal to rule as King of the Rock. The Reach is a fertile, wealthy, and heavily defended region, and it remained untouched for far longer than any other southern kingdom. The powerful fleets of House Hightower of Oldtown and House Redwyne of the Arbor forbade Andal ships from landing along its coast. During these years, the kings of House Gardener prepared for what seemed inevitable. Reports of devastation in other kingdoms reached Highgarden, resulting in many Gardener kings taking different approaches throughout multiple generations. King Gwaine IV sought aid from the Children of the Forest. His successor, King Mern II, focused instead on strengthening castles and fortifications. Despite all this preparation, the expected invasion never came. When the Andals finally did arrive generations later, they did not come as a single overwhelming force, but as migrating peoples. By then, the political landscape of Westeros had already shifted, and the Gardener kings who faced them chose a different path. These rulers would be remembered as the Three Sage Kings: Garth IX, his son Merle I, and his grandson Gwaine V. Rather than going to war with the Andals, they pursued a policy of peaceful integration. Garth IX opened his court to Andal influence while still maintaining his First Men traditions. He brought a Septon into his council, giving the faith a place at Highgarden, and commissioned the construction of the first sept within the castle itself. Despite this, he did not abandon the old gods, instead allowing both belief systems to coexist. His son Merle I went further, fully converting to the faith. He actively promoted its spread throughout the Reach, funding the construction of septs. His son Gwaine V completed this transformation. Born into the faith, he became the first Gardener king to be anointed as a knight. Marriage played a role in this strategy as well. Both Merle I and Gwaine V took Andal brides, forging alliances with powerful Andal families and ensuring their loyalty. At the same time, Andal warriors and nobles were welcomed into the service of the Gardener kings, with the Andal knight Sir Alistair Tyrell being a major example of this as he rose to become Gwaine V's champion and sworn shield. The Three Sages also granted lands and titles to the most powerful Andal leaders, turning them into loyal supporters. Andal craftsmanship transformed the region, replacing bronze weaponry with iron and reinforcing castles with advanced masonry techniques. This not only strengthened the Reach military, but also enhanced its already considerable wealth and infrastructure. Meanwhile, House Hightower also played a role in the early acceptance of Andal culture. Lord Dorian Hightower set aside his First Man wife to marry an Andal princess. His successor, Lord Daemon, became the first of his house to embrace the faith. After Daemon's death, his son Tristan was raised by Septon Robeson, a figure who would later become the first High Septon. In honor of his mentor, Tristan built the Starry Sept in Oldtown, establishing it as the spiritual center of the faith in Westeros. His own son, Lord Barris Hightower, further elevated the institution by gifting the High Septon his first crystal crown, solidifying the alliance between religion and power in the Reach. Around 1,000 years after landing in Westeros, the Iron Islands still remained unconquered. As Andal influence spread along the coast, the Iron Islands found found themselves encircled by stronger, more organized powers. After the Ironborn conducted countless attempted invasions, the Andals finally turned from defense to offense. The Iron Islands were already fractured by rivalries between their great houses. Andal warlords took advantage of these divisions, forming alliances with Ironborn lords who saw an opportunity to gain power. During the reign of King Ragnar II Grey-Iron, he faced not only invading Andal forces, but also a coalition of House Drum, Greyjoy, and Hoare. Together they defeated Ragnar, bringing an end to his rule. In the aftermath, a new king was chosen. Jaehaerys Hoare, and Maesters claim that he married the daughter of a powerful Andal warlord. House Hoare became the new ruling dynasty over the Iron Islands. However, many Ironborn viewed their willingness to compromise with Andal tradition as weakness and betrayal. The priest of the Drowned God viewed the faith as an alien and heretical influence. Despite the efforts of the Hoare kings, the faith never took hold in the Iron Islands. While some Andal settlers and their descendants initially maintained their religion, the overwhelming cultural dominance of the Ironborn was too strong. Over generations, most families of Andal origin abandoned the Seven and embraced the Drowned God. Over time, the vast majority of First Men south of the Neck converted to the faith of the Seven. Despite this, in many castles, the sacred godswoods of the First Men were preserved. These spaces allowed the worship of the old gods to continue alongside the new, preventing widespread religious conflict that might otherwise have torn the kingdoms apart. The Andal ideal of knighthood, rooted in the faith, spread throughout much of Westeros as well. One of the Andal's most significant contributions was the introduction of writing. As a result, nearly everything known about earlier ages comes not from the First Men themselves, but from accounts later written down by Andal septons, often based on oral traditions and songs passed through generations. Over time, Andal culture became so dominant that Westeros itself came to be known in Essos as the land of the Andals. Even in regions like the north, where the First Men had successfully resisted conquest, Andal influence gradually spread through trade, marriage, and language. The common tongue, derived from the Andal language, replaced the old tongue almost entirely. For thousands of years, Westeros remains deeply fragmented, with hundreds of kingdoms ruling over small territories. There is constant fighting between neighboring rulers for land, power, and survival. Gradually, stronger rulers begin consolidating power. Through war, alliances, and marriage, smaller kingdoms are absorbed into larger ones. This slow process unfolds differently in each region, but the end result is the same: the rise of a handful of dominant powers that will eventually become known as the Seven Kingdoms. House Stark continues expanding their control. Over generations, they solidify their rule across the region, putting down rebellions and asserting dominance over rival houses. They drive out threats such as pirates along their eastern coast and establish a settlement at a river known as the White Knife. This river runs south into the Bight, where White Harbor is eventually created, the North's most important port. One of the lowest points in the history of the Reach came during the reign of King Garth X Gardener, remembered as Garth Greybeard. By this time, the once dominant power of House Gardener had already begun to fade, but under Garth X, that decline turned into full-on collapse. Garth had come to the throne as a child and ruled for nearly 90 years, but he was neither a strong nor capable king. As he grew older, he became arrogant and detached from reality. Real power at court fell into the hands of two rival factions, House Manderly and House Peake, each competing for control of the kingdom. The situation worsened when Garth failed to produce a male heir. Instead, his daughters were married into these competing houses, giving both sides claims to the throne. What followed was a full-scale civil war within the Reach, as the Manderlys and Peakes turned their political rivalry into open conflict. With the kingdom tearing itself apart from within, its enemies seized the opportunity to strike. To the west and east, rival kings carved away border territories, but the most devastating blow came from the south. Dornish forces launched deep invasions into the Reach. Eventually, Highgarden fell, and when the Dornish entered the castle, they found Garth X senile, bedridden, and completely unaware of what was happening around him. According to legend, he was tied to his bed and left to rot in his own filth. The Dornish soldiers slit his throat, supposedly as an act of mercy. They then looted the castle, set it on fire, and destroyed the Oaken Seat, an ancient throne carved from a living tree, said to have been planted by the legendary Garth Greenan himself. Its destruction didn't just signify the fall of a castle, but the humiliation of an entire dynasty that had ruled for thousands of years. Even after Highgarden was burned, the chaos did not end. The civil war between the Manderlys and Peakes continued for another decade, plunging the Reach into total anarchy. Order was only restored when House Tyrell, longtime stewards of Highgarden, rallied the remaining loyalist houses. They defeated both factions, reclaimed the ruined castle, and placed a distant relative of the Gardener line on the throne as King Mern VI. He eventually rebuilt Highgarden with the help of the Tyrells, and eventually had his daughter married to Robert Tyrell. This resulted in the following generations of Tyrells claiming descent from Garth Greenan. Around 700 BC, the Rhoynar, a civilization of river-based city-states from Essos, were forced into a war against the Valyrian Freehold, with their cities and civilizations being completely annihilated. As her people faced death and destruction, Princess Nymeria gathered survivors, primarily women and children, and they made their escape. With a fleet said to consist of 10,000 ships, ships, they traveled across the summer sea in search of a new home. After years of wandering, they arrived in Dorne near the mouth of the Greenblood. Upon landing, Dorne was a fractured land divided among different kings who fought endlessly over scarce resources such as water, fertile land, and power. To many of these rulers, the Rhoynar were nothing more than foreign invaders, but Mors Martell, Lord of the Sandship, recognized opportunity where others saw threat. Many claim he was captivated by Nymeria's beauty and asked her to marry him. After this, hundreds of Dornish knights and lords took Rhoynish wives, binding the two peoples together by blood. The Rhoynar brought with them not only numbers which greatly increased Martell's strength, but also wealth, advanced craftsmanship, and knowledge that surpassed much of Westeros. On the day of her wedding, Nymeria ordered her fleet burned, stating that there is no return to Essos and that their future will be in Dorne. She named her husband Prince of Dorne, adopting the Rhoynish title instead of king, and together they began a brutal campaign known as Nymeria's War. One by one, kingdoms were taken over. Some were defeated in battle, while others were forced into submission. After over a decade of conflict, Dorne was united under House Martell. Sunspear was built around Sandship, and from here, Nymeria ruled as Princess of Dorne for nearly 27 years, with power remaining in her hands. Over the course of her reign, she survived a dozen assassination attempts, crushed rebellions, and fought off invaders from outside powers, including the Storm King in the Reach. Under Nymeria, laws changed, traditions evolved, and inheritance in Dorne favored equality, allowing daughters to inherit alongside sons, a practice unheard of in much of Westeros. Nymeria died after decades of ruling, and her oldest daughter succeeded her. Meanwhile, House Stark crushed another Bolton rebellion, and due to his accomplishments in this conflict, the younger son of the king in the north, Carlin Stark, was awarded lands taken from the Boltons. They called this land Carl's Hold, and over time the name was changed to Carhold. A new house branching from House Stark was created, now known as House Karstark, and they remained loyal to the Starks for centuries. Around this time, the 10-year-old Osric Stark was elected as the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, making him the youngest individual ever chosen for this position, and he led them for 60 years. Castle Black, which had been standing for thousands of years at this point, took over Nightfort as the Lord Commander's seat around this time as well. Meanwhile, the Storm Kings of House Daeron successfully conquered the Riverlands, bringing them under their control and reducing the number of major realms on the continent to 7. The North, the Mountain and the Vale, the Riverlands, the Rock, the Reach, the Stormlands, and Dorne. Around 300 BC, House Frey began construction of a massive bridge across the Green Fork of the Trident. This structure, later known as the Twins, allowed them to control a key crossing point and amass great wealth through tolls. Despite their growing power, they were looked down upon by older noble families. Meanwhile, House Targaryen, one of the great Dragonlord families of the Valyrian Freehold, established itself on the island of Dragonstone, constructing a castle going by the same name, just off the eastern coast of Westeros. At first, this was simply a Valyrian outpost, far removed from the politics of the mainland, but in 114 BC, everything changed. While living in Valyria, Daenerys Targaryen, later known as Daenerys the Dreamer, experienced a prophetic dream showcasing the complete destruction of her land. When she told other people, no one believed her except for her father Aenar. Despite being viewed as mad and a coward, he sold his lands and left his influential life within Valyria. He brought his family, wealth, slaves, and most importantly, 5 dragons and 4 dragon eggs, with one of these dragons being Balerion the Blackdread. House Targaryen was not among the strongest of Valyria's great families to begin with, so when the other great houses saw them fleeing, it confirmed their lesser status to them. But 12 years later, Daenerys' vision came true, and the doom of Valyria occurred, a catastrophic event that destroyed the Freehold and wiped out nearly all of its Dragonlord families. Because of their relocation, the Targaryens survived, becoming the last known Dragonlords in the world. For the next century, they remained isolated on Dragonstone, quietly building their strength. At some point before the Targaryens came to Westeros, House Valyrion, an ancient family from Old Valyria, settled on the largest island in Blackwater Bay, naming it Driftmark. Here, they constructed the castle known as Driftmark, and within it was the Driftwood Throne. The island is positioned along vital trade routes between Essos and Westeros, which allowed House Valyrion to amass great wealth through commerce, taxation, and naval dominance. Over time, they became one of the strongest naval powers in the region. After the Targaryens came to Dragonstone, which is located near Driftmark, they formed a strong alliance with House Valyrion. A marriage between Valena Valerion and Aerion Targaryen, the Lord of Dragonstone, produced 3 children, Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys, securing their union. Back in Westeros, the balance of power continued to shift. Around 60 BC, the Iron Islands entered a second great age of expansion under House Hor. Unlike their earlier coastal raids, this campaign pushed deep inland, targeting the Riverlands. They conquered vast territory stretching from the Neck to the Blackwater, ruling over the region with brutal force. To cement their dominance, King Harren Hor, known as Harren the Black, ordered the construction of an enormous fortress on the shores of the God's Eye. Built by enslaved labor over many years, this castle, Harrenhal, was intended to be the greatest and most impregnable stronghold in all of Westeros. Meanwhile, Aegon Targaryen had grown into a tall, broad-shouldered, fearless young man. Though a formidable warrior, he took no joy in battle, and he only had one true friend, Orys Baratheon, a fierce warrior widely believed to be his bastard half-brother. Aegon followed tradition by marrying within his family, but broke convention by taking both of his sisters as wives, Visenya, whom he married out of duty, and Rhaenys, whom he married out of love. Each sibling rode a dragon. Aegon claimed Balerion the Black Dread, the largest and most terrifying dragon that will ever exist in Westeros. Visenya rode Vhagar, the second largest dragon and a creature with great power, and Rhaenys rode the smaller but quick Meraxes. As time went on, Aegon's attention increasingly turned westward. He had traveled to places such as Old Town and the Arbor, observing the fractured political landscape of Westeros, a continent divided into 7 kingdoms constantly at odds with one another. At Dragonstone, he commissioned the Painted Table, a massive wooden map of Westeros carved in detail, but notably lacking borders, reflecting his belief that the land should be united under a single ruler. Argilac Durrandon, the aging Storm King, feared the growing power of Harrenhal, who was nearing completion of the colossal fortress of Harrenhal. Seeking an alliance, Argilac offered his daughter Argilla to Aegon in marriage along with lands. Aegon refused as he was already wed to his sisters, and instead proposed that Argilla married Orys Baratheon, while demanding even more territory to be given to him. Argilac, failing to understand Aegon's bond with Orys and insulted by the suggestion that his daughter wed a rumored bastard, was enraged. He mutilated Aegon's envoy, cutting off his hands and sending them back with a message saying, "These are the only hands your bastard shall have of me." In response, Aegon gathered his closest allies and spent 6 days in council with his sisters. Together they prepared for war, not only to punish Argilac, but to claim the entire continent. Ravens were sent to every king and lord in Westeros, carrying the message that Aegon would be the one true king. Those who bent the knee would be allowed to keep their lands and titles, and those who resisted would face fire and blood. On the night before his campaign, Aegon and his sisters entered the Sept at Dragonstone and prayed to the Seven, embracing the dominant religion of the land they were about to conquer. Ironically, on the very same day that Harrenhal was finished being constructed, the Targaryens and their dragons landed on the east coast of Westeros. In 2 BC, with a small force of less than 1,600 men, Aegon and his sisters began their conquest. With their dragons and House Valerion's fleet, they would become unstoppable. Aegon immediately established himself on the continent by constructing a wooden fortress on a hill, known as the Aegon Fort. This area would later become King's Landing. While Aegon oversaw construction, his sisters moved quickly to secure the surrounding lands. Rhaenys, upon Meraxes, flew to the nearby seat of House Roseby, and they immediately chose to submit when facing her dragon. Visenya, riding Vhagar, descended upon House Stokeworth, where resistance was met with fire and the castle eventually surrendered. After the battle, Aegon gathered his allies and newly subdued lords holding a coronation. Visenya placed a Valyrian steel crown upon her brother's head, with Rhaenys proclaiming him first of his name, King of all Westeros and Shield of his people. Aegon then displayed the 3-headed dragon banner of House Targaryen. He also elevated Orys to the position of Hand of the King. Following the coronation, Aegon's attention turned to the Vale of Arryn. He sent a fleet under the command of Daemon Valerion, accompanied by Visenya riding Vhagar, with the goal of taking Goldtown, the Vale's main port. The Arryns quickly assembled their fleet with reinforcements from Braavosi warships. The Arryn fleet managed to destroy a significant portion of the Targaryen ships, resulting in the death of Daemon Valerion, but Visenya soon intervened. Vhagar unleashed dragonfire upon the Arryn fleet, burning their men and ships. Though House Arryn's fleet was mostly destroyed, the Targaryens were not able to take Goldtown due to the losses they suffered. Not long after, Aegon marched onto the Riverlands, and here they were attacked by the armies of House Hor. The Battle of the Reeds ended in victory for the Targaryens, but at the cost of many lives from Aegon's small army. Hiding in the darkness, the Ironborn struck again at the Wailing Willows. Here, it seemed like Aegon's forces were almost completely annihilated, and as the Ironborn victors attempted to withdraw across the lake, Aegon descended from the sky on Balerion, burning their men and ships. Harren the Black, confident in the strength of Harrenhal, summoned the Riverlords to defend him. Unfortunately for him, his tyranny brought a lot of resentment, and instead of answering his calls, many turned against him. Edmund Tully became the first of the Riverlords to declare for Aegon. One by one, others followed, strengthening Aegon's army. When Aegon finally reached Harrenhal, he demanded Harren to surrender and he would be named Lord of the Iron Islands. Harren refused, and that night, Aegon flew above Harrenhal, with Balerion burning the castle down. Here, House Hor was completely wiped out, resulting in a distant relative of House Hor, Corin Volmark, becoming the king of the Iron Islands. The next day, Edmund Tully came before Aegon and swore fealty, and in recognition for his early support, he was named Lord Paramount of the Trident, establishing House Tully as the rulers of the Riverlands. Aegon granted Harrenhal to his loyal follower, Quentyn Cohaerys, and the other Riverlords bent the knee to their new king. Meanwhile, Visenya flew to Crackclaw Point demanding submission. The lords there, having heard of Harren's demise, understood resistance was pointless. They bent the knee without battle, swearing their loyalty to House Targaryen. While Aegon was dealing with the Riverlands, he sent the majority of his army to the Stormlands, being led by his hand Orys and sister wife Rhaenys. Before they could reach Storm's End to bring down Argilac, they were ambushed by his forces at a river known as Windwater. More than 1,000 men were killed during the battle, resulting resulting in a Targaryen loss, and the attackers fled into the forest of the Kingswood. As they attempted to make their escape, Rhaenys descended upon Meraxes and unleashed dragonfire onto the forest, killing countless men. Argilac was at Storm's End when this happened, and when he received word of Harrenhal being destroyed, he decided he wouldn't stay trapped inside his castle to burn like Herod. He rode north with his full strength to confront Orys in open battle, with Argilac having twice as many men than the Targaryen forces. This led to the battle known as the Last Storm, and as heavy rain and wind struck, the Stormlanders attacked. The storm made it nearly impossible for Rhaenys to fly on Meraxes, so they had to stay low to the ground. Orys and his forces were positioned on top of a hill, using the terrain and mud to their advantage. After multiple failed charges up the hill, they eventually broke through the Targaryen forces. Just as Argilac thought he won the battle, Rhaenys appeared with Meraxes, burning his forces. Despite losing the battle and being thrown from his horse, Argilac did not yield easily. He rose to his feet and continued fighting, holding off numerous attackers. Orys ordered his men to stand aside, offering Argilac one final chance to surrender. He refused, and the two men fought in the rain and mud, each wounding the other. In the end, Orys killed him, and the ancient line of the Storm Kings had come to an end. In the aftermath, Orys and Rhaenys made it to Storm's End, and there they met Argilac's daughter, Argilla, refusing to submit, declaring herself Storm Queen. Eventually, the castle's own defenders rose against Argilla out of fear, seizing her and delivering her to Orys. Instead of punishing her, he removed her chains and gave her food and wine. Eventually, Orys took Argilla as his wife, and he was named Lord of Storm's End and Lord Paramount of the Stormlands. Rather than erase the legacy of House Durrandon, Orys chose to preserve it by adopting their sigil, the Crowned Stag, and House Baratheon was created. After Aegon successfully conquered these regions, the King of the Reach, Mern the Ninth Gardener, and the King of the Rock, Loren Lannister, set aside any rivalry they had to fight against their common enemy. They gathered their forces at Golden Grove, forming the largest army Westeros had ever seen, around 55,000 men. Many other powerful houses in the Reach joined them, and because Mern brought the larger numbers, he was the main commander. The two kings marched north to meet Aegon, but unfortunately for them, he was already informed of their advance. He, his sisters, their dragons, and all of their forces gathered at Stony Sept, with this being the only time during the conquest that all three Targaryen dragons would fight together. They advanced south to meet the two kings, and they were instantly met with overwhelming numbers, resulting in the battle known as the Field of Fire. Aegon, recognizing the disadvantage, descended on the battlefield with his sisters, setting the entire battlefield on fire. Due to the wind, the Targaryen forces were mostly safe, while the armies of the Reach and the Rock were engulfed in flames. As soldiers attempted to flee, they were cut down by Aegon's men. More than 4,000 men died directly from Dragonflame, including King Mern, his sons, grandsons, and other family members, with the ancient House Greenhand being completely annihilated. Loren Lannister realized the battle was lost and escaped. The following day, he was captured and immediately bent the knee to Aegon. In return, Aegon allowed him to retain his lands and titles, naming him Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. Aegon then went to Highgarden expecting resistance, but instead he found the castle held by its steward, Harlan Tyrell, whose family had served the Gardeners for generations, surrendering Highgarden and pledging loyalty to Aegon. As a reward, Aegon elevated him to Lord of Highgarden, Lord Paramount of the Manor, and Warden of the South. As Aegon was planning his next moves, he received news that the king in the north, Torrhen Stark, had crossed the neck with around 30,000 Northmen. Aegon immediately summoned his sisters and called upon all the lords who had already bent the knee. By the time Torrhen reached the Trident, he was met with the large Targaryen army and 3 dragons. Some of his bannermen urged an immediate attack, while others advised retreating to Moat Cailin. Torrhen's bastard half-brother, Brandon Snow, proposed a plan to cross the river during the night and assassinate the dragons in their sleep. Torrhen was not a reckless man, and he understood that one wrong decision could doom not only his army but his entire kingdom. Instead of risking annihilation, he chose diplomacy, crossing the Trident and approaching Aegon by himself. He knelt and laid his crown at the Conqueror's feet. Aegon allowed Torrhen to retain his lands and titles, naming him Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. Though some would forever see his choice as submission, others recognized it as wisdom. From that day forward, Torrhen Stark became known as the King Who Knelt. Meanwhile, in the Vale of Arryn, Shara Arryn, ruling as Queen Regent for her young son Ronald, had been closely watching the Targaryen advance. Earlier in the war, she had attempted diplomacy, even offering herself in marriage to Aegon, on the condition that her son be named heir. Aegon had refused, and in response, she focused on strengthening her defenses. Riding Vhagar, Visenya ignored the defenses that Shara had put in place, ascending to the Eyrie itself. When Shara returned to her castle, she found her son Ronald sitting calmly on Visenya's knee, gazing at her dragon. The boy, fascinated rather than frightened, asked if he could ride it. Shara realized that resistance would mean destruction, and that her son's life and the Vale's future depended on her choice. She bent the knee, surrendering the crowns of House Arryn. Soon after, Ronald was allowed to fly 3 times around the giant's lance atop Vhagar, and House Arryn became the Lords of the Eyrie and Wardens of the East. Around this time, Rhaenys flew south over the Red Mountains to Dorne. After going to different castles, she found all of them to be empty, and she realized this was a deliberate strategy. The Dornish refused to meet the Targaryens Targaryens in open battle, where dragons would ensure their destruction. Instead, they adopted guerrilla tactics, where their forces would hide in the deserts and mountains. Rhaenys then flew to Sunspear, and there she found Maria Martell alone, waiting for her. Rhaenys demanded submission, and Maria responded claiming that Dorne would not kneel, but it also wouldn't fight on Aegon's terms. Rhaenys warned her that next time the Targaryens would return with fire and blood, and Maria answered with the words of her own house, unbowed, unbent, unbroken, declaring that while the dragons might burn them, they would never make them submit. Rhaenys decided to leave, and Dorne would remain the only free kingdom during Aegon's conquest. Meanwhile, when word of the conquest reached Old Town, the High Septon retreated into the Starry Sept, and there he fasted and prayed for 7 days, seeking divine guidance. On the 7th day, he had a vision, and according to him, the crone herself had shown him a future where Old Town burned if it resisted the Targaryens. Because of this vision, the High Septon declared that the faith would not oppose Aegon. This decision fell to the ruler of Old Town, Manfred Hightower, a devout man who took the words of the High Septon seriously. Acting on the council, Manfred chose submission. When Aegon finally reached Old Town, the gates were open and Manfred met Aegon bending the knee. 3 days later, within the Starry Sept, the High Septon anointed Aegon with the 7 oils, placed a crown upon his head, and proclaimed him Aegon of House Targaryen, first of his name, King of the Andals, the Royner and the Firstmen, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. With Aegon's coronation in Old Town complete, rather than date his reign from his landing or his earlier crowning at the Aegon fort, he chose to begin it from the moment he was anointed by the High Septon. This tied his kingship directly to the faith of the 7, granting him religious legitimacy in the eyes of the people of Westeros. Aegon then returned to his initial landing spot, the Aegon fort, and started building the capital for his new kingdom. The swords of his defeated enemies were gathered and melted down into the Iron Throne as a reminder of conquest and submission. He also formalized the position of the Hand of the King, keeping Orys as his hand and assembling the Small Council, a group of advisors who would oversee different aspects of governance. Aegon's first major law, the King's Peace, forbade private warfare between lords without permission of the crown. He also allowed each kingdom to retain its own laws and customs to keep the defeated houses loyal. Aegon frequently traveled throughout Westeros on royal progresses, accompanied by a group of maesters who educated him on the histories, traditions, and governance of each region. This allowed him to better understand the people he ruled, reinforcing his authority while minimizing rebellion by gaining respect everywhere he visited. Visenya and Rhaenys oversaw matters while Aegon was away. Rhaenys in particular became closely associated with the well-being of the small folk, having an empathetic and personable style of ruling, where she would involve herself in disputes and advocate for reforms. She also pushed for laws protecting women from the Ironborn practice of taking salt wives through raiding. Rhaenys would often arrange marriages between distant noble houses to bind the kingdoms together. One of these unions was between the daughter of Lord Torrhen Stark and Lord Ronald Arryn. Despite her beloved presence in the realm, rumors spread that when Aegon was absent, Rhaenys entertained handsome young men, even sleeping with some of them. After her son Aenys was born in 7 AC, he was frail and sickly, leading some to whisper that he might not be Aegon's son at all. However, as Aenys grew and eventually bonded with the dragon Quicksilver, these suspicions faded, replaced by acceptance of him as the rightful heir. While much of Westeros remained peaceful during this time, the Iron Islands descended into chaos. While Corin Volmark had declared himself king, the priest of the Drowned God crowned a barefoot holy man named Lobos, who claimed divine parentage. Other kings emerged across the islands, and for over a year the Ironborn warred among themselves. In 2 AC, Aegon turned his attention to ending this instability. Backed by fleets from the Reach, the Waterlands, the Arbor, and even the North, he launched an invasion on the Iron Islands. Aegon personally killed King Corin with his Valyrian steel sword Blackfire. Meanwhile, Lodos, unable to summon divine aid, walked into the sea with stones tied to his legs, believing he would be brought to his god. Thousands of his followers imitated him, and their bodies later washed ashore. Rather than impose an external ruler or destroy the Ironborn entirely, Aegon allowed the Ironborn to choose their own leader. They selected Vicon Greyjoy, a respected and capable lord with ancient lineage. Vicon swore fealty and became the first lord of the Iron Islands. He sought to adapt to the new order, restricting pillaging to distant shores and even allowing the return of the faith of the 7, actions that angered traditionalists but secured peace with the crown. He remained loyal to Aegon throughout his life, advising his heirs never to challenge the dragons. By 3 AC, every region in the 7 kingdoms had now been ruled under Aegon except for Dorne. Rather than immediately resorting to war, Aegon initially pursued diplomacy, seeking to bring the Dornish into his realm through negotiation. For roughly a year, envoys traveled back and forth, but no progress was made. Princess Maria Martell continued to inform them Dorne would never submit nor engage in traditional combat. Aegon eventually decided he would take Dorne by force, launching the First Dornish War. In 4 AC, Aegon led roughly 30,000 men through the Prince's Pass in the Red Mountains, accompanied by powerful lords such as Harlan Tyrell. His hand Orys led a separate force of 1,000 knights through the Boneway, intending threatening to crush Dorne from multiple directions. Meanwhile, Queen Rhaenys stayed in the skies on her dragon Meraxes. She eventually burned the Planky town and captured multiple Dornish strongholds, but she found yet again that every castle was left empty. The Dornish abandoned their lands, poisoned wells, burned crops, and lived in the deserts and mountains. Once through the mountains, Aegon divided his forces. He led one army east towards Skyreach, while Tyrell marched south toward the Hellbolt. The relentless heat, lack of water, and poisoned wells decimated both of their forces. By the time they both reached their destinations, they were abandoned. As Orys advanced through the Boneway, his army was attacked from above by unseen enemies throwing rocks, arrows, and spears. Many Stormlanders were killed and Orys was taken as a hostage, where he ended up being held captive for years. Aegon and Rhaenys eventually reached Sunspear, finding it largely abandoned as well. Declaring victory nonetheless, Aegon proclaimed Dorne part of his realm and installed Jon Roseby as Warden of the Sands. When he returned to King's Landing, the Dornish re-emerged, killing all of the forces Aegon left behind, retaking castles, and Sunspear rose in rebellion. Princess Meria personally had Jon Roseby thrown from a tower to his death. In response, Harlan Tyrell marched from the Hellbolt to retake control, but his already weakened army faced constant attacks. In 5 AC, Tyrell and his entire army vanished into the deserts of Dorne, never to be seen again. In 7 AC, Orys was finally ransomed back, but before releasing him, his captors cut off his sword hand. The once formidable warrior returned home enraged, consumed by a desire for vengeance. He resigned as Hand of the King and became known as Orys One Hand. Infuriated by what happened to Orys, Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys returned to Dorne in 8 AC, attacking Sandstone, Vaith, and the Hellbolt, attempting to systematically break Dornish resistance through continued dragon assaults. As Rhaenys, riding upon Meraxes, flew above a castle, a scorpion bolt pierced the dragon through the eye, resulting in Meraxes falling, destroying the Hellhold's highest tower. Rhaenys died in the fall, and the emotional impact on Aegon and Visenya was immense. What followed became known as the Dragon's Wrath. Driven by grief and rage, the Targaryens unleashed their dragons across Dorne with unprecedented brutality, burning every castle and settlement they could find for 2 years. Sunspear was one of the only areas spared, with some speculating that this was due to the fear that Princess Meria had acquired weapons capable of killing dragons. The Dornish responded by orchestrating killings across the 7 kingdoms, with violence even reaching the capital. Both Aegon and Visenya were targeted multiple times in King's Landing, with Visenya at one point having to defend her brother, killing assassins in the streets. These repeated threats exposed the vulnerability of the king, ultimately leading Visenya to establish the Kingsguard in 10 AC, an elite brotherhood sworn to protect the king with their lives, modeled after the vows of the Night's Watch. Despite the devastation in Dorne, their spirit remained unbroken. In 13 AC, Meria Martell finally passed away from old age, and her son, Prince Nymor, succeeded her. Unlike his mother, Nymor saw an end to the endless bloodshed, sending his daughter Daria to King's Landing to discuss peace. She brought the skull of Meraxes with her, and its arrival angered many at court, specifically Visenya and Orys, who saw it as an insult rather than an offering. Some lords even proposed harming the young princess, but Aegon refused to allow such actions. Nymor's terms stated that Dorne desired peace, but would not submit to the Iron Throne. Aegon was ready to reject this outright, but when Daria gave him a letter from her father, he read it thoroughly in silence. Observers claimed that as he finished, his hand was bleeding, cut by the blades of the throne as he clenched it tightly. Without revealing its content, he burned the letter and immediately departed for Dragonstone on Balerion. When he returned the following morning, his decision had changed. Aegon agreed to the terms and signed a peace treaty, bringing an end to the First Dornish War. The contents of Nymor's letter still remain a mystery. Some believe it was an emotional appeal from one ruler to another. Others claim it contained threats, perhaps even involving Aegon's heir, or revelations about Rhaenys' fate. Whatever it said, Dorne remained the only kingdom to successfully resist Aegon's conquest. Not long after, in 12 AC, Visenya gave birth to Maegor on Dragonstone, a child who had become very different compared to his older brother Aenys. While Aenys was weak and gentle, Maegor was large and aggressive. Raised primarily by Visenya on Dragonstone, Maegor grew into a fierce warrior, displaying violent tendencies as a child and excelling in combat training. Under the guidance of skilled knights, Maegor quickly proved himself to be a prodigy in combat. By 13, he was already overcoming seasoned knights. In the meantime, Aegon raised Aenys as his heir in King's Landing, involving him in royal governance. Aenys was trained by his father's Kingsguard, and although he was a decent fighter, he lacked his father's size and strength. As the years passed, Aegon continued to strengthen his rule through careful governance. The rest of his reign became known as the Dragon's Peace, a period of relative stability. Aegon put significant effort into the development of King's Landing, where he had walls constructed between 20 to 26 AC to protect the city. Later, dissatisfied with the Aegon fort, he ordered its destruction in 35 AC and began construction of the Red Keep, which would eventually become a great castle. Visenya was placed in charge of its construction, a decision some interpreted as a way for Aegon to distance himself from her as they slowly grew apart. Aegon also ruled carefully in regard to religion. Understanding the power of the Faith of the Seven, he worked to maintain its support. He commissioned the construction of major septs in King's Landing, including one on Visenya's Hill and another, the Sept of Remembrance on Rhaenys' Hill. Prince Aenys would eventually marry Alyssa Valerion in 22 AC, the daughter of Lord Aethan, who was King Aegon's master of ships. Despite being a political match, they had a loving relationship and 6 children together: Rhaena, Aegon, Viserys, Jaehaerys, Alicent, and Baela. Questions of succession arose when their first child, Rhaena, who would later become the Dragon Rider of Dreamfire, was born in 23 AC, prompting Visenya to propose a marriage between Rhaena and Maegor to secure the line of succession. This proposal was opposed by both the Faith and Aenys' supporters, leading instead to Maegor's marriage to Cerys Hightower, who was the niece of the High Septon. Maegor continued to make a name for himself in battles and tournaments. At 16, he was knighted by Aegon himself after winning a major tourney, defeating multiple knights of the Kingsguard. Though Aegon's reign was mostly peaceful, tensions still lingered beneath the surface. Many in Westeros resented Targaryen rule, viewing them as foreign conquerors or abominations due to their incestuous practices. In his later years, Aegon gradually withdrew from active governance, leaving more responsibilities to Aenys and his council. In 37 AC, while on Dragonstone and recounting tales of his conquest to his grandsons, Aegon suffered a fatal stroke at the age of 63. He was cremated in the Valyrian tradition, with his pyre lit by the dragon Vhagar, and his famous sword Blackfire placed upon the flames. At the time of his father's death, Aenys was at Highgarden. The moment news reached him, he mounted his dragon and flew directly to Dragonstone. This immediate response was important. In a realm still held together by loyalty to Aegon personally, any delay could have created conflict. During Aegon's funeral, Maegor delivered the eulogy, reinforcing his image as the stronger son of Aegon. It was here that Aenys made a shocking decision. He gave Maegor the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire. This was more than just a gift. It was the acknowledgement that his brother better embodied the warrior image of Aegon the Conqueror. At the same time, Aenys tried to frame this as unity, declaring that they would rule together with Maegor serving him. However, Blackfire was more than just a sword. It represented legitimacy, strength, and kingship. By giving it away, Aenys unintentionally weakened his own image in the eyes of many lords. Maegor also claimed the greatest prize he had long desired, Balerion the Blackdread. With Balerion under him, Maegor became one of the most formidable figures in the realm. Despite all of this, Aenys ascended to the Iron Throne in 37 AC. He was warmly received, with the small folk cheering for him. Aenys was unlike his father in many ways, as he was initially loved by the people and looked at as a charming, kind, and approachable king, but these qualities made him indecisive and overly reliant on the counsel of others. Aenys attempted to continue his father's policies, ruling from King's Landing while maintaining ties with the faith. Initially, his coronation was accepted, but doubts about his strength as a ruler quickly emerged. Within the first year of his reign, multiple rebellions broke out across the realm, exposing the fragility of Targaryen authority without Aegon's presence. The first of these uprisings began in the Riverlands, where a brutal outlaw known as Harren the Red claimed descent from Harren the Black and sought to reclaim his supposed birthright, where he eventually infiltrated Harrenhal. He dragged Lord Gargon Jaehaerys from his bed to the Godswood, cut off his genitals, and fed them to a dog as the Lord bled to death. Since Gargon had no children, House Jaehaerys was extinguished entirely, and Harren declared himself King of the Rivers. At the time of this rebellion, King Aenys was at Riverrun, where Lord Tully urged him to mount his dragon Quicksilver and end the revolt quickly. However, Aenys hesitated, and instead ordered Lord Tully to raise his banners and march to Harrenhal with his 1,000 men. The king's indecisive nature continued after this when he shifted attention to King's Landing, out of fear that the rebels might strike the capital. His constant hesitation wasted precious time and allowed unrest to continue. Eventually, Aenys sent his hand, Alan Stokeworth, to the Riverlands with several hundred men to hunt down Harren the Red. Stokeworth succeeded in locating the outlaw, and a battle took place. Harren managed to kill Lord Stokeworth during the fighting, but he was ultimately slain as well. In the aftermath, the lordship of Harrenhal was granted to House Haraway. At the same time, the most dangerous rebellion emerged in the Dornish Marches, led by the mysterious outlaw known as the Vulture King. The Vulture King gathered a massive army, eventually numbering over 30,000, and launched raids into the Stormlands and the Reach, resulting in the Second Dornish War. Confident in his strength, the Vulture King divided his forces, sending one army to besiege Stonehelm, while he led the other toward Nightsong and Hornhill. In the Stormlands, Lord Orys Baratheon, still driven by his desire for vengeance, led his forces to Stonehelm and crushed the Dornish forces. However, Orys himself did not survive long after this victory, dying of wounds he suffered in the battle. Meanwhile, the Vulture King's main force was intercepted by a coalition of lords, including Harmon Dondarrion and Samwell Tarly. Unable to take Nightsong and caught between opposing forces, the Vulture King's army collapsed and the survivors were hunted down in what became known as the Vulture Hunt. The Vulture King himself was captured, tied naked between two posts, and left to die of thirst and exposure, with his corpse ironically being picked apart by vultures. Meanwhile, a fourth rebellion unfolded in the Vale, where Jonos Aaron rose against his brother Lord Ronald, imprisoning him and declaring himself King of the Vale. Allard Royce took matters into his own hands, raising an army to suppress the rebellion and cornering Jonos at the Eyrie. Faced with defeat, Jonos executed his own brother by throwing him through the moon door. The rebellion finally came to an end when Prince Maegor arrived on the dragon Balerion, breaking the will of Jonos' followers, and they turned on their leader and threw him out of the moon door in hopes of earning mercy. Maegor granted them a form of it, choosing to hang them all rather than burn them alive. Lord Ronald's cousin, Hubert Arryn, was installed as the new Lord of the Vale. Following these victories, Aenys rewarded loyal lords generously with lands, titles, and honors. He also appointed his brother Maegor as Hand of the King, and for about 2 years they seemed to rule together effectively. However, the fragile balance between the brothers unraveled in 39 AC. Maegor declared that his first wife, Lady Cerise Hightower, was infertile after years with no children, so he took a second wife, Lady Alice Haraway. This caused even more conflict with the faith, which forbade polygamy. Although Maegor attempted to justify his actions by explaining how his father Aegon had 2 wives, this argument did not persuade the faith. No Septon agreed to perform the ceremony, forcing Maegor and Alice to get married in a Valyrian-styled wedding officiated by his mother Visenya. To the faith and many lords of the realm, this was seen not just as sin, but as a deliberate act of disrespect. The High Septon responded with outrage, denouncing the union as sin and fornication and calling Alice a whore. Across Westeros, lords condemned Maegor, openly insulting his new wife and questioning the legitimacy of the Targaryen dynasty's relationship to the faith. King Aenys initially attempted a compromise that satisfied no one, and he eventually presented Maegor with an ultimatum: set aside Alice or go into exile for 5 years. The proud Maegor chose exile, and in 40 AC, he departed for Pentos, taking Alice, the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire, and Balerion with him. In an effort to appease the faith, Aenys appointed Septon Myrmison as his new hand, but this move failed entirely. The faith remained unconvinced, viewing Aenys' actions as weak and insincere. Myrmison himself proved ineffective in restoring stability, as he attempted to cure Cerise Hightower's supposed infertility through nightly blessings, which led her to being frustrated and heading back to Old Town. Meanwhile, lords across the realm began to whisper that the king was weak, indecisive, and unfit to rule. The small folk, once fond of Aenys for his gentle nature, began to turn against him. In 41 AC, Aenys arranged the marriage of his eldest daughter, Princess Rhaena, to his eldest son and heir, Prince Aegon. While the faith had tolerated the incestuous unions of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters due to the power he had, they refused to accept the continuation of such practices by his descendants. In an attempt to win back the love of the people, Aenys sent Aegon and Rhaena on a royal progress throughout the realm, hoping they would be greeted as he once had been. However, this effort failed disastrously. The couple was insulted and even attacked by crowds of smallfolk. At one village, religious fanatics known as the Poor Fellows threw dirt at them, and Aegon had to be restrained from retaliating. Meanwhile, Septon Myrmison, who had performed the wedding ceremony, was expelled from the faith. When Aenys wrote to the High Septon requesting Myrmison's reinstatement, he replied addressing him as King Abomination, declaring him a pretender and tyrant unworthy of the Iron Throne. Shortly after, Myrmison was ambushed in the streets of King's Landing by Poor Fellows and cut to pieces, resulting in the beginning of the Faith Militant Uprising. The warriors' sons fortified the Sept of Remembrance, turning it into a stronghold while thousands of Poor Fellows roamed the countryside, attacking and killing those loyal to the king. The realm descended into chaos, and at one point, 2 Poor Fellows infiltrated King Aenys' residence, attempting to assassinate him. The overwhelmed and indecisive Aenys chose to flee the capital with his family, retreating to Dragonstone. Here, his condition deteriorated quickly. Visenya urged him to respond with fire and blood, advocating for the destruction of the sorry Sept in Old Town and the Sept of Remembrance in King's Landing. This could have crushed the rebellion, but Aenys could not bring himself to act. As reports of rebellion spread and news arrived that his children Aegon and Rhaena were besieged at Crickhall by thousands of Poor Fellows, Aenys collapsed. According to Grand Maester Gawain, the king aged dramatically in his final days, appearing as a man of 60 although he was only 35. Visenya took control of his care, and though he briefly improved, the stress was too overwhelming. In 42 AC, after only 5 years on the throne, King Aenys died on Dragonstone and his body was cremated according to Targaryen custom. Almost immediately, suspicion arose as some believed that Visenya, who had always favored her own son Maegor, may have accelerated Aenys' death to clear the path for Maegor's ascension. Right after Aenys died, she mounted Vhagar and flew to Pentos to bring Maegor back from exile. In doing so, she ensured that the Iron Throne would pass not to Aenys' rightful heir, Prince Aegon, but instead to the far more ruthless Maegor. Upon Maegor's return, he claimed the Iron Throne, bypassing his nephew entirely. His coronation at Dragonstone immediately set the tone for his reign. When Grand Maester Gawain protested the violation of succession laws, Maegor executed him on the spot, personally beheading him. From that moment forward, Maegor ruled not through legitimacy, but through fear. Maegor immediately turned his attention to King's Landing, arriving on Balerion and planting his banner on top of Visenya's Hill, as a direct challenge to both the faith and any who would deny his claim. At his side was his mother, Visenya. The Grand Captain of the warriors' sons approached them and called for a trial of 7, a sacred form of combat believed to reflect the judgment of the gods. Maegor, lacking even the support of the Kingsguard, was forced to seek champions from among the gathered crowd. During the battle, every man fell on both sides, with Maegor being the only one standing, though very wounded. He collapsed and took a blow to the head, resulting in him falling into a coma for nearly a month. On the 28th day of Maegor's unconsciousness, his second wife, Alis, returned from Pentos, bringing with her a mysterious woman known as Tiana of the Tower, along with sellswords. Tiana, rumored to be a sorceress, took over Maegor's care, and 2 days later, the king awoke. Upon awakening, Maegor immediately mounted Balerion and flew to Rhaenys' Hill, burning the Sept of Remembrance to the ground, and hundreds of warriors' sons were killed. That same year, Maegor's forces secured victories against the Faith Militant at the battles of Stonebridge and the Great Fork of the Blackwater. In the aftermath, Maegor defied the Faith yet again by taking Tiana of the Tower as his third wife. This created even more outrage, and when Grand Maester Myros objected, Maegor beheaded him with Blackfire. He apparently executed a dozen Septons before finally finding one who was willing to perform the ceremony. Meanwhile, in Old Town, the High Septon denounced Maegor as an abomination, and his first wife, Cerys, continued to assert her status as the only true queen. In 43 AC, Maegor continued the construction of the Red Keep. He appointed Lord Lucas Haraway, his second wife's father, as Hand of the King, who oversaw the castle's development. Due to Maegor's increasing paranoia, he ordered the creation of secret tunnels and hidden passages beneath the castle in case he was ever betrayed, as well as a fortified castle within the castle, which became known as Maegor's Holdfast. He also demanded 4 layers of dungeons to be made, and had the 4th level created for torture. As the Faith continued to resist, Maegor outlawed holy men from carrying weapons and punished lords who sympathized with the Faith. After the High Septon demanded that he come to Old Town and seek forgiveness, Visenya mounted Vhagar and burned multiple noble houses in the Reach, while Maegor unleashed Balerion upon the Westerlands. They eventually decided to march on Old Town, where they threatened to destroy the Starry Sept itself. When the High Septon mysteriously died, whether by taking his own life or assassination, Lord Martin Hightower opened the city's gates, sparing it from destruction. A new and weaker High Septon took over, and he anointed Maegor as king. Under Maegor's orders, the warriors' sons in Old Town were either executed or sent to the wall, and bounties were placed on the heads of any remaining Faith militant. While at Old Town, Maegor reconciled with his first wife, Cerys, and they celebrated their reunion with a feast. Cerys eventually returned with him to King's Landing. Meanwhile, Aenys' children, Aegon and Rhaena, escaped the siege at Crakehall and fled to Casterly Rock, where they were granted protection by House Lannister. Despite Maegor already establishing himself as king, Aegon still had a claim but only limited support. Aegon decided to make a bold and risky choice. In 43 AC, he and Rhaena disguised themselves and secretly infiltrated King's Landing. Their goal was not to seize power directly, but to secure dragons. Rhaena reclaimed her dragon Dreamfire, and Aegon claimed his father's dragon Quicksilver. Now having 2 dragons, Aegon openly declared his uncle a usurper, and began to gather support. Though many great houses were cautious, some lords of the Riverlands and Westerlands rallied to his cause, resulting in him raising an army of 15,000 men. Riding Quicksilver, Aegon marched to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. At the battle beneath the God's Eye, Maegor descended upon him riding Balerion. Quicksilver, far smaller and weaker, was no match for the Blackdread. In the skies above the God's Eye, Balerion tore Quicksilver and his nephew apart. This resulted in him gaining the nickname Maegor the Cruel and being viewed as a kinslayer throughout the realm. In 44 AC, right after killing her oldest son, Maegor made Aenys' widow Alyssa, as well as her youngest children Jaehaerys and Alicent, his mother's wards on Dragonstone, while summoning her other son Viserys to court to serve as his personal squire. As time went on, Maegor's reign became increasingly defined by his paranoia and an obsession with producing an heir. He would visit one of his 3 wives every night. Finally, his second wife Alis was pregnant. However, she went into labor extremely early, giving birth to a monstrous-looking child. Maegor was convinced the child could not be his and that she must have cheated on him, resulting in everyone involved in the birth being executed. His third wife, Tiana, claimed that she did indeed sleep with another man, so Maegor had Alis dragged from her bed and gave her to Tiana for torture. Everyone related to Alis at King's Landing was killed, including her father, who was still Maegor's hand. After weeks of being tortured by Tiana, Alis eventually died, was cut into 7 pieces, and mounted on spikes above the gates of King's Landing. Maegor then marched on Harrenhal and killed any man, woman, and child related to Alis, resulting in the extinction of House Haraway and House Towers being granted Harrenhal. Upon returning to King's Landing, Maegor Maegor found out that his mother, Visenya, passed away. Without her, his rule became even more erratic and cruel. In the chaos that followed, Aenys' widow, Alyssa, escaped across the narrow sea with her 2 youngest children, prompting Maegor to have Queen Tiana torture her son Viserys for 9 days. His mutilated corpse was then publicly displayed in the courtyard in an attempt to draw Alyssa back. Maegor's cruelty continued after the construction of the Red Keep in 45 AC, where he executed everyone who worked on it to ensure its secrets remained hidden. He then ordered the construction of the Dragon Pit at the site of the wrecked Steps of Remembrance. However, his reputation caused most of the workers to flee the city, leaving him forced to rely on prisoners from the dungeons to have it constructed instead. Shortly after the completion of the Red Keep, Maegor's first wife Cerys suddenly got sick and died, resulting in a rumor that Maegor had her killed. It is believed that he had a member of the Kingsguard remove her tongue, and while she struggled, her throat was slashed instead. Maegor went on a year-long campaign hunting down and slaughtering the poor fellows and warrior sons, attempting to put an end to the rebellion. He returned to King's Landing with 2,000 skulls, although many believe the victims were innocent smallfolk. Meanwhile, the cost of his wars and projects drained the treasury, forcing oppressive taxation that resulted in even more hatred for him among both nobles and commoners. By 47 AC, Maegor still had no heirs, so he decided to get married again, but this time to 3 wives to triple his chances of getting a son. In a single ceremony, he wed Lady Eleanor Costane, Lady Jane Westerling, and not only his niece, but also the widow of Prince Aegon, Princess Rhaena. In fact, the other 2 women were also widows due to Maegor's wars, which resulted in them receiving the nickname the Black Brides. Not long after, both Jane and Eleanor became pregnant. However, Queen Jane's child was born 3 months early, with it being legless and armless, as well as having both male and female genitals. Jane died after giving birth, and this fueled rumors that Maegor was cursed by the gods. Maegor got suspicious, prompting him to have his 3rd wife Tiana sent to the dungeons, and before even being tortured, she confessed to poisoning both Alicey's child years prior, as well as Jane's. Before Tiana was executed by Maegor himself, she told him that Queen Eleanor's baby will still be born a monster even if she was killed. Sure enough, 2 months later, Eleanor birthed an eyeless child with small wings. In 48 AC, Alyssa Valerion returned to Westeros with her 2 children, Jaehaerys and Alicent, arriving at Storm's End. Jaehaerys, now the only living son of the late King Aenys, had a claim to the throne, and thanks to his dragon Vermithor, as well as his sister Silverwing, many lords believed he could have a shot at securing the throne and finally putting an end to Maegor's cruelty. His second cousin, Lord Rhaegar Baratheon, was the first great lord to openly support his claim, and other great houses such as House Lannister, Hightower, Tyrell, Arryn, and Tully followed. Though only 14, Jaehaerys publicly denounced Maegor as a usurper, swearing to put an end to his tyranny. After his sister Rhaena, the 6th wife of Maegor, heard of this, she escaped King's Landing, taking the sword Blackfire with her and giving it to Jaehaerys. Quickly, many who had once served Maegor began to abandon him. He called his banners, but few answered, leaving him with an army of barely 4,000 men. Despite this, he refused to surrender. His reign, however, would not end in battle. Maegor was found dead upon the Iron Throne by Queen Eleanor, with his robe soaked in blood, his wrist slashed, and one of the throne's blades driven through the back of his neck. The truth of his death was never discovered. Some claimed Eleanor was responsible, others whispered a betrayal by his own Kingsguard. Many believed the throne itself had killed him, and of course some argued that he had taken his own life. But in the end, it did not matter. Maegor had ruled through fear and cruelty, and by the time he died, he stood alone. Whether by blade, betrayal, or his own hand, his death felt less like a mystery and more like an inevitability. With Maegor dead, Jaehaerys ascended the throne, bringing in a much more peaceful era where he sought reconciliation. The Faith Militant Uprising, which had gone on for years, was finally brought to an end not through war, but through diplomacy. As he was still only 14 when he took the throne, his mother Alyssa would serve as Queen Regent for the first 2 years of his reign, and Lord Rhaegar Baratheon would serve as Hand of the King. Despite his young age, he decided he did not want to sit back passively and do nothing. He involved himself deeply in governance, listening, learning, and quietly asserting his authority. Jaehaerys' first actions as king were very important and had to be handled delicately. Lords who had supported Maegor were largely pardoned and restored to their lands, although he required a son or daughter as hostage from each, or gold to ensure loyalty. Only those directly responsible for atrocities, such as the torture and death of his brother Viserys, were punished. But perhaps his greatest early achievement came in repairing the conflict between the Iron Throne and the Faith of the Seven. Through careful diplomacy, Jaehaerys reached an agreement that would reshape the relationship between Crown and Faith for generations. The Faith Militant was disbanded, the Crown promised to protect the Faith, and in return, the Faith relinquished its right to independent judgment. This resulted in the creation of the doctrine of exceptionalism, which argued that Targaryens, as Dragon Lords, were set apart from other men and thus not bound by the same rules, specifically regarding incestuous marriage. Speaking of marriage, Jaehaerys' sister Rhaena was married to a man in Fair Isle. Not long after, a marriage between Queen Regent Alyssa and Lord Rhaegar Baratheon occurred in 49 AC, remembered as the Golden Wedding. Although Jaehaerys respected Rhaegar, the marriage bothered him as Jaehaerys had not been consulted about their wedding. He spoke to a septon about it, claiming he did not need a new father, and that he felt that he was even more intelligent than Rhaegar. He also thought that this could be a power move on Rhaegar's behalf, not a result of him having real affection for his mother. Nonetheless, Jaehaerys did not object to the marriage. Following the wedding, there were talks between the small council about who Jaehaerys should marry, as he needed an heir. They discussed this when Jaehaerys was absent, as his mother knew he would choose his sister Alicent. The recent memory of the Faith militant uprising still lingered, and they were wary of reigniting another conflict. Despite this, no acceptable political match for the king could be agreed upon. Instead, they attempted to have Alicent betrothed to Sir Oren Baratheon. When Jaehaerys learned of this, he went directly to his sister and decided to plan a secret marriage between them. They flew their dragons to Dragonstone and were wedded in a private ceremony. Although they were now married, Jaehaerys refused to consummate the marriage, believing Alicent was too young. Their secrecy, however, was short-lived. Alyssa and Rhaegar arrived on Dragonstone, having learned of the king's actions. Rhaegar declared that since the marriage had not been consummated, it was not official and ordered his men to seize them. The Kingsguard refused the Hand's command, forming a barrier around Jaehaerys and Alicent, claiming that Rhaegar would be the first to die if his men attacked them. Alyssa and Rhaegar returned to King's Landing, and no announcement was made to the realm about the king's marriage, with it remaining a secret. During his stay at Dragonstone, Jaehaerys understood that ruling required more than wisdom. It also demanded strength. Each morning, from dawn until midday, he sparred relentlessly against seasoned warriors, including members of his own Kingsguard. Within a year, Jaehaerys had transformed himself into a capable and confident fighter, ensuring he would never be mistaken for weak. Meanwhile, as lords visited Jaehaerys at Dragonstone, none could fail to notice that Alicent was always at Jaehaerys' side, with whispers starting to spread through the realm. Queen Regent Alyssa was eventually forced to acknowledge before the council that the marriage would have to be accepted. Rhaegar, however, refused to yield. Frustrated, he proposed to set Jaehaerys aside entirely and crown Princess Aeria Targaryen in his place, the daughter of Rhaena. Because of this act of betrayal, Rhaegar was quickly dismissed as Hand of the King by his own wife. Not long after, Jaehaerys finally turned 16. He returned to King's Landing on his dragon, reconciled with his mother, and immediately got started on reshaping the small council. Some members were dismissed, others kept, and new men were appointed, all based entirely on their ability. Rhaegar was then summoned before the throne to answer for his betrayal. Jaehaerys acknowledged Rhaegar's past loyalty and chose to pardon him, but the terms were that Rhaegar would never again speak against his king or queen, and he would honor his marriage to Alyssa. With order restored at court, Jaehaerys turned his attention to the realm's finances, which had been left in disarray. Under the guidance of Rhaego Draz, the crown's debts were stabilized enough for work on the Dragon Pit to resume, but the king understood that deeper reform was needed. He devised a taxation system that placed duties on exotic goods and costly imports. He also imposed a heavy tax on castle construction and expansion. In 51 AC, as stability returned to the realm, Queen Alicent at last joined her husband in King's Landing, and their long-hidden union was brought into the open. Although Jaehaerys understood that the realm had changed, with the faith being weakened and less militant, he did not rely on this. Instead, he and Alicent chose to travel the realm together on Dragonback. Wherever they went, Vermithor and Silverwing accompanied them, discouraging rebellion without a word being spoken. In addition, 7 speakers were sent across the realm to preach the doctrine of exceptionalism, spreading Jaehaerys' wisdom and Alicent's kindness, with this helping shape public perception. Not long after, Alicent announced that she was pregnant. Starting in the Crownlands, Jaehaerys and Alicent began the first of their many royal progresses, visiting lords both great and small. He did this to rebuild trust after the chaos of Maegor's reign, yet even in these early efforts, tragedy struck. At Maidenpool, the pregnant Queen Alicent was attacked by 3 holy sisters at Jonquil's pool. Jaehaerys immediately ended the progress and returned her to the safety of the Red Keep. Nonetheless, Jaehaerys went through with completing his progress. In 53 AC, while in the Riverlands, he received word that Alicent had given birth to a daughter, Princess Daenerys. While traveling home, Jaehaerys learned that his mother was dying at Storm's End right before she was supposed to give birth. He and Alicent rushed to her side, but nothing could be done to save her. They were informed that her child could still be saved, but she had to be cut open, and this broke her husband, Rhaegar. They went through with cutting her open, and as Alyssa died, she gave birth to a daughter named Jocelyn Baratheon. Rhaena arrived too late to see her mother alive, and in a fit of rage, she accused Rhaegar of causing her death, grabbing his beard and threatening to burn Storm's End if he ever had another wife or failed his children in any way. In 55 AC, Jaehaerys started to create a unified legal code, although it would take several decades to be finished. That same year, construction of the Dragon Pit was finally completed, and Jaehaerys continued his royal progresses, though Alicent, once again pregnant, remained behind. Their son Aemon was born soon after. The following year, Jaehaerys' niece Aeria returned to King's Landing on Balerion the Blacktrade after visiting Valyria. She was extremely ill and died shortly after her return. It was discovered that there was something living inside of her skin, as it could be seen moving around, and as she was dying, her flesh continued to grow darker, with smoke even coming out of her mouth, nose, and vagina. When she was placed into a tub of ice, the thing living inside of her would make terrifying noises, eventually dying dying shortly after. It is not known what this creature was, but it is assumed that they reside in the now destroyed Valyria. Shortly after, Jaehaerys had Balerion confined to the Dragon Pit, as he was now very old and slow. Jaehaerys also created a new order of 77 warriors, known as the Dragon Keepers, to guard the dragons. In 57 AC, Alicent gave birth to another child, Prince Baelon. That same year, Jaehaerys appointed his good friend Septon Barth as Hand of the King. Barth managed to reduce the crown's debt significantly, allowing Jaehaerys to continue developing King's Landing. This resulted in the construction of proper drainage systems, sewers, wells, and fountains, transforming it into a more livable capital. By 58 AC, Jaehaerys turned his attention north, planning a grand progress to Winterfell. When he and Alicent arrived, they received a cold welcome by Lord Alaric Stark, as he secretly blamed Jaehaerys for the death of his brother Walton. Almost a decade before, Lord Walton rode north to help the Watch put down a rebellion. This rebellion was caused by men who previously served Maegor and were exiled to the Wall by Jaehaerys when he first became king. As Walton chased them down north of the Wall into the haunted forest, he was killed by giants that attacked him. After his death, Alaric inherited Winterfell, but it was a bitter moment as he loved his brother deeply. Despite his initial resentment, he started to take a liking to Alicent and Jaehaerys. Although it was summer when the king and queen visited, Alaric warned Jaehaerys that winter is coming. Not long after, in 59 AC, a brutal winter did indeed come, bringing famine and the deadly plague known as the Shivers. The disease ravaged the population, specifically in cities, and claimed many lives, including members of the King's Own Council and Kingsguard. Law and order broke down in King's Landing, and it even claimed the life of the 6-year-old princess Daenerys. Her death devastated Jaehaerys, but not long after, the disease started to die down and the 2-year winter came to an end. In 60 AC, Alicent birthed her 5th child, Princess Alyssa. By 61 AC, the king sought to reassert strength through action, joining Rhaegar Baratheon in defeating the new Vulture King during the Third Dornish War. Unlike the invisible enemy of disease, this was a foe he could face directly, and this victory restored both his confidence and his reputation. Fighting alongside his men, Jaehaerys proved that he was not weak, bringing in respect and support from many. Not long after, Rhaegar died quietly at Storm's End. The decades that followed were looked at as the golden years of Jaehaerys' reign. Over the course of the next 18 years, he and Alicent would have 8 more children: Maegor, Vaegon, Daella, Saera, Visera, Gaemon, Valerion, and Gale, making the total number of children they had together 13. Unfortunately, only a handful of them would survive to adulthood. While his family grew, Jaehaerys also turned his attention to the realm itself. In 62 AC, he ordered the construction of a vast network of roads, the greatest of which would become known as the King's Road, stretching all throughout Westeros. His eldest son, Prince Aemon, was named Prince of Dragonstone and heir to the throne that same year, while also securing a strong alliance through marriage to his aunt Jocelyn Baratheon in 70 AC. Their union brought in Jaehaerys' first grandchild, Rhaenys. Not long after, his second son Baelon wed his sister Alyssa, and they eventually birthed 2 sons, Viserys and Daemon. These next generations, all dragon riders, with legendary dragons such as Caraxes, Vhagar, and Meleys among them, ensured that House Targaryen remained both feared and respected. In the late 70s AC, the king faced challenges within his own family. His son Vaegon rejected both courtly life and dragon riding, choosing instead the Citadel, where he would eventually become an Archmaester, earning him the nickname the Dragonless. His daughter Daella was ultimately wed to Lord Roderick Arryn in 80 AC. However, tragedy came 2 years later when she died in childbirth, leaving behind a daughter, Aemma Arryn. In 83 AC, the 4th Dornish War began. Unlike earlier clashes with raiders and pretenders along the Dornish marches, this conflict was led by a Prince of Dorne, Morion Martell. Morion felt insulted by the result of the previous Dornish War, and when he inherited the seat of House Martell, he decided to pursue direct conflict by invading the Stormlands. After acquiring ships from pirates in the Stepstones and making their way to Cape Wrath, the king was already waiting for him. Jaehaerys mounted on Vermithor alongside his sons. Aemon upon Caraxes and Baelon upon Vhagar descended from the skies and destroyed their entire fleet. Unfortunately, another tragedy for the king and queen occurred again in the following year, as their daughter Alyssa died from childbirth and her infant son soon after, leaving her brother Prince Baelon shattered. Later that year, one of Jaehaerys' daughters, Princess Saera, had sex with 3 young knights, comparing herself to Maegor, claiming she could marry all 3 of them. After failed attempts at discipline, Saera fled across the narrow sea, eventually arriving at Lys and becoming a whore. Shortly after, his other daughter Visera died in a drunken fall after resisting an unwanted marriage. All of these tragedies surrounding Jaehaerys' daughters occurring in such a small period of time took a toll on him. He became thin and his beard started to turn gray. In 84 AC, he turned 50, and he gained the nickname the Old King instead of the Conciliator. From this moment, a rift grew between Jaehaerys and his wife, and eventually what became known as the First Quarrel occurred, with Alicent living apart from Jaehaerys in Dragonstone for 2 years. Jaehaerys decided to travel from the Westerlands to the Reach. He inspected his roads and visited lords, but he was mostly just trying to avoid the pain that awaited him at home. It was only in 89 AC AC through the intervention of their daughter Maegor that Jaehaerys and Alicent were reunited. A year later, his granddaughter Aenys, who was the oldest child of the heir to the throne Aemon, wed the famed seafarer Corlys Velaryon. It was a grand celebration, but one of the last times the family would gather in such a way. In 92 AC, Aemon was slain suddenly by a crossbow bolt to the neck while fighting Myrish pirates on Tarth. In the aftermath, Jaehaerys made a choice that would create one of the most bitter disputes of his life. Rather than naming his granddaughter Aenys as heir, he instead passed her over in favor of his second son Baelon. Though Baelon was widely admired, the decision was controversial. None took greater offense than Queen Alicent, which caused the second quarrel. Although they restored peace not long after, this disagreement made her feel resentment towards her husband. Corlys also felt insulted, resulting in him leaving the small council in protest and withdrawing to Driftmark with Aenys, in which they would go on to have two children, Laena and Laenor. As for the now 16-year-old Viserys, son of Baelon, he entered the Dragon Pit in 93 AC and claimed Balerion. However, the Blackdread was too old and weak for proper flying, dying only a year later. That same year, Viserys was wed to his cousin, Aemma Arryn, to strengthen ties between great houses. After several miscarriages, they finally had a daughter in 97 AC, naming her Rhaenyra. Meanwhile, Viserys' younger brother Daemon entered a political marriage with Lady Rhea Royce, a noblewoman of the Vale. However, Daemon did not like his wife or her homeland, openly mocking both. In 98 AC, a grand tourney was held in King's Landing to celebrate the 50th year of Jaehaerys' reign. During this tourney, Sir Ryan Redwyn and Sir Clement Crabbe shattered 30 lances between them before being declared co-champions, with this moment being one of the most legendary in Westeros chivalry history. Some weeks later, Jaehaerys' closest friend and most trusted advisor, Septon Barth, died quietly in his sleep, leaving a void in governance. After his death, Ryan Redwyn was appointed as Hand, but due to his lack of skill in ruling, he was quickly replaced by Baelon. Then, in 99 AC, tragedy struck again with the death of Princess Gale, the youngest of Jaehaerys' children. Though it was announced she died from an illness, she had actually taken her own life. The loss shattered Queen Alicent, and within a year, weakened by grief, she passed away as well. In 101 AC, Prince Baelon, now heir and hand of the king, died suddenly from a burst appendix, leaving the succession once more uncertain. Fearing that the realm might descend into civil war between the claims of Rhaenys' line and that of Baelon's sons, Jaehaerys turned to his surviving son Vaegon for counsel. Vaegon proposed that the Great Council should determine the succession. Lords from across the Seven Kingdoms gathered at Harrenhal to decide the future of the Iron Throne. The choice narrowed down to Rhaenys' son Laenor and Baelon's son Viserys. In the end, the lords overwhelmingly favored Viserys. Jaehaerys, too frail to attend, accepted their decision and formally named his grandson Prince of Dragonstone. By this time, the king himself had become a shell of the ruler he once was. He had outlived nearly all his children, most of his trusted advisors, and even the queen who had stood beside him for decades. His strength weakened and his mind began to falter. Governance passed to his final hand, Otto Hightower, while Otto's daughter Alicent attended to the aging king in his final days. In 103 AC, after 55 years upon the Iron Throne, Jaehaerys died quietly in his bed at the age of 69. His body was given to the flames in the Dragon Pit, and his ashes were laid to rest beside Alicent on Dragonstone, with the two reunited at last in death. The realm he left behind mourned deeply due to his peaceful reign, and his grandson Viserys would succeed him. King Viserys I Targaryen, also known as the Young King, began his reign with the Seven Kingdoms unified after decades of peace and prosperity. Viserys was warmly received by both lords and smallfolk who looked upon his reign with optimism. His personal life also looked very bright at the time, as his relationship with his beloved wife Aemma was healthy, and his daughter Rhaenyra was very lively, gaining the love of everyone who met her and the nickname the Realm's Delight. At just 7 years old, she became a dragon rider, claiming the young dragon Syrax. A year later, she served as her father's cupbearer, always at the king's side. As she grew, Rhaenyra developed deep attachments to figures within her orbit, most notably her uncle Daemon. The prince, charismatic and dangerous in battle, fascinated her. Alicent appeared in green, while Rhaenyra wore the red and black of House Targaryen, and from that moment, the rival factions would be known as the Greens and the Blacks. Servant found him cold and unresponsive and instantly told his wife Alicent. Instead of announcing the king's death, she kept it a secret. With the realm still divided between the factions of her son and her stepdaughter, Viserys' passing could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. As tensions escalated, it was obvious that war was inevitable. Other than her husband and children at her side, she also gained Lord Corlys and his wife Rhaenys as allies. It was quickly noted that the Blacks had an advantage in dragons, with 9 of them tamed and 3 wild, compared to the Greens' 4 in King's Landing. As Rhaenyra's sons were crossing the Narrow Sea, the Triarchy fleet intercepted them, destroying and capturing them. Young Viserys, possessing only a dragon egg, was seized and carried off into captivity. His brother Aegon alone escaped, taking flight on his dragon Stormcloud. Arrows and scorpion bolt shot at him, but he managed to return to Dragonstone with his dragon dying from its injuries after landing. Surrounded and facing defeat, they were saved just in time by the arrival of Daeron, the youngest son of Queen Alicent, riding his dragon Tesserion. The Battle of the Honeywire began as Tesserion's flames shattered the enemy forces. It was a decisive green victory, and in its aftermath, Ormond knighted the young prince, who would gain the nickname Daeron the Daring. Elsewhere, Whaley's Mutant succeeded in retaking Rook's Rest for the Blacks, but as he attempted to slay the crippled dragon Sunfire, he was killed. When his surviving men returned, the dragon was gone. In the Riverlands, Aemon and Sir Criston marched towards Harrenhal, where Daemon was, with 4,000 men accompanied by Humphrey Lefford. Pressing eastward to join forces with Aemon and Criston, they stumbled upon Roderick Dustin's hardened veterans of the north, joined by rivermen and Frey levies. More forces closed in from every direction, trapping the Lannister host. The battle by the lakeshore began, and it was the bloodiest land engagement in this war. The fighting went on for hours, with the lake filled with corpses and turning red because of the blood. Rhaenyra summoned her remaining sons to the capital, with young Aegon and Joffrey brought close. However, beyond the city, the war was far from over. At Harrenhal, division fractured the Green Command. Criston urged retreat, seeking to unite with the forces of the Reach under Ormond Hightower and Daeron Targaryen. Aemon sought vengeance. He remained in the Riverlands with Vhagar, unleashing fire and terror across the countryside, in the hope of drawing Rhaenyra into a direct confrontation while Criston marched south. Within King's Landing, Alicent pleaded with Rhaenyra to end the bloodshed, but Rhaenyra, hardened by betrayal and the deaths of her sons, refused. In her eyes, Alicent's children had forfeited any claim to mercy the moment they stole her birthright and plunged the realm into war. In the West, the balance of power shifted dramatically when House Greyjoy entered the war. The Greens had previously attempted to win over Dalton Greyjoy by offering him the position of Master of Ships, but this title did not interest the Ironborn. Rhaenyra's faction understood Dalton far better, offering him what he truly desired: freedom to raid, plunder, and take saltwives along the coast of Westeros. With that, the Ironborn declared for the Blacks and began to attack. Although Casterly Rock itself held firm under the command of Joanna Lannister, Lannisport was not so fortunate, suffering sack and devastation. Meanwhile, between the God's Eye and the Blackwater Rush, Sir Criston's forces were caught by Riverlords and Northmen led by the fierce Roderick Dustin. Criston challenged his enemies to single combat, but they refused him. Surrounded and outnumbered, Criston's army collapsed under the assault, and Sir Criston himself was killed, with this battle being known as the Butcher's Ball. Elsewhere, Daemon established himself at Maidenpool alongside Nettles, the Dragonseed rider of Sheepstealer, while continuing his hunt for Aemon and Vhagar. During this time, Daemon and Nettles grew close, even sharing a bathtub at times, and they eventually fell in love with each other. In the Reach, the Greens advanced toward King's Landing under Lord Ormond and Prince Daeron under his dragon Tesserion, claiming multiple victories. But at the sack of Bitterbridge, the young Prince Maelor, only 3 years old, fell victim to a mob of Rhaenyra's supporters. In the chaos, the child was torn apart as men and women fought over him. When word reached Daeron, he sought vengeance, unleashing dragonfire upon Bitterbridge, reducing the town to ash. Meanwhile, the war reached another turning point at the First Battle of Tumbleton. Rhaenyra's forces were already outnumbered when betrayal struck from within. 2 Dragonseeds, Ulf the White and Hugh Hammer, earned the name the two betrayers here. With their dragons Silverwing and Vermithor, they joined the Greens. Though Lord Ormond Hightower and others fell in the fighting, the Greens ultimately prevailed. Tumbleton was sacked as Tesserion, Vermithor, and Silverwing lit it on fire. The aftermath threw the Blacks into paranoia. If Dragonseeds could betray her once, they could do so again. Suspicion fell upon the remaining riders, including Adam Valerion and Nettles. Despite Lord Corlys's defense of them, Rhaenyra ordered their arrest. Warned in time, Adam fled on Seasmoke, while Corlys himself was imprisoned for his defiance, and trust within the Black faction began to fracture even as their enemies struggled with their own internal chaos. Leadership in the Greens faltered after Ormond's death, with Sir Hobart Hightower unable to control the undisciplined forces. Ulf the White was not pleased with the little rewards he had received, dreaming instead of greater power, even Highgarden itself. Hugh Hammer, even more ambitious, began to imagine himself as king. Desertion spread, and the once formidable Green Army began to unravel from within. Around this time, one of the wild dragons of Dragonstone, Grey Ghost, was mysteriously found dead on the island. It was eventually discovered that Sunfire, the dragon of King Aegon, killed him and returned to Dragonstone to regain its strength. Aegon himself was also not dead, as many believed. During the chaos, he had been smuggled to Dragonstone by Larry Strong. There, he was reunited with Sunfire, and together they began to heal from their wounds in secrecy. Meanwhile, resentment began to grow against Rhaenyra by Dragonstone's inhabitants, and Aegon started to gain support here. When the moment came, Dragonstone easily fell, as the castles were poorly defended. Amid the chaos, Baela, daughter of Daemon, attempted to escape atop her dragon, Moondancer. She took to the skies, but Sunfire rose to meet her. Sunfire's flames blinded Moondancer, and the 2 dragons crashed to the ground. Though Baela survived, she was left burned and broken, taken captive by Aegon's forces. Sunfire, though victorious, was once again badly wounded, while Aegon himself shattered his legs in the fighting. Even so, Dragonstone was now his. Far Far away in Maidenpool, another fracture was forming within Rhaenyra's cause. The queen, consumed by suspicion and grief, issued a command that would further unravel her support. She demanded the head of Nettles, accusing her of treason and of becoming the lover of Daemon. When Nettles learned that Rhaenyra wanted her dead, she mounted Sheepstealer and left Daemon. Instead of chasing her, he focused his attention on finding Aemon. He flew to Harrenhal and took it with little resistance, waiting there for 2 weeks. Aemon finally arrived at Harrenhal and Vhagar, and the two riders took to the sky, with this eventually being known as the Battle Above the God's Eye. Caraxes and Vhagar clashed, and during the fight, Daemon reportedly leapt from his own dragon onto Vhagar. He drove his sword through Aemon's blind eye, killing him instantly. Moments later, the two dragons locked together, crashed into the waters of the God's Eye below. Caraxes, mortally wounded, managed to crawl from the lake and drag himself to the walls of Harrenhal before dying. Vhagar sank beneath the waters, where her remains would lie for years before being discovered. Daemon disappeared without a trace, and some believe he perished in the lake, while others believe he survived and flew away to live out his days beside Nettles. Back in King's Landing, Rhaenyra's hold on power started to unravel. When word spread that Lord Corlys, her most powerful ally, had been imprisoned in the Black Cells, the Valyrian fleet abandoned her cause. These ships had made up more than half the strength that had carried her to victory in the capital, and their sudden withdrawal left her exposed. That same day, Queen Helena, completely broken by grief and madness, jumped from Maegor's holdfast, impaling herself upon the spikes below. However, rumors spread that she had been killed at Rhaenyra's command. Hundreds of Goldcloaks were attempting to restore order, but they were overwhelmed by a mob numbering in the thousands. In the chaos, a hedge knight named Sir Perkin the Flea proclaimed that his squire Trystane Truefire was a bastard son of King Viserys, and he crowned him as king. Promising knighthood to any who joined him, Perkin gained followers quickly, turning rebellion into open insurrection. By the next day, the city was divided. Some districts remained under control, but much of King's Landing had slipped into anarchy. The following night, rioters seized control of the King's Gate, the Lion Gate, and the River Gate. With 3 of the 7 gates in enemy hands, the city lay open, and faith in Rhaenyra's rule collapsed entirely. The small folk no longer believed she could protect them. A figure known as the Shepherd rose to power, claiming the dragons were demons sent to punish mankind. He led a massive mob to the dragon pit with the intention of killing the beast that had brought so much ruin. As the mob pushed forward, Rhaenyra's own son, Prince Joffrey, acted in desperation. Mounting Syrax, who was not accustomed to him, he attempted to fly to the pit to defend it, but Syrax threw him from her back, and the boy fell to his death before ever reaching the battle. To make matters worse, the dragon pit then fell. The mob descended upon the chained dragons, and one by one, the beasts were killed. When Syrax herself descended upon the survivors, she too was slain in the chaos. From atop Maegor's holdfast, Rhaenyra watched as her son and dragon died. With the dragons gone and the city in revolt, her council finally accepted that King's Landing was lost. The next day, Rhaenyra fled the capital, abandoning the throne she had fought so long to claim. At Tumbleton, news of the chaos in King's Landing reached the Green Forces, encouraging thoughts of marching on the capital. Unfortunately for them, leadership was uncertain, with Prince Aemon dead and King Aegon II missing. Some looked to Prince Daeron as the rightful heir, while others, like Hugh Hammer, dreamed of crowns of their own. With the dragon Vermithor at his command, Hugh believed himself worthy of kingship by conquest, and with Ulf the White's support, plans were made to crown him. But not all among the Greens accepted their ambition, and a faction of lords, later known as the Caltrops, conspired to eliminate the two betrayers before their power could grow further. Before these plots could unfold, Tumbleton came under sudden assault. Sir Adam Valerian, once accused of treachery but still loyal to Rhaenyra, descended upon the town with his dragon Seasmoke and an army of rivermen, with reinforcements from House Tully. The Second Battle of Tumbleton began, with Ulf the White sleeping through much of the fighting and eventually being killed, while Hugh Hammer was slain by one of his own supposed allies. Prince Daeron's death remains uncertain as his body was never discovered, but some say he was killed in the fighting, while others claim that he died in a burning building. In the skies above, dragons clashed once more. Seasmoke battled the riderless Tesserion and Vermithor, and in the end, Vermithor tore Seasmoke apart, but succumbed to his own wounds soon after. Tesserion, badly wounded, was slain to end her suffering. Though Adam had struck a devastating blow, he too fell in the battle, and without dragons or siege equipment, his forces could not take Tumbleton. The rivermen withdrew, leaving the town in green hands, but only barely. With Daeron and Hugh dead, the Green Army lost its leadership and began to crumble, and they soon retreated. After fleeing King's Landing, Rhaenyra sought refuge at many different locations, with many denying her entry, and along the way, her forces slowly chipped away either through desertion or surprise attacks. With no ships of her own and unwilling to separate from her son Aegon, Rhaenyra sold her crown to secure passage aboard a Braavosi vessel. With it, she returned to Dragonstone with the hope of rebuilding her strength. Instead, she only met betrayal, and what remained of her army was slaughtered. She and her son were captured and brought within the castle to face her half-brother, King Aegon II. There, Aegon fed Rhaenyra to his dragon before the eyes of her son. Yet even in that moment, Aegon recognized the danger that remained. Rhaenyra's supporters might still rally behind her son, and so Aegon the Younger was taken hostage. Though Aegon II had reclaimed his rival's stronghold, his dragon Sunfire succumbed to his injuries and died. With the death of his dragon, Aegon Aegon lost one of his last sources of strength. Still, he began making plans to return to King's Landing, intent on reclaiming his throne. For weeks, King's Landing descended into anarchy in a period remembered as the Moon of the Three Kings. Competing claimants rose during this time. Trystane Truefire was living in the Red Keep, with Ser Perkin ruling through him. At the same time, another pretender known as Gaemon Palehair emerged, a child said to be the bastard son of Aegon II, who was crowned in a brothel on Visenya's Hill. Order was eventually restored when Lord Boros Baratheon seized King's Landing in Aegon's name, and the pretenders were quickly dealt with. Gaemon was imprisoned while Trystane was executed. From the depths of the dungeons, Lord Corlys was freed and restored to power, joining Aegon's small council. With no sons left, Aegon agreed to marry one of Boros' daughters, seeking to secure his line and strengthen his position. Yet even as the capital was brought back under control, the war was not over. Lord Boros marched out to meet the advancing Riverlords, a force led by young but formidable commanders, such as Kermit Tully and Benjamin Blackwood. The Battle of the King's Road erupted, and due to Boros' overconfidence, his forces were outmaneuvered, his flank broken, and his knights brought down by archers. Though Boros himself fought fiercely, he was ultimately cut down by Lord Tully. With their defeat, King's Landing stood nearly defenseless. The Riverlords advanced toward the city, while the disciplined forces of Lord Cregan Stark marched south to join them. Reinforcements from the Vale were also on the move. Faced with inevitable defeat, Aegon II was urged to surrender. Lord Corlys advised him to take the Black and join the Night's Watch, but Aegon refused. Instead, he ordered that his nephew, Aegon the Younger, have an ear cut off and sent to the approaching army as a warning, and that if his line perished, so would Rhaenyra's. Shortly after, Aegon II was found dead, his lips stained with poisoned wine, with the identity of the killer remaining a mystery. In the end, the Dance of the Dragons consumed both sides, leaving behind a shattered realm. In mid-131 AC, 10-year-old Aegon III Targaryen was to be crowned the King of Westeros. Following the cremation of Aegon II, a fragile peace began. The Riverlords who had marched on King's Landing bent the knee to the boy king. Leaders such as Corlys helped stabilize the city, offering pardons to former enemies in an effort to prevent further bloodshed. Lord Cregan arrived in King's Landing and quickly seized control of the city in what became known as the Hour of the Wolf. The young king was confined to Maegor's holdfast for his own safety, and even visits from his half-sisters Baela and Rhaena unsettled him, specifically when he saw Rhaena's baby dragon. Rumors spread wildly throughout the city, with some claiming Cregan intended to claim power for himself. In reality, Cregan's purpose was to bring justice to those responsible for the death of Aegon II. At first, he hoped to continue the war, planning campaigns against Storm's End, Old Town, and Casterly Rock. However, Corlys had already sent envoys offering peace to these strongholds. After 6 days of Cregan holding the court under his control, word returned that the major green-aligned houses had accepted peace, but Cregan insisted that justice must still be met. Declaring that a king should die in battle, not by poison, he launched an investigation into the death of Aegon II. 22 men were arrested, including powerful figures such as Corlys. To carry out these trials, Cregan was named Hand of the King, ruling in Aegon's name. However, Aegon, encouraged by Baela and Rhaena, intervened, freeing Corlys from detainment. To ensure this decision stood, Alicent Blackwood agreed to marry Cregan, forging a political and personal alliance that helped secure Corlys' life. Most of the accused chose to take the Black and join the Night's Watch rather than face execution. In the end, only 2 men, Varys Strong and Sir Giles Belgrave, were condemned to die, with Cregan personally carrying out their sentences. With justice served, Cregan resigned as Hand the very next day, having accomplished what he came to do, and he returned back to Winterfell. Aegon III was wed to his cousin Jaehaerys, uniting the rival branches of House Targaryen. Following the wedding, Aegon was formally crowned in King's Landing. One of Aegon's first official acts as king was to restore structure to court. He filled the 5 vacant positions in the Kingsguard, and soon after, key officials were appointed. Tyland Lannister was named Hand of the King, while Leowyn Corbray named Protector of the Realm. Above them sat a council of regents, who would rule for Aegon until he became of age. Though he technically had ultimate authority, Aegon rarely exercised it. He appeared on the Iron Throne only when required by ceremony or duty, and otherwise remained out of sight. The regents ruling in the name of Aegon were divided on how to handle the former Queen Alicent. Executing her was considered too dangerous as it could reignite a war, yet allowing her to move freely within court was equally unthinkable, even if she was the new queen's grandmother. Alicent had grown unpredictable, with her at one point urging her granddaughter to kill her husband in his sleep, an outburst that left Jaehaerys terrified. The Hand, Tyland, decided to remove her from court life altogether, having her confined to her own chambers. Aegon's marriage to Jaehaerys was also troubled. Aegon was 11, Jaehaerys only 8, and both had deep emotional scars from the war. Their union was political, not personal, and they spent little time together beyond formal occasions. Jaehaerys preferred the isolation of her chambers, while Aegon showed little interest in companionship. Grand Maester Munkin wrote to the Citadel describing Aegon and Jaehaerys as broken, warning that they were not like other children, and questioning what such a king and queen might mean for the future of the realm. In 132 AC, the death of Corlys brought new uncertainty. With the sea snake gone, the question about who would inherit the throne if Aegon died arose. When asked directly, Aegon named Gaemon Palehair, a former pretender and the only friend he seemed to trust. The suggestion was quickly dismissed, seen as further evidence of the king's detachment from reality and politics. The regents instead considered potential male heirs of Aegon's half-sisters, Baela and Rhaena, and plans were made to secure marriages for both of them. Baela, however, refused to be used as a political tool, fleeing to Driftmark and marrying her cousin Alan Valerion. Rhaena was more compliant, selecting Corwyn Corbray as her husband. Later that year, a devastating winter hit Westeros, and a deadly sickness known as the Winter Fever emerged. It began in a small town in the Vale called Sisterton, where it quickly killed half the population. The survivors, desperate for someone to blame, turned on foreign whalers they believed had brought the disease, slaughtering many innocents. From the sisters, the plague crossed the Bight to White Harbor. It spread from Goldtown to Maidenpool, then to Duskendale, and by early 133 AC, it had reached King's Landing. The first victims in the capital were those closest to the water. From there, it spread rapidly through the crowded streets, and despite efforts to conceal it by closing the gates, it made no difference. As death swept through the capital, the young king did something unexpected. Rather than hiding behind walls, he walked among the sick. He sat beside the dying, held their hands, and cooled their fevers with damp cloths. He spoke little, but listened, offering what comfort he could. Most he visited would die, but those who lived would later remember his quiet presence as a rare kindness in a time of despair. The hand, Tywin Lannister, also passed away from the disease, and Aegon held his hand in his final moments. Within Maegor's holdfast, Alicent became sick, and in her final days, she confessed her sins. She died not long after. The plague ravaged King's Landing, killing nearly 1/5 of its population. Across the realm, it killed 3 out of every 4 it infected. In the aftermath of Tywin Lannister's death, the 12-year-old king acted with a maturity beyond his years. He had powerful allies summoned to court, and among them were Thaddeus Rowan, whom Aegon intended to name as Hand of the King, Alan Valerion as Admiral, and his cousin Baela Targaryen. These decisions, however, never came to fruition. The regency, now controlled by Unwin Peake and Munkin, overturned every one of the king's commands. With Munkin's backing, Peake named himself Hand of the King and Protector of the Realm, consolidating power in his own hands. Aegon received these insults in silence, but feeling a deep resentment towards him. Peake continued filling the court with his own allies, tightening his grip on power. The harshness of Peake's rule was made clear when Aegon was forced to watch prisoners being dragged from the dungeons and publicly tortured or executed. Some cried out to the king for mercy, but Aegon stood motionless. Later that same year, tragedy struck again when his young queen Jaehaerys died, and it was ruled that she had taken her own life. Seizing the opportunity, Peake attempted to bind the crown more tightly to himself by proposing that Aegon wed his own daughter, Miriel. The proposal was met with widespread opposition. Lords across the realm, including Cregan, condemned the match. Under pressure, Peake instead announced a grand ball on Maiden's Day, where the king would choose his own bride. In the weeks leading up to it, Peake ensured his daughter spent time with Aegon, hoping to influence his choice. Seated upon the Iron Throne, Aegon showed little interest in all but one of the girls who were presented to him, with that girl being Daenerys Valerion. Soon after, he made his decision. Through Gaemon, he announced that he would marry Daenerys. Peake objected, arguing the king needed an older bride to produce heirs, but the other regents overruled him. The marriage was held on the last day of the year. For a brief time, the marriage seemed to lift Aegon's spirits. He became more visible in court, even venturing outside the Red Keep to show his young queen the city. He began attending meetings of the small council, showing a renewed interest in governance, but this was short-lived. Peake viewed the king's participation as an intrusion. Whenever Aegon asked questions, he was dismissed or mocked. Gradually, the king withdrew once more. In 134 AC, Lord Alan Valerion returned to King's Landing from his first great voyage, bringing with him something no one had expected. Though Peake had forbidden the king from attending the reception at the docks, the regents overruled him. Aegon, accompanied by his young queen Daenerys, went to greet the returning fleet. Standing before the king was his long-lost brother Viserys, believed dead since the Battle of the Gullet years earlier. The reunion shattered the guilt Aegon had carried since leaving his brother behind, which helped restore his confidence. Peake was outraged by the immense ransom Alan had paid to secure Viserys' freedom, and in fury he threatened to resign his hand. This time, the regency did not resist and accepted his resignation, replacing him with Thaddeus Rowan. Even so, Peake's influence lingered, as his allies remained in power. For Aegon, however, Viserys' return changed everything. Viserys became Aegon's constant companion, easing the king's loneliness in a way no one else could. Yet this closeness came at a cost, as he began to neglect others in his life. His queen Daenerys was often overlooked, and his longtime friend Gaemon faded into the background. Viserys had not returned alone. With him came his wife Lara Rogaire, and members of her powerful Lycian family. The following year, Lara gave birth to a son, named Aegon in honor of the king. With this, the royal succession seemed secure, and the newborn was even given a dragon egg. But dragons had become a source of dread for Aegon. When news reached him that another child, Laena Valerion, Aegon had been injured by a malformed baby dragon, Aegon reacted quickly. All dragon eggs were ordered to be removed from the Red Keep and sent to Dragonstone. Viserys, who still believed in their family's bond with dragons, was furious. The decision drove a wedge between the brothers, and for a month, Viserys refused to speak to the king. During this time, Aegon started spending more time with Daenerys. During a quiet meal with her and his friend Gaemon, the two suddenly became very ill. The court soon realized they were poisoned. Daenerys was saved, but Gaemon died within the hour, and this broke Aegon. Viserys set aside his anger and returned to comfort his brother, and while this helped, the darkness returned to Aegon, leaving him once again withdrawn and indifferent to the world around him. The poison was soon identified as the deadly Tears of Lys, baked into apple tarts. Aegon himself had been spared only because he rarely ate sweets. An investigation was launched, but no reliable information came forward. As suspicion spread, it fell upon the Rhaegarys of Lys. One brother fled, and the others were seized by the Goldcloaks. When Sir Amori Peake of the Kingsguard arrived with armed men to arrest Lara Rhaegar, he expected compliance. Instead, he found the drawbridge barred by Prince Viserys and King Aegon. Amori's men tried advancing nonetheless, but they were met by Sandok the Shadow, Lara's sworn protector. Sandok cut them down to the last man, and with the immediate threat eliminated, the gates were sealed. Aegon, Viserys, Queen Daenerys, Lara Rhaegar, and a handful of attendants locked themselves inside the holdfast, which began an 18-day standoff often called the Secret Siege. Over the course of many days, the besiegers tried different tactics to convince the king to yield, but he stayed determined. Inside the holdfast, conditions worsened as food ran dangerously low. Queen Daenerys wept herself to sleep from hunger, and some attendants grew so weak they could barely stand. Yet Aegon and Viserys refused to open the gates. Only when they witnessed ravens being sent to loyal lords across the realm did they finally yield. By then, the immediate threat had passed, but the damage was done. The siege revealed a court rotting from within, divided by ambition, fear, and distrust. It also revealed something else. Beneath Aegon's silence and grief, there was still a king capable of judgment, resolve, and command when it mattered most. In 136 AC, Lord Torrhen Manderly, a man that seemed removed from the toxic rivalries that had plagued the court, was named Hand of the King, but Aegon seemed to have little interest in him. That same year, Aegon finally turned 16, assuming direct control of the realm, and he instantly appeared before the small council, dismissing both his regent and his hand, Lord Torrhen. Meanwhile, Viserys and his wife Lara had a second son, naming him Aemon. Like his brother Aegon, a dragon egg was placed in the cradle, but his arrival revealed early tensions within the family. While most celebrated, the young toddler Aegon reacted with jealousy, as he was at one point found hitting his infant brother with the dragon egg that was gifted to him. A couple of years later, Viserys and Lara had another child, this time a daughter named Nerys. She was born ill, nearly dying as a baby, and she remained sickly throughout her life. Unlike her brothers, Nerys was not drawn to physical pursuits. She preferred music, poetry, and reading, and was deeply religious. As children, Nerys and Aemon grew very close. Aegon was bold and often harsh, whereas Aemon was everything Nerys admired, gentle, charming, and kind. Meanwhile, Aemon grew into one of the finest knights of his generation. He was gifted with swordsmanship, and even formidable warriors such as Cregan Stark would later praise his skill, claiming they had never faced a finer swordsman. In 139 AC, their mother Lara returned to Lys, leaving her children behind in Westeros, and she died there not long after. This not only affected the children, but especially Viserys, who became less charming and more stern. Over the course of Aegon III's reign, he became known as the Broken King, as he continued to carry the weight of the Dance of the Dragons throughout his life. His withdrawn personality never vanished, and he found little joy in anything. It took him 10 years to finally consummate the marriage with his wife Daenerys. Together, they eventually produced 5 children, his heir Daeron in 143 AC, Baelor, Dana, Rhaena, and Elena. Despite having children, he still seemed overall dissatisfied with life. As king, Aegon's reign was peaceful and focused on restoring a realm devastated by war. However, his distant nature prevented him from building strong personal bonds with his lords. Governance fell to his brother Viserys, who served as his hand in later years. Together, the brothers dealt with various threats to stability, including a series of pretenders who falsely claimed to be Prince Daeron, brother of the late Aegon II, but all were quickly exposed as imposters. Traumatized by dragons, Aegon came to loathe the creatures. During his reign, the last dragons of Westeros dwindled and died. Many blamed Aegon for their extinction, some even whispering that he poisoned the last of them. Whether true or not, he gained the nickname Aegon the Dragonbane. Ironically, Aegon also understood the power dragons once represented. He at one point urged Viserys to bring mages from Essos in an attempt to hatch dragon eggs through sorcery. The effort failed, making this one of the last serious attempts to restore the dragons to the world. By 153 AC, tensions that had been growing between Viserys' children finally came to a head when their father arranged for his son Aegon to marry his sister Nerys, with the approval of King Aegon III. At the wedding feast, Aemon argued with his brother Aegon, who was unwilling to hide his anger. That night, during the bedding ceremony, Nerys wept. Shortly after the wedding, at 17 years old, Aemon joined the Kingsguard, swearing vows that would make him serve for life. Although he was an honorable desirable young man. He most likely did this after it was made impossible for him to marry his sister Nerys, who he loved. On the final day of 153 AC, Nerys gave birth to a son, Daeron II. The birth was difficult and nearly killed her. Warned that another pregnancy could be fatal, she pleaded with Aegon to live as brother and sister, now that they had an heir. He refused, and Nerys felt trapped in a marriage she never wanted, wishing she could have married her other brother Aemon instead. Shortly after their marriage, Aegon had 4 bastards over the next few years with a woman named Megat, a girl he secretly wed while still being married to Nerys. When his father Viserys found out about this, he had sent her away, with Aegon never seeing her again. In 157 AC, Aegon III died at the age of 36, reportedly from tuberculosis. Though still relatively young, he was widely perceived as far older due to his worn-down spirit. His reign brought peace, but also little inspiration. Aegon III's heir, Daeron I Targaryen, ascended the Iron Throne in 157 AC at just 14 years old. His uncle Viserys remained as Hand of the King, continuing the role he had held under Aegon. Viserys did not press for a regency, allowing the young king to rule on his own. From the very beginning of his reign, Daeron was driven by a singular ambition, the Conquest of Dorne. To him, its continued independence was an unfinished chapter in Targaryen history. When his counselors warned him that Aegon the Conqueror had failed even with dragons, Daeron answered, "You have a dragon, he stands before you." Though initially doubtful, his council began to take him seriously once Daeron revealed the detailed plans he had developed alongside Alan Valerion, who was a highly respected strategist. Unlike previous attempts, this would not be a standard invasion. It would be a coordinated multi-front campaign designed to avoid the mistakes of the past. Daeron divided his forces into 3 armies. He himself led the main army through the Boneway, one of the most dangerous passes into Dorne. Learning from the disastrous campaign of Orys Baratheon, Daeron avoided the obvious routes where Dornish ambushes were most likely. Instead, he guided his army along narrow paths through the mountains, bypassing traps and striking where the enemy was least prepared. At the same time, a second host under Lionel Tyrell marched through the Prince's Pass, engaging Dornish forces in the west and drawing much of their strength away from Daeron's advance. Meanwhile, the third army came from the sea. Alan Valerion, commanding the royal fleet, launched a naval assault along the Dornish coast. His forces shattered the defenses of Plankytown, a vital port, and then pushed inland via the Greenblood River. By securing the river, Alan prevented the eastern and western Dornish forces from linking up, isolating them and weakening their ability to resist. What followed was a series of battles across Dorne, as Daeron's carefully coordinated strategy began to unfold. Among those who marched with the king were his cousins, including Aegon and his brother Aemon the Dragon Knight. Bringing Aemon proved to be vital, as he at one point threw himself in front of Daeron, taking a hit from a poisoned arrow. Though the wound nearly killed him, Aemon survived and was sent back to King's Landing to recover. Within a year of the invasion's beginning, the campaign started to come to an end. After a series of battles, Targaryen forces eventually advanced on Sunspear. The fighting did not end at the walls, as Daeron's armies pushed into the city, battling through its streets until resistance finally broke. In 158 AC, the submission of Sunspear occurred, where the Prince of Dorne, alongside 40 of the most powerful Dornish lords, bent the knee to Daeron. For the first time in history, all 7 kingdoms were united not just in name, but in fact under the Iron Throne. However, the victory came at the cost of 10,000 men who had died in the campaign, but Daeron had achieved what even Aegon the Conqueror could not. Following the submission, Daeron remained in Dorne for a time to secure his conquest. Due to some still wanting to rebel, 14 highborn Dornish hostages were taken to guarantee the loyalty of their houses. These hostages were entrusted to Daeron's cousin Aegon, who was tasked with escorting them safely to King's Landing. Among them was Lady Castella Vaith, who would later become another one of Aegon's mistresses. By 159 AC, confident that Dorne had been fully conquered, Daeron returned to King's Landing. He left governance of the region in the hands of Lionel Tyrell, charging him with maintaining order and suppressing any renewed resistance. During this period, Daeron also turned his attention to diplomacy. He sought to strengthen trade and security in the region, even proposing a marriage alliance with the Sea Lord of Braavos. The goal was to eliminate piracy that disrupted commerce with Dorne. However, this move had unintended consequences. With Braavos at odds with Pentos and Lys, talk of such an alliance alarmed those free cities, leading them to lend support to Dornish rebels. During all of this, Daeron's siblings, 16-year-old Baelor and 15-year-old Dana, were married, but from the very beginning, the marriage was deeply troubled. Baelor's devotion to the faith of the Seven shaped nearly every aspect of his life, and his marriage was no exception. Baelor refused to consummate the union, as to him, physical desire was something to be resisted even within marriage. For Dana, this was humiliating, and they stayed emotionally detached from one another throughout their marriage. Shortly after Daeron's return to King's Landing, the conquest of Dorne began to unravel almost immediately. The small folk in Dorne did not submit as easily as their lords. Resistance grew across the deserts and mountains, and to maintain maintain control, Lionel Tyrell moved from castle to castle, rooting out rebels and forcing submission wherever he went. One night, while staying at Sandstone, he triggered a deadly trap when he pulled a cord to summon a servant. A canopy above him split open, and 100 red scorpions fell upon him. His death was slow and agonizing. Within weeks, open rebellions started happening all throughout Dorne. Faced with this crisis, Daeron returned to Dorne in 160 AC to restore control. Once again, he led his armies through the Boneway, winning several victories as he pushed into rebellious territory. At the same time, Alan Valerian resumed his naval campaign, striking the Planky Town. Many lives were lost in this renewed fighting. During this period, Aemon the Dragonite returned to the campaign after recovering from his earlier wounds, and he won great fame in Dorne. By 161 AC, the Dornish appeared ready to negotiate once more. Envoys proposed talks to renew their fealty, and Daeron agreed to meet them under a peace banner, but the meeting was a trap. As Daeron arrived, the Dornishman ambushed them. The 18-year-old king fought fiercely, wielding Blackfire, but he was overwhelmed and slain in combat. Most of his Kingsguard died protecting him, but Aemon managed to kill 2 of the attackers before being captured alive. He was imprisoned, placed naked in a crow cage above a pit of vipers. With Daeron's death, the Conquest of Dorne came to a disastrous end. In total, 40 to 50,000 men died. Despite his tragic death, his life would eventually be further recognized in the city of Old Town, where a statue of Daeron would be constructed, depicting him on a horse and lifting his sword toward Dorne. Daeron's body was brought back to King's Landing, and learning how he died enraged many. Viserys ordered the Dornish hostages held in the capital to be thrown into the dungeons, awaiting execution. Daeron's brother, Baelor the First Targaryen, was crowned at the age of 17. His first act as king shocked everyone. He pardoned the Dornish hostages and publicly forgave the killers of his brother. Determined to heal the wounds left by the war, Baelor set out on barefoot to return the hostages to Dorne himself. Upon reaching Sunspear, Baelor's actions created peace with the Prince of Dorne. He secured a marriage alliance between his cousin Prince Daeron and Princess Miriam Martell. He refused the offer of safe passage home by sea, insisting that his trust in the gods will allow him to return home on foot safely. Before leaving Dorne, Baelor demanded his cousin Aemon's release. He was given the key to his cage, forcing the king to retrieve him himself. Ignoring all warnings and trusting in his faith, Baelor stepped into the pit. He was bitten multiple times by the vipers that surrounded the cage, before reaching and freeing Aemon. The venom quickly overcame him, and it fell to the Dragonite to carry him to safety, bringing him to Blackhaven where a Septon provided aid. They then set out to Storm's End. Baelor was on the verge of dying for months, drifting in and out of consciousness. After more than half a year of recovery in Storm's End, he was finally strong enough to return to King's Landing. When Baelor returned to the capital, his first major act was to convince the High Septon to dissolve his marriage to his sister Dana, due to it never being consummated. This decision was controversial, opposed even by his hand Viserys. Soon after, Baelor ordered that his 3 sisters, Dana, Rhaena, and Elena, be confined within a section of the Red Keep that would become known as the Maiden Vault. He claimed this was to preserve their innocence and protect both them and the men of the court from sinful temptation, though many suspected Baelor feared his own weakness as much as that of others. Despite protests from Viserys, the court, and the princesses themselves, the king never changed his decision. The sisters lived in relative comfort, but they were prisoners nonetheless. Elena, desperate for freedom, cut off her beautifully famed hair and sent it to Baelor in hopes of persuading him to release her, but her plea was ignored. Dana, the most defiant of the 3, escaped her confinement 3 times, disguising herself as servants. While Baelor enforced strict control over his family, he also sought to impose moral reform upon the realm. He outlawed prostitution in King's Landing, expelling more than 1,000 women and their children from the city despite warnings from his counselors about the chaos this would cause. Though he prayed for those he cast out, he refused to help them in any meaningful way. At the same time, he devoted himself to religious works, most notably the construction of a grand sept atop Visinia's Hill, later known as the Great Sept of Baelor, which he claimed to have seen in a vision. He also took Septon's vows to ensure he would never marry again. Baelor was also very charitable, often emptying the royal treasury to provide support to the small folk, and they adored him for his generosity. However, his behavior made the nobility unhappy. He attempted to replace messenger ravens with doves, proposed tax exemptions for lords to ensure their daughters would remain abstinent, and even tried to hatch a dragon egg through prayer alone, fasting over it for half a year to no avail. His actions often humiliated the great lords, such as when he forced the proud Lord Belgrave to wash the diseased feet of a beggar. Baelor also ordered the burning of numerous books he deemed sinful or dangerous, including many insightful books by Septon Barth, not because of its content alone, but because of Barth's association with arcane studies. In doing so, Baelor erased valuable knowledge from the realm, driven by his belief that such works led men away from the gods. Meanwhile, Aegon's wife Nerys suffered a traumatic childbirth that resulted in the death of her twin children. In response, Baelor fasted for a month in mourning and sent Aegon away to Braavos on a diplomatic mission, likely doing doing this to protect Daenerys from further suffering. Daenerys herself remained frail but faithful, finding comfort in her companionship of her brother Aemon. Baelor's passion for his faith reached new heights when the High Septon died. Claiming divine guidance, Baelor appointed a humble stonemason named Pate as the new High Septon, believing him to be the incarnation of one of the Seven's faces, the Smith, due to his skill in carving stone. However, Pate was unable to read, write, or perform basic religious duties, and his appointment embarrassed the realm. When Pate died of a fever the following year, rumors spread that Viserys had arranged his death to end the farce. Afterwards, Baelor elevated a random 8-year-old to the position, claiming the boy had performed miracles. In 170 AC, Baelor's cousin, Prince Daeron, finally had his first son with Miriam Martell. They named their son Baelor in honor of King Baelor. Over the following years, they would go on to have 3 more children, naming them Aerys, Rhaegal, and Maekar. While some of Baelor's actions won him the love of the common people, his decisions strained the patience of the nobility and raised questions about his sanity, with some believing the snake venom he had suffered during his journey to Dorne had affected his mind. As time went on, Baelor increasingly turned to prolonged fasting as a way to purge himself of sinful thoughts, specifically those he associated with lust. These fasts grew more severe over time, alarming those around him. His sister and former wife Dana gave birth to a bastard son, whom she named Daemon Waters, in honor of her grandfather. Dana refused to name the child's father, though many suspected it to be her cousin Prince Aegon. In response, Baelor fasted for 40 days, consuming almost nothing except for water and a small amount of bread. Maesters, Septons, and his council made attempts to put an end to his fast, but Baelor wouldn't have it, and they were forced to watch helplessly. In 171 AC, on the 41st day, he collapsed before the altar of the Mother, and Baelor the Blessed died soon after. Though history records that Baelor starved himself to death, not all accepted this explanation. Rumors quickly spread that his uncle in hand, Viserys, may have poisoned him, believing that he had grown tired of waiting for the throne. Others claimed that Viserys acted for the good of the realm, as Baelor started to entertain dangerous religious visions, including the idea of forcibly converting all non-believers in Westeros. Had he acted on such beliefs, it could have ignited catastrophic wars with the North and the Iron Islands. Following his death, his sisters were finally released from the Maiden Vault after nearly a decade of confinement. In the aftermath of Baelor's passing, some voices among the small folk and nobility argued that Dana, as the eldest surviving child of King Aegon III, should inherit the Iron Throne. But Dana's long isolation had left her without allies or influence at court, and her recent childbirth was very controversial. In the end, the crown did not go to Baelor's sisters, but instead passed to his uncle, who ascended the throne as King Viserys II Targaryen. Although Baelor was beloved by the small folk, many are not impressed by his actions, with many viewing him as a crazy religious fool. Nonetheless, the Great Sept of Baelor was constructed years after his death, with his statue being the center of religious worship in the Faith of the Seven. In 171 AC, Viserys II finally became king at the age of 49, and he sought to restore order and stability to the realm. In the short span of a little more than a year, Viserys proved himself an efficient and capable ruler. He reformed the royal household and its administration, strengthened the economy, and worked to expand trade across the Narrow Sea. He also revised and improved the legal code, originally shaped under Jaehaerys I. Many believe that had he lived longer, Viserys might have rivaled Jaehaerys himself as one of Westeros' greatest kings. Yet his reign was cut abruptly short in 172 AC, when he fell suddenly ill and died. Some believe that his oldest son and heir, Aegon, poisoned him so he wouldn't have to wait to become king. Nonetheless, Aegon ascended the Iron Throne as Aegon IV, and from the very beginning, his rule was completely different to his father's. Combining his handsome and charismatic nature with his indulgent and impulsive personality, he quickly surrounded himself with many women. Already having 5 bastards, he would go on to father many more with as many as 9 different mistresses, openly flaunting them at court. These seemingly minor indulgences gradually spiraled into full corruption. Rather than appointing capable and honorable men, he filled his court with companions and people who flattered him, with them existing only to amuse him. Positions of power, including roles within the city watch, were handed out as rewards for loyalty or entertainment value. In turn, these officials ensured that the king's desires, especially his pursuit of women, were constantly satisfied, even at the expense of order. This extended into the politics of the great houses. Aegon granted lands, wealth, and titles on a whim, sometimes enriching one house while stripping another of its rightful inheritance. Rumors spread that he seized lands for personal gain and redistributed them to suit his desires. His actions became increasingly absurd, at one point gifting a dragon egg to a lord simply for hosting him, after allegedly bedding 3 of the lord's daughters in a single night. At court, those closest to Aegon saw the true danger of his nature. His brother Aemon the Dragon Knight, now Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, noticed his disastrous decision-making skills. Tensions also arose between his sister wife Daenerys. Aegon's disliking for her never went away, day, and he would continue to force himself upon her, making her bear more and more children despite the risks to her health. In 172 AC, Daenerys gave birth again, delivering twins, one stillborn boy and a surviving daughter, Daenerys, with this birth yet again nearly killing her. Members at court noticed her frail state, and Aegon's hand, Lord Bracken, discussed the possibility of replacing the queen with his own daughter, Barbara Bracken, who already had a bastard son, known as Aegor Rivers, with Aegon. At the same time, rumors began to spread that Aegon's heir, Prince Daeron, was not truly his son, but rather the child of Aemon the Dragon Knight, whose closeness with Daenerys had long been noted. According to some, these rumors were orchestrated by Aegon himself, possibly as a means of undermining his heir in favor of one of his bastards, most notably Daemon Waters. At one point, a knight formally accused Daenerys of adultery and treason. Aemon defended his sister's honor in a trial by combat, slaying the knight and becoming the subject of songs and legends across the realm. Rather than resolving matters, however, Aemon's growing fame only fueled Aegon's jealousy and resentment. In 174 AC, Aegon began pursuing plans for an unprovoked war against Dorne. Daeron strongly opposed the idea, not only because of his marriage to Miriam Martell, but also recognizing both the cost and uselessness of such a campaign, given the long history of failed attempts to subdue the Dornish. Despite his son's objections, Aegon pressed forward, ordering the construction of a massive fleet, intended to launch an invasion along the Dornish coast. Yet before the fleet could reach its target, it was caught in a violent storm and completely destroyed at sea. Around a year after this, one of Aegon's bastards, known as Brynden Rivers, was born. As the years passed, the king grew even more cruel. In 178 AC, Aegon discovered that one of his Kingsguard, Sir Terence Toyne, had been conducting an affair with one of the king's own mistresses, Lady Bethany Bracken. Terence was executed, dismembered piece by piece, while Bethany was forced to watch before being put to death herself. The king's vengeance did not end there. Out of spite, he also ordered the execution of Bethany's father, Lord Bracken, who had once served him loyally as hand. This act of cruelty sparked a desire for revenge within House Toyne. Not long after, the surviving brothers of Sir Terence attempted to assassinate the king. At that point, the king's brother Aemon placed himself between the attackers and the king, sacrificing his own life to save his brother, despite years of resentment and disrespect from Aegon. Aemon's death shocked the realm, as he had long been celebrated as one of the greatest knights of his age. His earlier deeds, such as winning a tourney and disguised as the Knight of Tears, to crown Daenerys Queen of Love and Beauty instead of one of Aegon's mistresses, had already cemented his legendary status. His final act only elevated him further in the eyes of the people. The loss of Aemon was soon followed by another tragedy. In 179 AC, Queen Daenerys died in childbirth, along with the child she bore. Her death came years after physical suffering and emotional strain, much of it caused by Aegon himself. Yet even in death, she and Aemon received little honor from the king, as he showed little to no grief. In the aftermath, Aegon began making increasingly open insinuations that his heir Daeron was not truly his son, but rather the product of a relationship between Daenerys and Aemon. Aegon also gave the legendary Valyrian steel sword Blackfire to his bastard son, Daemon Waters, after knighting him at the age of 12 and formally acknowledging him as his son. Traditionally, this sword is usually passed to the rightful king or heir, so this undermined Daeron's right as heir even more. After acquiring the sword, Daemon changed his last name to Blackfire. The realm took notice of Aegon's preference of Daemon over Daeron, which worried many as it could throw the kingdom into another succession conflict. Aegon further sought to strengthen Daemon's position through marriage alliances. He arranged for Daemon to be betrothed to Royanne of Tyrosh, the daughter of the Archon, likely hoping to secure the support of the Tyroshi fleet for future ambitions, specifically another attempt at conquering Dorne. Some accounts suggest Daemon had wished instead to wed his half-sister Daenerys, while others claim he accepted the match, believing he would be permitted multiple wives like Maegor had. Meanwhile, Prince Daeron, still residing on Dragonstone, started to openly oppose his father's rule. Many lords, disgusted by Aegon's actions, began to look to Daeron as a more just and capable future king. Aegon, aware of his growing faction, hesitated to formally disinherit his son despite his threats and insults. To do so would almost certainly spark a civil war, as powerful houses would have risen in defense of Daeron's claim. In his final years, Aegon became obsessed with restoring dragons to his house, like many Targaryens before him. Rather than seeking lost eggs or ancient magic, however, he turned to pyromancers, commanding them to build dragons. Their efforts resulted in grotesque mechanical constructs fueled by wildfire, and the experiments ended up being catastrophic, with hundreds of men perishing, and a quarter of the Kingswood being burned in the process. With this, Aegon's ambitions for conquering Dorne completely came to an end. By 184 AC, the king was 49 years old, and he had become so enormously obese that he could no longer walk, confined entirely to his chambers, and dependent on others even for the most basic needs. His physical condition deteriorated into something so horrific that even the maesters, accustomed to illness and decay, claimed they had never seen anything like it. His body swelled and rotted, with worms visibly crawling through his flesh, and the stench of sickness and waste filled the room. To the Septons, this was no illness. It was a punishment from the gods for a lifetime of excess, cruelty, cruelty and sin. As Aegon's body failed, the consequences of his actions throughout his reign became clear. He had spent his life indulging every appetite without restraint, taking countless women to his bed. He boasted that he slept with as many as 900 women, yet claimed to have truly loved only 9 of them. Among his many affairs included noblewomen, commoners, and even his own kin, including his cousin Dana during her confinement in the Maiden Vault, which resulted in the birth of Daemon Blackfyre. While on his deathbed in his final moments, Aegon carried out one final spiteful act. He legitimized all of his bastard children. Among these legitimized offspring were the so-called Great Bastards, children born from the 9 women that he loved, with the most notable of them being Daemon Blackfyre, Brennan Rivers, and some others. Some suggest that Daemon himself was named Aegon's prince in these final moments. This was a calculated act that destabilized the succession and planted the seeds for future conflict. When King Aegon IV died in early 184 AC, his son, Prince Daeron, moved quickly. Departing Dragonstone at once, he sailed for King's Landing to secure his claim. Upon his arrival, he crowned himself with his father's own crown, an act meant to silence rumors of his illegitimacy. Though those whispers did not disappear entirely, Daeron wasted no time asserting control, presenting himself as the undisputed king. From the very beginning of his rule, Daeron focused on restoring order to a realm that had grown corrupt and unstable. The small council was dismissed and replaced with men chosen for their competence. This restructuring extended to the City Watch, taking a full year to finally restore discipline. Through careful appointments and oversight, Daeron gradually rebuilt it into a force capable of maintaining order. Despite his desire to correct his father's failures, there were limits to what Daeron could undo. For instance, Aegon IV's legitimization of all his bastards could not be reversed. Rather than antagonize them and risk instability, Daeron chose to treat his half-siblings with honor, maintaining the incomes and lands that had been granted to them. This was especially evident in his handling of Daemon Blackfyre. Honoring his father's arrangements, he had the 14-year-old Daemon wed to Roanne of Tyrosh. On the day of the wedding, Daeron further granted Daemon lands along the Blackwater Rush, allowing him to establish his own seat and household. These acts were meant to ensure loyalty and stability, but they also elevated Daemon's status. That same year, Daemon had 2 sons, naming them Aegon and Aemon. A few years later, he would have a 3rd son, naming him Daemon Blackfyre II. At the same time, Daeron's court began to change due to his marriage to Miriam Martell. Dornish nobles and knights increasingly appeared at King's Landing, bringing with them cultural differences that were unfamiliar to many Westerosi lords, and this change was not universally welcome. Many nobles, especially from the Reach and the Stormlands, regions that had been in conflict with Dorne for a long time, viewed the growing Dornish presence with suspicion or resentment. While Daeron himself saw this integration as a strength and a step toward unity, others saw it as a submission to former enemies. Nonetheless, Daeron pursued one of the most ambitious policies of his reign, the peaceful unification of Dorne with the 7 kingdoms. Rather than attempt conquest like his predecessors, Daeron turned to diplomacy. He began negotiations with his brother-in-law, Prince Meryn Martell, with these negotiations lasting for over 2 years. Ultimately, in 187 AC, an agreement was reached and sealed through marriage. Meryn wed Daeron's sister, Princess Daenerys. Following the ceremony, the Prince of Dorne swore fealty to the Iron Throne, formally bringing Dorne into the realm. In the aftermath, Daeron and Meryn would visit the Great Sept of Baelor, placing a golden flower in front of the statue of Baelor the Blessed, declaring, "Baelor, your work is done." To commemorate this new era, Daeron founded Summerhall in the Dornish Marches, a lightly fortified palace meant to represent peace. Unlike the other regions of Westeros, Dorne was allowed to retain significant autonomy. The Martells kept their royal title of prince, maintained their own laws, and were granted the right to collect taxes for the Iron Throne with relatively little oversight. While these concessions were necessary to secure the peace, many lords elsewhere saw them as unfair privileges, and many believed that Dorne had gained too much influence too quickly. During these early years, Daeron earned a reputation as a thoughtful and scholarly ruler, rather than a warrior king. Nevertheless, strength was not absent from his line. His eldest son, Baelor, would prove himself a formidable warrior, earning the name Baelor Breakspear, most famously by defeating Daemon Blackfyre and attorneys celebrating the Dornish marriage. His younger son, Maekar, also showed great combat abilities. Baelor, though admired for his skills, bore the features of his Dornish mother, which only deepened the unease of those already suspicious of Dornish influence. Meanwhile, Daemon Blackfyre continued to grow in importance. Handsome, powerful, and trained by renowned warriors, he embodied the traditional image of a Targaryen conqueror in the eyes of many. Though Daeron treated him honorably, the contrast between the scholarly king and the warrior bastard, combined with the earlier gift of the sword Blackfyre by Aegon IV, began to shape perceptions among the nobility. Encouraged by allies such as his half-brother Aegor Rivers, known as Bittersteel, and the famed master-at-arms Quentin Ball, called Fireball, Daemon was gradually pushed toward claiming the throne. When Daemon was finally ready to declare himself king, word of his intent reached King Daeron's court even before the declaration could be made, possibly through the actions of another of Aegon's bastards, Brynden Rivers, who was loyal to Daeron. Acting quickly, Daeron dispatched the Kingsguard to arrest Daemon, but with the aid of Fireball, Daemon escaped captivity. This failed arrest attempt gave his supporters the justification they needed, and open rebellion followed. Declaring himself the rightful king, Daemon took a new sigil, a black dragon on a red field, reversing the Targaryen colors. From this, he became known as the Black Dragon, while Daeron became the Red Dragon. The realm soon split. Though it is often said that half the kingdom rose for Daemon, this is likely an exaggeration. No great house fully committed to his cause, with many houses only sending partial support. Houses such as Hightower, Butterwell, Oakhart, and Tarbeck supported both sides to varying degrees, while opportunists like Manfred Lothston were willing to betray one side for the other. Daemon's strongest support came from Marcher Lords and those hostile to Dorne, who saw in him a chance to undo Daeron's policies. Still, Daemon controlled enough territory to act as a king in truth. Across Westeros, battles erupted in the Riverlands, Reach, Vale, and Westerlands, as the conflict spread into full civil war. Among Daemon's commanders, Fireball proved one of the most dangerous. He led devastating campaigns, including an assault into the Westerlands, where he killed Lord Lefford at Lannisport and defeated Lord Daemon Lannister. At the Manor, he killed all but one of Lady Penrose's sons, intentionally sparing the youngest. Yet despite his combat abilities, Fireball was killed, struck down by a random archer while pausing for water. His loss deprived Daemon of one of his most capable leaders at a critical moment. Meanwhile, Daeron's forces, though initially scattered and at times poorly coordinated, began to gather strength. The king grew dissatisfied with his hand, Lord Ambrose Butterwell, whose loyalty and competence came into question. Shortly before the decisive battle, Daeron replaced him with Lord Hayford, a more reliable supporter. Elsewhere, loyalists such as Lord Leo Tyrell won important victories in the Reach, helping to contain the rebellion. The final confrontation came at the Battle of the Redgrass Field in late 196 AC, with Daemon's army advancing toward King's Landing. The stakes were high because if Daemon won this battle, he would likely be able to take the capital and the throne. The battle opened with Daemon shattering the vanguard led by Lord Donal Arryn. Only the timely arrival of Sir Gawain Corbray of the Kingsguard prevented total collapse. Daemon and Gawain met in single combat, their duel lasting nearly an hour. Daemon eventually gained the upper hand and wounded Corbray when he dismounted to ensure his fallen foe would not be trampled, honorably ordering for him to be carried from the field. Brynden Bloodraven Rivers had positioned his elite archers, the Raven's Teeth, atop the Weeping Ridge. From here, they rained arrows down toward him. One by one, Daemon's first son Aegon fell, and then Daemon himself. When his second son Aemon seized Blackfyre and attempted to rally the troops, he too was killed. Despite this loss, the battle did not end immediately. Bittersteel seized Blackfyre and led a charge against Bloodraven's position, managing to wound his half-brother and take his eye in the process. But by then, King Daeron's oldest son, Prince Baelor Breakspear, arrived with a fresh force of Dornish spearmen, striking the rebels from the rear while his brother Prince Maekar had a shield wall formed. Together, they put an end to the rest of Daemon's forces, later immortalized as the Hammer and the Anvil. When the war was finally over, 10,000 men were dead and countless more wounded. Bittersteel managed to flee across the Narrow Sea with the surviving Blackfyre family, including Daemon II. Though the war had lasted less than a year, its consequences would endure for decades, as the Blackfyre pretenders would rise again and again in the future. In the aftermath of the first Blackfyre rebellion, Daeron moved quickly to secure the realm, stripping lands, castles, and hostages from lords who had supported Daemon in his cause. Despite these punishments, the rest of his reign was peaceful, as the king focused on stability and governance rather than vengeance. At court, one of the most influential figures to rise in this period was Brynden Rivers, who continued his loyal service to Daeron, although his presence became controversial, eventually gaining a reputation among the small folk as the king's sorcerer. Brynden took part in small council meetings, where his views would often clash with the king's heir, Baelor Breakspear. Baelor, who served as hand of the king, advocated for mercy and reconciliation toward former rebels, while Brynden warned that leniency would only sow the seeds for future uprisings. Despite these disagreements, Baelor proved to be a capable and widely respected hand, and many throughout the realm believed he would one day become a great king in his own right. Meanwhile, Daeron's family continued to grow, as his other sons Aerys, Rhaegal, and Maekar would contribute in different ways to evolve the political landscape. As the years passed and the royal line expanded further through grandchildren, Daeron began to grow wary of the dangers posed by having too many potential claimants to the throne. Around 208 AC, he made the controversial decision to send his grandson Aemon, the bookish third son of Maekar, to the Citadel to forge a Maester's chain, despite Maekar's objections. Within Maekar's own household, tensions and darker behaviors emerged, specifically in the actions of his son Aerion, whose cruelty was evident from a young age, tormenting his younger brother Aegon, known as Egg, by acts such as throwing his pet cat down a well and threatening to remove his genitals. In contrast, before Aemon was sent to the Citadel, he and Egg shared a close bond, often dreaming of dragons and imagining themselves as riders, even recreating the Battle of the Redgrass Field with toy soldiers. Egg himself spent part of his youth at court, attending small council sessions and gaining early exposure to governance, though his ambitions lean more toward knighthood than rule. Over the rest of his reign, Daeron ensured peace and stability were maintained, and because of his overall positive rule, he was given the name Daeron the Good. Not long after the first Blackfire Rebellion, the legendary knight known as Sir Duncan the Tall started to rise to prominence. Born in 193 AC, he grew up in the harsh streets of King's Landing. Flea Bottom is the city's poorest district, and here, he lived as an orphan among other street children. At the time, they were thieves, scavenging whatever they could to survive. Dunk, as he was then known, never knew his parents, but he dreamed of traveling north to the Wall, where he might find a sense of belonging. While Dunk struggled to survive in Flea Bottom, he met a hedge knight known as Sir Arlen of Pennytree. As a knight, Arlen competed in many tourneys, unhorsing notable opponents such as Lord Stokeworth and Sir Daemon Lannister at Lannisport. In 200 AC, he faced Baelor Breakspear at a tourney at Storm's End. Though defeated, Arlen always took pride in the contest, claiming he broke 7 lances against the prince. Arlen's life was not without hardship. During the first Blackfire Rebellion, he fought beneath the banners of Lord Hayford alongside his young squire and nephew, Roger of Pennytree. At the Battle of the Redgrass Field, Roger was slain. The loss of his nephew impacted him greatly, and for several years afterward, he traveled alone. When he encountered Dunk, he saw something in him, whether it be his immense size or spirit, and Arlen took him on as a squire when the boy was only 5 or 6 years old. From that moment on, Dunk's life changed entirely. Under Arlen's guidance, he left behind the slums and began traveling the 7 kingdoms, learning the ways of knighthood. From the moment Arlen first allowed him to hold a sword, Dunk dreamed of one day becoming a knight of the Kingsguard. The long companionship between Arlen and Dunk came to an end in 209 AC, as the pair traveled toward the tourney at Ashford Meadow. Along the road, Sir Arlen fell ill, and the sickness quickly claimed his life. Dunk buried him, and alone for the first time since childhood, chose to continue on to the tourney. There, he decided to claim that Sir Arlen had knighted him before his death, taking the name Sir Duncan the Tall. Along the way to the tourney, Dunk stopped at an inn, where he encountered a strange and drunken man who claimed to have dreamed of him. This man, later revealed to be Prince Daeron, spoke in a cryptic manner, disturbed by whatever vision he believed he had seen, and warned Dunk to stay away. At the same inn, Dunk also met a bald-headed boy who begged to become his squire. Dunk refused the boy and continued on his journey. This boy, however, was no ordinary orphan. He was Prince Aegon, the youngest son of Maekar, sent to Ashford to serve as squire to his elder brother Daeron. Yet Daeron, uninterested in the tourney and deciding to drink instead, abandoned his duties, shaving Egg's silver gold hair to conceal his identity. By the time Dunk arrived at Ashford Meadow and made camp, Egg had already tracked him down and inserted himself into his life. When the boy again asked to serve him, Dunk eventually accepted him as his temporary squire. Meanwhile, Prince Maekar had come to the tourney with high expectations for his sons, Daeron and Aegon, hoping they would distinguish themselves and bring honor to his branch of the family in comparison to the sons of his brother, Prince Baelor Breakspear. However, almost immediately, Maekar's plans began to unravel due to Daeron vanishing and drinking at the inn, while Egg had disappeared entirely. Believing his youngest son missing or taken, Maekar dispatched Sir Roland Craycall of the Kingsguard to search for the princes. When Daeron was eventually found, he lied to save himself, claiming that a large robber knight had abducted Aegon and that he had been pursuing them. Unaware of the chaos unfolding among the highboard, Dunk began preparing himself for the tourney, though his circumstances made this difficult. Lacking proper equipment, he was forced to sell one of his horses, along with his late master's armor, in order to purchase a set from the armorer. While exploring the tourney grounds, Dunk encountered Tanzel, a puppeteer who was kind to him, and they formed a brief but meaningful connection. The following day, Dunk attempted to register for the list, presenting himself as a knight. However, to enlist, they required proof of knighthood. Dunk claimed that Sir Arlen had knighted him before his death, though there was no witnesses to confirm it, and even Dunk himself seemed uncertain of the truth behind his own words. He was advised to find someone alive who could vouch for him. Dunk returned to the castle, and he stumbled upon Prince Baelor Breakspear and Prince Maekar, who were in the midst of dealing with the disappearance of Maekar's sons. When Dunk explained his situation, Baelor recalled Sir Arlen, and out of respect for his memory, Baelor agreed to vouch for Dunk, granting him the right to compete. Meanwhile, Prince Aegon revealed his cruel and unstable nature during the joust. Aegon entered the list and deliberately drove his lance into his opponent's horse, instead of striking the knight, killing the animal and injuring its rider. Though the act was officially deemed an accident, many, including Egg, recognized it as a deliberate act of cruelty. Shortly after this tragedy, Aegon stumbled upon a puppet show performed by Tanzel, depicting a knight slaying a dragon. This deeply offended Prince Aegon, who saw himself as the dragon in the tale. Enraged, he ordered his men to destroy the puppets in stall. He then personally brutalized Tanzel by breaking her fingers. Egg alerted Dunk of what was happening, and acting on instinct as well as the vows he believed a knight should uphold, field, protecting the innocent and defending the weak. Dunk struck Aegon, knocking him down and kicking him in the teeth and stomach. Aegon's guards seized Dunk immediately, and the furious prince ordered that his teeth should be smashed, and then his belly cut open after. At that moment, Egg stepped forward and revealed his true identity as Prince Aegon, commanding the guards to stop. They obeyed, but Dunk was still arrested and taken to the castle to await judgment. Prince Baelor visited Dunk in his cell and explained the danger he faced. Aegon twisted the incident into an act of treason, claiming the puppet show incited rebellion against House Targaryen. That, alongside Daeron's previous lie that Egg had been kidnapped, painted Dunk not as a defender of the innocent, but as a criminal and conspirator. Prince Maekar, already angered by the disappearance of his sons, was furious. Though Baelor refused to allow Dunk to be executed outright, he could not deny Aegon the right to demand justice. Dunk chose to invoke his right to a trial by combat, but Aegon, confident in his advantage, demanded a trial of 7, requiring each side to have 7 champions. Aegon believed Dunk would struggle to find 6 men willing to risk their lives for him, and Aegon could call upon princes in the Kingsguard to fight for his side. With the help of Egg, Dunk began to gather allies. Despite his low birth, his actions had earned him the respect of those who valued honor. One by one, 6 men agreed to stand beside him, with one of these men being the formidable Lord Lionel Baratheon. The final and most important champion came as a surprise: Prince Baelor himself, who, believing in Dunk's honor, chose to fight for him even against his own kin. Aegon was joined by his brother Prince Daeron, his father Prince Maekar, Sir Stephen Fossaway, and 3 knights of the Kingsguard. As the trial commenced, chaos erupted across the field. In the initial charge, Prince Daeron was unhorsed. True to a promise he had quietly made at Dunk the night before, Daeron did not rise to continue the fight, effectively removing himself from the battle. Dunk himself was struck hard by Aegon, who drove a lance into his side. Yet Dunk endured, drawing on both his training under Sir Arlen and the raw, brutal fighting instincts he had learned in Fleabottom. Using his strength, Dunk beat the prince, smashing his helm with his shield and bringing him to the ground. With a dagger placed up to Aegon's eye, Dunk forced him to yield. Aegon publicly withdrew his accusation, and all of his charges were cleared. Unfortunately, 2 men died during the fight, and most tragic of all was the fate of the heir to the throne and the current hand of the king, Prince Baelor Breakspear. When fighting against his brother Maekar, he was struck in the back of the head from his mace. When his helmet was removed after the fight, the back of his head was bashed in, and he died soon after, reportedly in Dunk's arms. In the aftermath, Prince Maekar felt immense guilt over his brother's death, and it would weigh on him heavily for the rest of his life. He also recognized the danger his son Aegon posed. Maekar chose to send him into exile in the Free Cities, hoping distance might make him less cruel. As for Dunk, he was offered a place at Summerhall in Maekar's service, but Dunk refused, choosing to remain a hedge knight. However, he agreed to take Egg as his squire. Aegon would live humbly, traveling the roads and learning the realities of the realm, far removed from the luxuries and arrogance of court life. Maekar accepted these conditions, even instructing his son to keep his disguise by shaving his head. The morning after the tourney, Sir Duncan the Tall and his new squire Egg departed Ashford together. Dunk and Egg decided to ride south to Dorne. They began their journey by crossing through the harsh mountain route known as the Prince's Pass, escorting merchants as they made their way into the Dornish lands. The journey only grew harsher as they crossed the deep desert. During this passage, Dunk's horse Chestnut died beneath Egg, forcing the two to continue by riding together on Thunder, enduring the unforgiving heat and exhaustion together. Yet for all its hardships, Dorne offered them safety. During 209 and 210 AC, the Great Spring Sickness swept across the 7 kingdoms, killing tens of thousands. Dorne remained largely untouched, and from the deserts they turned to the rivers, traveling by boat down the Greenblood toward Plankytown. From Plankytown, the pair secured passage aboard the ship White Lady bound for Oldtown. Upon arriving in Oldtown, Egg was briefly reunited with his brother Aemon. Around this time, Dunk and Egg were also gifted a mule named Maester, likely from Aemon himself. While Dunk and Egg lived this quiet, wandering life, the rest of the realm continued to collapse. In King's Landing, the Great Spring Sickness reached its height, claiming the life of King Daeron II Targaryen, ending a mostly peaceful reign that had lasted 25 years. With his death, the crown passed to Daeron's second son Aerys, a scholarly and reclusive man far more interested in books than governance. Upon ascending the throne, Aerys decided to appoint his uncle, Brynden Rivers, as Hand of the King. Known to many as Bloodraven, Brynden had already built a reputation as a master of secrets, a man rumored to dabble in sorcery and see more than ordinary men could. Under Aerys, he effectively ruled the realm. His first and greatest challenge was the plague itself. As bodies piled in the streets of King's Landing, Brynden ordered the pyromancers to burn the dead within the dragon pit, and the city glowed green with wildfire. To make matters worse, a severe drought occurred lasting more than a year and worsening the devastation left by the plague. Crops failed, trade slowed, and small folk fled their homes in search of water and food. Brynden ordered them back, but few obeyed. Instead, many turned into bandits, and the roads of Westeros became more dangerous than they had been in decades. Prices soared, law and order weakened, and whispers spread among the people, some calling Bloodraven a kinslayer, others claiming he used dark sorcery to maintain control. Meanwhile, Maekar watched these events unfold with bitterness. He had expected to be named Hand, only to be passed over in favor of Bloodraven. Unable to work alongside him, Maekar withdrew from court to Summerhall, where he grew increasingly withdrawn and resentful. After a short journey to Dosk for supplies, Dunk and Egg returned to Standfast. Here they found that a local stream that had sustained the land had dried up, and after investigating with a knight known as Bennis, they discovered a dam had been constructed on the orders of Roanne Weber, Lady of Coldmoat. When Dunk attempted to reason with the workmen, they refused to dismantle it. Recklessly, Bennis drew his longsword and cut one of the workers. Returning to Standfast, Dunk and Bennis found the Lord, Eustace Osgrey, carefully cleaning the ancient shield of Sir Wilbert Osgrey, a knight from the Age of Kings long before the Targaryens ruled. Once Eustace finished recounting the story of his ancestor, the Hedge Knights informed him of the dam and Bennis's violence. Eustace immediately understood the consequences, as Lady Roanne would not let such an insult stand. He ordered Dunk and Bennis to gather men from his nearby villages and prepare for war, but the reality was they could only gather 8 peasants. That night, Dunk and Egg spoke privately. Egg believed that revealing his identity might stop the conflict before it began. Dunk, however, refused. Though he understood Egg's desire to protect the small folk, he insisted the boy's identity must remain secret. That same night, Dunk had a vivid and unsettling dream. He found himself back in Dorne, digging a grave for his dead horse Chestnut, while figures from his past, Arlen, Baelor, and Baelor's son Valar, looked on and spoke. As the dream continued, more faces from Standfast gathered, and in its most disturbing moment, Egg himself was buried alive beneath the sands. The next morning, Eustace watched as Dunk and Bennis attempted to train their embarrassing force. Troubled by both the hopelessness of their situation and his dream, Dunk looked for alternatives. At Coldmoat, Dunk found that the stories he had heard of Lady Roanne were not entirely true. Rather than an aged, bitter widow, she was young and beautiful, qualities that caught Dunk off guard. During his audience, he learned the deeper truth behind the conflict. The stream did not belong to Eustace at all. It had been granted to House Weber by Daeron II as a reward for loyalty during the rebellion, taken from House Osgrey as punishment for their support of Daemon Blackfyre. Roanne, bound by her father's will, was required to remarry soon or lose her lands to a rival cousin. Despite Dunk's attempts at diplomacy, the meeting ended in failure. She demanded that Bennis be handed over for justice, or she would take him by force. Frustrated and disillusioned, Dunk considered abandoning Eustace's service altogether, yet when he thought of the helpless villagers who would suffer, he chose to stay. The following morning, Eustace, Dunk, and Egg rode to the river, where Roanne awaited them with her forces. Dunk requested a private parley and was granted it. In a final attempt to prevent bloodshed, he revealed Egg's true identity. He then cut his own cheek, offering himself as compensation for the earlier injury inflicted by Bennis. Roanne was impressed by the gesture, but it was not enough. She demanded an apology from Eustace himself, something the old knight refused to give. With neither side willing to yield, the dispute would be settled with a trial by combat. Dunk stood as Eustace's champion, while Roanne named Sir Lucas Inchfield as hers. The duel took place in the very stream that had sparked the conflict. Though Inchfield was the more polished knight, Dunk's strength carried him through. In a brutal fight, he managed to kill Inchfield, but Dunk was severely wounded and nearly drowned in the water before being saved. When Dunk awoke, he found out that Eustace and Roanne had chosen peace, not through submission, but through marriage. Their union ended the conflict and joined their lands at last. Dunk himself was offered a place at Standfast as captain of the guard, but he refused. Though he had fought for Eustace, he was still a hedge knight at heart, bound to the road. As Dunk prepared to leave, Roanne met him at the stables. She offered him her finest horse and her apologies, but Dunk refused both. Still, she insisted he take something of hers. What followed was a brief, passionate kiss. Then, as a final token, Dunk cut off a length of her famed red braid to remember her by. And with that, Dunk and Egg departed Standfast together. By 212 AC, across the narrow sea in Tyrosh, Daemon II Blackfyre dreamed of a dragon hatching at White Walls, a vision he believed prophetic. After hearing about this dream, Gorman Peake convinced Daemon that the time had come to press his claim. If a dragon could be hatched, Peake argued, it would rally powerful houses such as Butterwell, Frey, Lothston, and Bracken to their cause. Not all were convinced. Aegor Bittersteel Rivers remained in Essos with the sword Blackfyre, refusing to support this scheme as the conspirators pressed forward. Meanwhile, a marriage between Ambrose Butterwell to a daughter of House Frey was taking place. House Butterwell announced a grand wedding tourney, offering his prize dragon egg as the champion's reward. However, this was not just a prize, it was bait. Daemon himself crossed into Westeros in disguise, taking on the persona of a hedge knight named Sir John the Fiddler. While under disguise, he encountered Sir Duncan the Tall and his squire Egg as they traveled through the Riverlands toward the north, intending to serve Baron Stark against Ironborn raids, led by Dagon Greyjoy. Duncan was wary of Peake and his companions, especially upon recognizing Peake as the man responsible for the death of his old friend Roger during the first Blackfyre Rebellion. But due to Daemon's charm, Dunk accepted his invite to White Walls, telling Egg they needed to pass that way regardless. On the road, Dunk and Egg met other hedge knights, Maynard Plum, Kyle the Cat, and Glendon Ball. From them, Dunk learned of the Dragon Egg prize and the scale of the gathering at White Walls. During this, Maynard Plum spoke in defense of the Hand, Brendan Bloodraven Rivers, and his harsh rule, while others expressed their discontent hint, revealing the political divide running beneath the surface of the realm. Unknown to most, Bloodraven himself was already watching. Through spies, he had learned of the plot forming at White Walls. Upon arriving at the castle, Egg quickly grew suspicious. Many of the attending lords had supported the Blackfires years earlier, and the gathering felt less like a wedding and more like a council of conspirators. His suspicions deepened when he overheard Lord Peake speaking of a dragon hatching and of the prince whose dreams foretold it. Meanwhile, Dunk observed other oddities, such as John the Fiddler, a supposed hedge knight, being treated equally among nobles at the feast. That evening, Dunk climbed to the roof of White Walls, where the Fiddler approached him privately. Speaking openly, Daemon claimed he had dreamed of Dunk before ever meeting him, dreams in which Dunk wore the white cloak of the Kingsguard. He insisted that his dreams always come true, recounting how he had foreseen the deaths of his own brothers. He also spoke again of a dragon hatching at White Walls. When the tourney began, Duncan entered the list as a mystery knight, calling himself the Gallows Knight. However, his time in the list was short-lived. He was defeated in his first joust against Uthor Underleaf. Because of his loss, Dunk had to forfeit his armor, horse, and sword. Egg was distraught at the outcome, but what followed was even more troubling. Underleaf later informed Dunk that someone had tried to bribe him, not just to win, but to kill Duncan during the joust. At the same time, Glendon Ball revealed that Lord Peake had offered him a place at Starpike if he would throw a match to ensure the Fiddler's victory. Glendon refused, angering Peake and placing himself in danger. As Dunk searched for Egg, he began to connect the dots: the bribery, the gathered lords, and the strange behavior of the Fiddler. Realizing the tourney itself was being manipulated to guarantee one outcome: that this man going by the name John would win the Dragon Egg. The crisis deepened when Alan Cockshaw, driven by jealousy over the attention that Daemon had showed Duncan, lured Dunk away from the festivities under the pretense of revealing Egg's whereabouts. Instead, he led him to a deserted courtyard and attempted to kill him. Though wounded in the struggle, Duncan overpowered Cockshaw and kicked him down a well to drown, an act witnessed by Maynard Plum, who then stepped forward to aid the injured hedge knight and revealed that Egg was in the castle sept. The dragon egg soon went missing, and almost immediately, blame fell upon Glendon Ball, the very man who had refused Peake's bribe. He was seized and accused, likely to be tortured into a confession. At the same time, Egg revealed his true identity as a prince to Maester Lothar. He was then brought before Ambrose Butterwell and Walder Frey, and there, Egg claimed that his father Maekar already knew of the plot that was happening and was marching on White Walls with an army. Frey, unwilling to risk being caught in treason, withdrew his forces and departed for the twins. Butterwell, panicked, trying to explain his innocence, insisted that the conspiracy had been the work of Gorman Peake. Realizing the danger they were in, Duncan urged Egg to escape if possible. He then made his way inside the Great Hall, and in front of all the lords and knights, Duncan publicly accused John the Fiddler of being Daemon Blackfire, exposing his true identity. Dunk accused Lord Peake of orchestrating the entire plot, rigging the tourney, bribing competitors, and framing Glendon Ball for the theft of the dragon egg by planting a painted stone in his belongings. Daemon himself appeared shaken by these revelations. Unlike Peake, he had not been fully aware of the manipulations carried out in his name, and for a moment he seemed uncertain whom to trust. Seeking to resolve the matter and prove Glendon's guilt or innocence, Daemon declared a trial by combat in the form of a joust, announcing that he would personally face Glendon. By the following morning, many guests had fled during the night, sensing the danger, including Maynard Plum. Daemon abandoned his disguise, washing the dye from his hair and openly using the sigil of House Blackfire. Glendon Bell, weakened from torture, was prepared to fight as well. On the very first pass, Glendon unhorsed Daemon, and this moment shattered the illusion of strength he previously built up. Even as the joust concluded, the final blow to the rebellion arrived. The Hand of the King, Brendan Bloodraver Rivers, arrived and surrounded White Walls with hundreds of knights, as well as 5,000 infantry drawn from houses such as Darkland, Hayford, Mooton, Blackwood, and others. His intelligence network had ensured he knew exactly when to strike. Faced with overwhelming force, Daemon attempted to rally those still present, calling for them to fight to the death, but few answered. The assembled knights and lords, seeing the futility of resistance, refused to follow him. Daemon rode out alone and offered single combat to Bloodraven, but the Hand had no interest in theatrics. He ordered Daemon arrested on the spot, ending the Second Blackfire Rebellion before it could truly begin. In the aftermath, order was quickly restored. The conspirators were taken into custody, with Gorman Peake executed for treason. Other ringleaders faced death or imprisonment, while lesser participants who cooperated were spared harsher punishment. Butterwell was stripped of nearly all his wealth, allowed to keep only a tenth, and White Walls itself was given to the crown, ordered to be torn down so it would not become a symbol like the Redgrass Field. Frey, having fled early, escaped immediate punishment, though Bloodraven ensured they would be dealt with as well. Daemon Blackfire, however, was spared execution. Instead, Bloodraven kept him alive as a hostage in the Red Keep, a calculated decision meant to prevent Aegor Bittersteel Rivers from proclaiming Daemon's younger brother, Aegon, as a new pretender across the Narrow Sea. Afterwards, Duncan met with Bloodraven in his pavilion. There, the Hand revealed that the dragon Daemon had dreamed of was not a beast at all, but instead Egg himself, a prince whose future would shape the realm. At Egg's request, Bloodraven even provided provided Duncan with gold to regain the possessions he had lost at the tourney. Shortly after the events at White Walls, Duncan and Egg continued their travels across the Seven Kingdoms, eventually visiting Winterfell. In 219 AC, the Third Blackfire Rebellion began. This uprising was launched by Aegor Bittersteel Rivers, who crowned Aegon Blackfire the fourth son of the original pretender Daemon Blackfire, and brought the Golden Company, a group of sellswords, into the fight. The Golden Company was originally founded by Bittersteel and Essos, the same year that the Second Blackfire Rebellion occurred, and over the years he built it into a powerful force of fighters. Prince Maekar proved to be a capable leader during the war, commanding forces against the invaders. Fighting alongside him were his sons, including the cruel Prince Aegon and the young Prince Aegon, who, despite his age, demonstrated great courage on the battlefield. The war also saw the second great duel between Bittersteel and Brandon Rivers. The rebellion came to an end when Aegon Blackfire was slain. It was said he had surrendered and that Bittersteel himself was also captured. Brought in chains to King's Landing, his fate became a matter of debate. Both Bloodraven and Prince Aegon urged King Aerys to execute him, seeing it as the only way to end the threat he posed. However, Aerys chose mercy, sentencing Bittersteel instead to take the Black and join the Night's Watch. Yet even in defeat, the Blackfire cause refused to die. On the voyage north, Bittersteel's ship was intercepted by his allies, and he was freed, returning across the narrow sea to rejoin the Golden Company. Before the year's end, he crowned Aegon's son, Daemon III, ensuring that the Blackfire's ambitions continued. In 220 AC, Egg married Lady Betha Blackwood, a match made for love rather than politics. Together, they would have 5 children, with Aegon naming his firstborn son Duncan, seemingly honoring the Hedge Knight who had shaped his youth. The following year, King Aerys I, who had no heirs, died from natural causes. The Iron Throne passed to his last surviving brother, Maekar. Upon taking the throne, Maekar summoned all of his sons to court. Aemon, who had forged his Maester's chain in 217 AC, also answered the summons, though he declined a place on the Small Council out of respect for the Grand Maester, choosing instead to serve at Dragonstone alongside his older brother Daeron, now Prince of Dragonstone and heir to the throne. Despite earlier tensions, Maekar retained Brandon Rivers as Hand of the King, recognizing his abilities. In the West, Gerald Lannister rose to power after the suspicious deaths of his brother and niece, both of which some whispered were his doing. Though many viewed him as a possible kinslayer, Gerald proved to be an exceptionally capable ruler, strengthening the wealth and influence of House Lannister. At some point, Prince Daeron died, allegedly from a disease he caught from a whore, making King Maekar's second son Aerion the heir to the throne and Prince of Dragonstone. Not long after, in 232 AC, Aerion believed that he was destined to become a dragon and drank wildfire, dying in agony shortly after. In the following year, House Peak, longtime supporters of the Blackfire cause, rose in rebellion on the Dornish marches. King Maekar, accompanied by his forces, and even his son Prince Aegon, headed south to crush the uprising. Theon Lannister served as Egg's squire, and at his side was his old companion Sir Duncan the Tall. Maekar led the assault, storming Starpike, the Peak stronghold. During the chaos, the king's crowned helm was crushed by a rock dropped from the castle gates, and he died immediately. Though they put an end to the uprising, it came at an immense cost, and a succession crisis began. The Hand of the King, Brandon Rivers, summoned a great council at King's Landing. As the lords of Westeros gathered to debate the future of the realm, another claimant emerged from exile, Aenys Blackfire, son of Daemon I Blackfire, hoping to win the throne through diplomacy rather than war. Bloodraven lied to him, promising that he could become king, and upon arriving, he was seized and executed, with his head being presented before the council to warn against further Blackfire ambitions. As the Great Council continued, some lords sought to place the crown upon Maester Aemon, Maekar's oldest living son, even proposing releasing him from his vows. Aemon, however, refused outright, insisting that the throne should instead pass to his younger brother. Despite some not being convinced, Aegon was ultimately chosen by the majority. In 233 AC, the once wandering squire was crowned King Aegon V Targaryen, being known as Aegon the Unlikely. Aegon's first act as king showcased his immense sense of justice. Though all knew that Bloodraven's execution of Aenys had removed a dangerous rival, Aegon could not allow the word of the Iron Throne to be so openly broken. He had his own hand arrested and gave him 2 choices: death or be exiled to the Night's Watch. The Bloodraven chose exile and began his journey to the Wall. At the same time, Maester Aemon chose to join the Night's Watch as well, so that no future plots that might use him as a rival claimant to his brother could arise. In late 233 AC, he journeyed north aboard a ship, bound for Eastwatch by the Sea, accompanied by Brandon Rivers, and escorted by Sir Duncan the Tall. After arriving at the Wall, Aemon would become the Maester of the Night's Watch, and some years later, Brandon would become the Lord Commander. However, he eventually disappeared while ranging beyond the Wall. At some point, he became the Three-Eyed Raven, the last Greenseer living with the Children of the Forest. Conquest. For years, a brutal winter hit Westeros at the beginning of Aegon's reign. Due to his travels when he was younger and seeing firsthand the struggles that the small folk went through, he sent out massive shipments of food and grain to the north to help relieve starvation. While this earned him loyalty among the common people, it also created resentment among the Great Lords. In 236 AC, the long winter finally came to an end. Immediately afterwards, Daemon III Blackfyre, backed by Bittersteel and the Golden Company, launched an invasion, landing at Massey's Hook, resulting in the 4th Blackfyre Rebellion. They had hopes the houses that once supported them would come to their aid, but Westeros had changed. To most of the realm, the Blackfyre claim was something of the past. King Aegon quickly responded, riding out in person with his sons Duncan, Jaehaerys, and Daeron, alongside Sir Duncan the Tall, now a member of the Kingsguard. At the Battle of Windwater Bridge, the royal forces crushed the Blackfyre army. Sir Duncan killed Daemon III in single combat, bringing the rebellion to an end. Bittersteel, however, once again escaped, fleeing across the narrow sea with what remained of his army. A few years later, he would eventually die at the age of 69. Sir Tion Lannister, heir to Casterly Rock, also died during this rebellion, and his passing elevated his younger brother Tydos as heir. Their father, Gerald, briefly emerged from his declining health and grief, taking firmer control of his lands and attempting to prepare Tydos for rule. Yet even then, Gerald understood his son's weaknesses. Meanwhile, Aegon continued to pursue reforms aimed at improving the lives of the smallfolk, granting protections, limiting abuses by lords, and attempting to rebalance the social order. These efforts only deepened the divide between crown and nobility. In 237 AC, seeking to stabilize his rule and strengthen alliances, Aegon and his queen, Betha Blackwood, arranged a series of strategic marriages for their children. Prince Duncan, the heir, was betrothed to a daughter of Lord Lionel Baratheon of Storm's End. Prince Jaehaerys was promised to a daughter of House Tully, Princess Shaera to the heir of House Tyrell, and young Prince Daeron to Olenna Redwyne. These matches were carefully designed to secure the loyalty of the great houses and support Aegon's reforms. However, in 239 AC, Prince Duncan fell in love with a mysterious common-born woman known as Jenny of Oldstones. Defying both his father and the expectations of the realm, he chose to marry her. Choosing love instead of duty, he lost his position as Prince of Dragonstone. Lord Lionel Baratheon, enraged by the insult to his house, renounced his allegiance and declared himself Storm King. A short but intense rebellion followed. Sir Duncan the Tall defeated Lionel during a trial by combat. After the rebellion, Aegon sought reconciliation rather than punishment. He betrothed his youngest daughter Raelle to Lionel's heir, Ormond, restoring peace between the crown and Storm's End. Meanwhile, Prince Jaehaerys was made heir to the throne. Unfortunately, he too was inspired by his older brother's defiance, and he secretly wed his sister Princess Shaera in 240 AC, defying their father's wishes to end the tradition of incestuous Targaryen marriages. The union, already consummated, left Aegon with no choice but to accept it, though it angered both House Tully and House Tyrell, whose alliances had been broken. The pattern repeated itself with the youngest son. In 246 AC, Prince Daeron broke his long-standing betrothal to Olenna Redwyne. This final broken alliance resulted in the complete collapse of Aegon's grand marriage strategy, lowering his political position even further. Beyond the royal family, instability spread in other regions. In the Westerlands, Tydos Lannister became Lord of Casterly Rock after Gerald's death in 244 AC. His weak and indecisive rule led to widespread disorder. Bannermen ignored his authority, disputes went unresolved, and neighboring houses grew bolder. The power of House Lannister declined significantly, with many openly mocking the once mighty lions as toothless. By 253 AC, Sir Duncan the Tall became Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. During a winter tourney at King's Landing, he participated against a 16-year-old Barristan Selmy, ultimately being defeated by him. A few years prior, when Barristan was only 10, he jousted against Prince Duncan when no one else would, giving him the nickname Barristan the Bold. Despite being so young, he already started to rise in prominence as a strong and courageous knight. In 258 AC, news reached King's Landing of a new threat forming across the narrow sea. 9 powerful and ambitious men, including the likes of outlaws, exiles, pirates, and sellswords, had gathered together, swearing to become kings. The alliance became known as the Band of Nine, or more mockingly in Westeros, the Nine Penny Kings. Among them was Maelys I Blackfyre, the last surviving male of the Blackfyre line. Maelys had secured control of the Golden Company through violence, slaying his own cousin to command its loyalty, and his goal was to take the Iron Throne. The Band of Nine first turned their ambitions toward Essos, conquering the disputed lands and taking the Stepstones, even placing one of their own in control of Tyrosh. Many in Westeros, including Aegon himself, believed the Free Cities would put an end to them. Preparations were made to defend the realm, but there was no urgent mobilization. Meanwhile, King Aegon became increasingly obsessed with dragons. From his perspective, the failures of his reign were not due to lack of will, but lack of power. His reforms had been resisted or undone by powerful lords. Without dragons, he could not enforce meaningful change. Convinced that the return of dragons would allow him to reshape the realm, Aegon began a search for lost Valyrian Targaryen knowledge. Ancient texts were sought from across the world, with journeys reportedly reaching as far as Ashai. His closest advisors warned against this path, but Aegon pressed on, convinced that dragons were the key to fulfilling his vision. In the Westerlands, the weakness of Tytos Lannister had led to growing instability. The crown was forced to intervene multiple times to restore order. Tytos' son Tywin had already begun to show more strength than his father. As a boy, he had openly opposed his father's decisions. Tytos eventually sent Tywin to court as a cupbearer, and here he formed close friendships with Prince Jaehaerys' son Aerys and Stephen Baratheon. Eventually, Jaehaerys had his son Aerys married to his sister Rhaella, despite King Aegon's own distaste for incestuous unions. The external threats in Essos, instability with the nobility, and succession problem resulted in the tragedy of Summerhall in 259 AC. That year, King Aegon summoned many of those closest to him to the Targaryen summer palace in the Dornish marches. Officially, the gathering was to celebrate the birth of his first great-grandchild, the child of Aerys and Rhaella, but Aegon's true purpose was to hatch dragon eggs. The exact details remain a mystery, but it is widely believed that sorcery played a role, whether through ritual, wildfire, or some combination of ancient and dangerous practices. Aegon attempted to bring dragons back into the world. Instead, a fire consumed the castle, reducing Summerhall to ruins. King Aegon V, his oldest son Duncan, his closest friend Sir Duncan, and many others perished during this tragedy. While the flames consumed Summerhall, Rhaegar, the son of Aerys and Rhaella, was born at the same time. With King Aegon V dead, the throne passed to his second son, 34-year-old Jaehaerys II in 259 AC. Though often regarded as physically frail, Jaehaerys proved more capable than many expected. One of his first acts as king was to not only put an end to the increasing threat of the Band of Nine, but also the Blackfire line completely. Although he initially wished to lead the campaign himself, his hand of the king, Lord Ormond Baratheon, persuaded him to remain in King's Landing with Queen Shaera, arguing that the king's safety and presence were essential for the realm's stability. Thus, command of the campaign fell to Ormond. In 260 AC, the armies of Westeros sailed to the Stepstones. Lord Quelyn Greyjoy led a fleet of 100 longships from the Iron Islands, while the Westerlands contributed heavily under the command of Sir Jason Lannister, brother of Lord Tytos. 11,000 Westermen marched, including young nobles such as Tywin, Kevan, and Tygae Lannister. From Dorne came spears, and from across the Seven Kingdoms came knights and noblemen eager for glory. Among them were Prince Aerys Targaryen, who was still a squire, Stephen Baratheon, Brynden Tully, Jon Arryn, Rickard Stark, and many more. Fighting raged across land and sea for most of the year. Early in the campaign, tragedy struck when the commander, Lord Ormond Baratheon, was killed, reportedly by Maelys Blackfire himself. He died in the arms of his son Stephen, and with his death, command passed to Sir Gerald Hightower, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. The Westerlands also suffered losses, most notably Sir Jason Lannister, who fell during the fighting on Bloodstone. Leadership of the Westermen then passed to Lord Roger Rayne, who led them to several victories. Young knights distinguished themselves in battle, with Sir Barristan Selmy becoming a legend here, cutting his way through the ranks of the Golden Company. Barristan faced Maelys in single combat and killed him, ending not only the battle, but the male line of House Blackfire itself. With Maelys dead, the remaining members of the Band of Nine abandoned their ambitions of conquering Westeros, retreating back to Essos to pursue their own interests. Barristan Selmy's heroics earned him a place in the Kingsguard at just 23 years old. Prince Aerys was knighted on the battlefield by his close friend Tywin. Alongside them, Stephen Baratheon emerged as Lord of Storm's End. Meanwhile, Tywin changed greatly after the war. Witnessing both the glory of strong leadership and the failures of his own father, he grew increasingly determined to restore the power and dignity of House Lannister. Lord Tytos, who had remained at Casterly Rock during the war, continued to display weakness. Upon returning, Tywin immediately began asserting authority, demanding repayment of debts, taking hostages when necessary, and sending his brother Kevan with veteran knights to crush banditry and enforce order. While some obeyed, others, such as Lord Roger Rayne, mocked these efforts. When Lord Walder Tarbeck confronted Casterly Rock, Tywin had him imprisoned, provoking retaliation from Walderand's wife, Ellen Tarbeck, who seized Lannister hostages in return. Lord Tytos undermined his son by releasing Walderan and forgiving the debts, but the damage had been done. By 261 AC, both House Rayne and House Tarbeck openly renounced Lannister authority, triggering the Rayne-Tarbeck revolt. Acting without his father's permission, Tywin raised an army and destroyed Tarbeck Hall, annihilating House Rayne by flooding the mines of Castamere, ending both houses entirely. While these events unfolded in the west, the broader realm experienced a brief period of recovery under Jaehaerys II. Despite his ill health, the king managed to restore stability after the actions of his father's later years, most notably through reconciliation with previously unhappy lords. Even those who had doubted him came to recognize his effectiveness as a ruler. However, in 262 AC, after only 3 years on the throne, Jaehaerys died suddenly from illness, reportedly struggling to breathe in his final moments. With Jaehaerys' death, his son Aerys was crowned. He was young, charismatic, and filled with ambition, wanting to distinguish himself immediately upon ascending the Iron Throne. One of his first acts was to sweep aside many of the aging officials who had served under his father and grandfather, replacing them with younger men. His close friend Tywin, who just recently showcased immense strength at Casterly Rock, was named Hand of the King. In these early years, Aerys immersed himself in governance, often declaring that he wanted to be remembered as the greatest king in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. He had grand, but often impractical ambitions. He spoke of conquering the Stepstones and adding them permanently to his realm, of building a new wall hundreds of miles north to expand the kingdom's borders, and of constructing a marble city along the Blackwater Rush to replace foul-smelling King's Landing. Despite all of his grandiosity, he lacked the discipline to follow through, as his attention drifted quickly. While the king dreamed, it was Tywin who ruled in practice. As Hand, Tywin proved to be an extraordinarily capable administrator. He restored the crown's finances by repaying debts to the Iron Bank of Braavos, using the vast wealth of Casterly Rock, avoided unnecessary foreign entanglements, and brought stability to the realm. He repealed many of the pro-smallfolk reforms enacted by Aegon V, winning back the favor of the Great Lords, while also reducing tariffs to encourage trade in King's Landing, Old Town, and Lannisport. Roads were improved, criminals punished harshly, and order restored. The realm prospered, but Tywin himself remained feared rather than loved. Over time, a dangerous perception began to spread that Tywin, not Aerys, was the true ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. This growing imbalance of power strained the king's pride. To make matters worse, in 263 AC, Tywin married his cousin Joanna Lannister, a woman rumored to have attracted Aerys' attention. At their wedding feast, a drunken Aerys made crude remarks and acted inappropriately during the bedding ceremony, an insult Tywin would never forget. Joanna returned to Casterly Rock, and there she later gave birth to twins, Cersei and Jaime, in 266 AC. Aerys' own marriage to his sister Rhaella was far from stable. While the king indulged freely in mistresses, Rhaella tragically endured multiple failed pregnancies. At first, Aerys showed compassion, but he started to become suspicious. By 270 AC, he had convinced himself that Rhaella had been unfaithful, and that the failed pregnancies were evidence of divine judgment against bastardy. He confined her to Maegor's holdfast and placed Septas to guard her. In 267 AC, Tywin's father, Lord Tydos, died of a heart attack while climbing stairs to visit his mistress. Tywin succeeded him as Lord of Casterly Rock, and immediately imposed harsh discipline, including forcing his father's mistress to walk naked through Lannisport in atonement. That same year, the royal court briefly relocated to Casterly Rock, but upon returning to King's Landing in 268 AC, tensions between the king and Hand worsened. Aerys began openly defying Tywin's counsel. The king's paranoia deepened as whispers spread that he was merely a puppet. When Tywin's captain of the guard, Sir Ilyn Payne, was overheard repeating such rumors, Aerys had his tongue torn out with hot pincers. Determined to reassert his authority, Aerys increasingly undermined his hand, rejecting his appointments and replacing them with his own loyalists. What had once been a powerful partnership devolved into a bitter rivalry. In the Stormlands, Lord Steffon Baratheon and his wife Cassana Estremont welcomed two sons, Robert in 262 AC and Stannis 2 years later, due to alliances Lord Jon Arryn had made with Steffon and Rickard during the War of the Ninepenny Kings. Both of their sons, Robert and Eddard, would eventually be sent to the Eyrie as wards when they were both very young. There, they formed a close friendship and regarded Jon as a second father. In the Riverlands, Lord Hoster Tully ruled Riverrun, raising his children Catelyn, Lysa, and Edmure, alongside his ward Peter Baelish. Peter, mocked as Littlefinger, grew close to the Tully children and a love triangle formed, with Peter falling in love with Catelyn and Lysa falling in love with Peter. To celebrate 10 years upon the Iron Throne, a grand anniversary tourney was organized in King's Landing, with it being financed mostly by Tywin. Lords and ladies from across the realm gathered in the capital, and among them came Tywin's wife, Lady Joanna, returning to court for the first time in years, accompanied by her 6-year-old twins, Cersei and Jaime. For Cersei, she always wanted to visit the capital after hearing so many stories about court life, and when she saw Aerys' son, Prince Rhaegar, she became infatuated with him. During the festivities, the drunk King Aerys publicly embarrassed Joanna by asking whether nursing her children had ruined her breast, which deeply humiliated her. Tywin, a man who rarely showed emotion, endured the moment in silence, but the insult cut deeply. The following morning, he attempted to resign as Hand of the King, but Aerys refused, forcing Tywin to remain in service. Back in the Westerlands, Tywin's twin children, Jaime and Cersei, grew up very close to one another. They at one point slept together when they were very young and even experienced on each other sexually, during which their mother, Joanna, was informed, having Cersei's bedchamber guarded from then on. In 273 AC, Joanna died not long after while giving birth to a boy named Tyrion. After Joanna's death, King Aerys made a cruel remark, suggesting that the gods had taken Joanna and given Tywin a dwarf son as punishment, claiming this was done to teach him humility. When these words reached Tywin, whatever remained of his affection for Aerys died completely. In 274 AC, Queen Rhaella gave birth to another son, Jaehaerys. For a brief time, the king's madness went away, but peace did not last long. The infant prince died within the same year, and Aerys' paranoia and rage only got stronger. longer. He first blamed the child's nurse, ordering her execution. Then, changing his mind, he accused one of his mistresses and her entire family of poisoning the child. They were tortured brutally until they confessed, though their stories conflicted wildly, showing that their confessions were not the truth. After these atrocities, Aerys was seemingly full of grief, fasting for 2 weeks and walking barefoot through King's Landing to the Great Sept of Baelor, where he prayed with the High Septon. Afterwards, he declared that he would remain faithful to Queen Rhaella and abandon his mistresses. In 276 AC, Rhaella gave birth to another son, Viserys. Unlike many of her previous children, the boy was healthy, but Aerys' paranoia had reached new heights. Terrified that someone might harm the child, he offered Kingsguard knights to watch over Viserys constantly, forbidding anyone, even Rhaella, from being alone with him. When Rhaella could no longer nurse the child, Aerys went so far to have his own food taster test the wed nurse in grotesque ways to ensure there was no poison. That same year, Tywin attempted to mend the fractured relationship between himself and the king by hosting another grand event, a tournament at Lannisport in honor of Prince Viserys' birth. Lords and small folk alike attended, but the crowd seemed to cheer louder for Tywin than they did for their king, which only deepened Aerys' insecurity. The 17-year-old Prince Rhaegar distinguished himself as a capable fighter by this point. Although he was not interested in violence, he excelled in tourneys when he chose to compete. At the Lannisport tournament, he defeated many respected knights, including Sir Barristan Selmy. He also formed a strong friendship with the legendary knight Sir Arthur Dayne during this time, who would go on to win the entire tourney at Lannisport after defeating Rhaegar. Meanwhile, Tywin made a bold political move. He formally proposed a marriage between his 10-year-old daughter Cersei and Prince Rhaegar. It was a logical and powerful alliance, uniting the wealth of the Lannisters with the royal bloodline, but Aerys rejected the proposal and insultingly declared that Tywin was merely a servant, and no servant's daughter was fit to marry a prince. He also refused to allow Jaime Lannister to serve as Rhaegar's squire, further slighting Tywin. Lord Rickard Stark made a series of politically motivated marriages, hoping to betroth his daughter Lyanna to Robert Baratheon and his son Brandon to Catelyn Tully. Peter Baelish, who is still deeply in love with Catelyn, was devastated by her betrothal. He soon attempted to kiss Catelyn shortly after, but she rejected him, laughing, which deeply wounded his pride. Drunk and heartbroken, Peter was taken to bed, where Lysa secretly joined him. In his drunken state, Peter believed Lysa to be Catelyn, and they had sex with each other. Duskendale was once a thriving port and a seat of kings in earlier centuries, but by the reign of King Aerys, its fortunes had declined sharply, mostly because Blackwater Bay had become the center of trade. Lord Dennis Darkland watched as his town slowly diminished in importance, and he became determined to reverse that decline. His solution was to gain greater autonomy and special rights, similar to those granted to Dorne generations earlier. However, when Lord Dennis brought this proposal before the crown in 277 AC, Tywin quickly refused his request. This rejection enraged Dennis, and after recognizing the growing rift between King Aerys and his hand, Dennis devised a dangerous plan. He stopped paying taxes to the Iron Throne in an act of rebellion. At the same time, he extended an invitation directly to King Aerys, asking him to come to Duskendale personally to hear his petition. Dennis believed that if he separated the king from his hand, he might be able to force a more favorable outcome. Tywin strongly advised Aerys not to go, urging him to reject the invitation. Aerys interpreted Tywin's advice as yet another attempt to control him, so he chose to ignore Tywin's advice. He left with a single Kingsguard knight, Sir Gawain Gaunt, and when he arrived at Duskendale, Aerys was seized by Lord Dennis's forces. Sir Gawain fought valiantly, but was slain by the Master-at-Arms of House Darkland. Aerys was also treated brutally, being shoved, stripped of his clothes, beaten, and humiliated. With the king now a hostage, he planned to force the crown to negotiate, threatening the king's life. Tywin assembled a powerful force and marched on Duskendale, placing the town under siege. By land and sea, he blockaded it, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. Despite his military strength, Tywin knew that any direct assault on the town could have resulted in the king's death. After around 6 months, Sir Barristan Selmy eventually infiltrated the town alone with the goal of rescuing Aerys. He disguised himself as a beggar, climbed the walls, and snuck through the castle without being seen. After making his way to the dungeon, he found the king and they made their escape. Eventually, they were found and Sir Barristan was forced to fight his way through the castle before ultimately leaving safely. The defiance of Duskendale shattered what remained of Aerys' sanity, making him even more paranoid, cruel, and unstable. He ordered the complete destruction of House Darkland. Lord Dennis begged for mercy but received none, and he was executed along with every member of his house. His wife, Lady Sarala, had her tongue in womanhood torn out before being burned alive. He extended his vengeance to House Hallard, who were also involved, ordering their extermination. Only a young boy was spared thanks to Sir Barristan pleading for mercy. House Darkland's lands and wealth were granted to House Ricker, while the Hallards' lands were stripped, their villages burned, and their castle torn down. After settling back into King's Landing, Aerys refused to be touched, allowing his hair and fingernails to grow long and wild, and until 281 AC, he refused to leave the Red Keep at all. He also believed that Tywin and his own son Rhaegar had plotted together to have him killed during the siege, so that Rhaegar might take the throne and wed Tywin's daughter Cersei. This belief poisoned all of Aerys' relationships. He refused to meet Tywin unless all 7 Kingsguard were present, and didn't couldn't trust anyone, including Rhaegar. Seeking someone he could trust, Aerys turned to his old friend Steffan, summoning him to court and raising him to the small council. Aerys tasked Steffan with traveling to Volantis to find a bride of pure Valyrian blood for Prince Rhaegar, but privately, many suspected that Aerys intended to replace Tywin as hand with Steffan, and perhaps even arrest and execute Tywin for treason upon his return. In 278 AC, Steffan departed with his wife, and after returning to Storm's End from his voyage, his ship was caught in a violent storm in Shipbreaker Bay. Robert became the Lord of Storm's End, and this event deeply saddened Stannis, with him later claiming he lost his faith in the gods that day. The paranoid Aerys believed that Tywin had orchestrated Steffan's death as well. As his fear deepened, Aerys sought new means of control, bringing the foreign eunuch Varys to court and appointing him Master of Whispers. Trusting him because he had no ties to Westeros, Aerys empowered Varys to build a vast network of spies, earning him the nickname the Spider. Meanwhile, the matter of Prince Rhaegar's marriage was resolved in early 279 AC, when he was betrothed to Elia Martell, sister to the Prince of Dorne. They had a grand ceremony at the Great Sept of Baelor, yet Aerys refused to attend, fearing assassination, and even forbade his young son Viserys from going. Afterward, Rhaegar and Elia chose to reside on Dragonstone, fueling rumors that the prince was distancing himself in preparation to overthrow his father. Later that year, Rhaegar and Elia had a daughter, Rhaenys. When she was presented at court, Aerys refused to touch her, claiming that she smelled Dornish, which deepened the rift between Aerys and his son. By this time, Aerys' madness resulted in him gaining an obsession with fire. He became fixated on wildfire and began using it to execute those he deemed traitors. These acts aroused the king, and after conducting these executions, he would force himself upon Queen Rhaella. During all of this, Sir Arthur Dayne defeated the Kingswood Brotherhood and earned the loyalty of the Smallfolk. A young Jaime Lannister had joined him and was knighted by Sir Arthur. This resulted in Jaime rising in prominence as a respected knight. After returning to King's Landing, Cersei informed Jaime that Tywin was planning on having Jaime betrothed soon. She ended up seducing him to persuade him to join the Kingsguard, so he would remain unmarried and live near her in the Red Keep. After they had sex, Jaime agreed to the plan. Aerys eventually appointed Jaime to the Kingsguard as a calculated slight against Tywin, stripping him of his heir and effectively taking Jaime as a hostage. Though Tywin accepted the decision, he was secretly furious, and he resigned as Hand of the King, returning to Casterly Rock with Cersei. With Tywin gone, the court fractured into rival factions, one loyal to Aerys and another aligned with Rhaegar. Grand Maester Pycelle, recognizing the gravity of the situation, wrote to the Citadel warning that the divisions at court resembled those that had occurred before the Dance of the Dragons, fearing a civil war was inevitable. In 280 AC, Lord Walter Wynn announced that he would host a grand tournament at his seat of Harrenhal, with prizes said to be 3 times richer than those offered at the earlier Lannisport tourney. This alone drew hundreds of knights, lords, and spectators from across Westeros. Yet from the beginning, there were rumors that this was actually a plot orchestrated by Rhaegar, who may have used the tourney as a way to gather the great lords of the realm to quietly discuss the possibility of removing his unstable father, King Aerys, from the Iron Throne. The King's Master of Whispers, Varys, informed Aerys of these rumors. As a result, Aerys decided to leave the Red Keep for the first time in years to attend the tourney himself. When the king appeared at Harrenhal, everyone was shocked by his appearance. Due to not having his hair and nails cut for years, his beard was tangled and filthy, and his fingernails were long and yellow, reportedly curling like claws. His behavior was also erratic, at times randomly laughing maniacally, and at other times having sudden bursts of rage. To everyone attending, his presence inspired fear and discomfort, whereas his son Rhaegar, being tall and handsome, commanded respect and love. The tourney itself lasted 10 days. The opening feast brought together many of the most important figures in Westeros. The Starks of Winterfell were present, and it was here that Lyanna Stark encountered a boy being bullied by 3 squires, with her defending him and scaring the boys away. That same night, during the feast, Prince Rhaegar performed a beautiful song on his harp, a performance so moving that it brought Lyanna to tears. The shy Eddard Stark only danced with Lady Ashara Dayne after his bold brother Brandon arranged it, whereas the more extroverted Robert Baratheon was drinking heavily. By the end of the tournament, Prince Rhaegar emerged victorious, defeating the finest knights in the realm, including Sir Barristan Selmy and Arthur Dayne. As champion, it fell to Rhaegar to name the Queen of Love and Beauty. Everyone expected him to crown his wife, Princess Elia Martell, but instead he rode past her and placed the roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark, who was already betrothed to Robert Baratheon. Everyone fell into silence. Brandon Stark had to be physically restrained from confronting Rhaegar, interpreting the gesture as an insult to his sister's honor. Although some claimed Robert laughed it off, many believed he took deep offense to this, which resulted in him resenting Rhaegar. Around this time, Lyanna talked to her brother Eddard about marrying Robert, claiming that she believed she would never be able to keep him away from having sex with other women. Eddard tried persuading her that Robert would love her, but Lyanna claimed that love cannot change a man's nature. After the tourney, Rhaegar returned to Dragonstone with Elia, who had nearly died giving birth to their second child Aegon. Rhaegar came to believe that Aegon might be the prince that was promised. Sometime after Aegon's birth, Rhaegar encountered Lyanna near Harrenhal. What followed remains one of the most debated moments in Westerosi history. To some, specifically Robert Baratheon, she had been abducted and repeatedly sexually abused. abused. To others, such as Barristan Selmy, Rhaegar had taken her out of love, perhaps even with her consent. Whatever the truth, the perception across the realm, especially in the north and Stormlands, was that Lyanna had been abducted. At this time, Brandon Stark was traveling south toward Riverrun for his upcoming marriage to Catelyn Tully. After arriving at Riverrun, Peter Baelish, who still loved Catelyn, challenged Brandon to a duel for her love. During the duel, Peter lost so badly that Catelyn begged for him to be spared, leaving Baelish severely wounded. It took Peter around 2 weeks to recover while under the care of Lysa, during which time he again slept with her, leaving her pregnant. Lord Hoster Tully, viewing Peter as too lowborn, later forced Lysa to drink moon tea to end the pregnancy. After news reached Brandon that his sister had gone missing, he immediately departed from Riverrun and rode for King's Landing with a small group of young nobles. When he arrived at the Red Keep, enraged, he shouted for Rhaegar to come out and die, unaware that the prince was not even present in the city. King Aerys II viewed this as treason, resulting in Brandon and his companions being arrested and charged with plotting the murder of the prince. Aerys summoned their fathers to answer for their son's crimes. Trusting in the laws of the realm, Rickard came to King's Landing expecting justice. When Rickard demanded a trial by combat, Aerys granted it, but he declared that House Targaryen's champion would be fire itself. Rickard was suspended down into a pit of wildfire, and as the flames burned him alive, Brandon was attached to a strangling device where his hands were bound behind his back, but a sword was placed just beyond his reach. If he could reach it, he might save his father, but every movement tightened the cord around his throat. Brandon struggled to reach the blade, strangling himself in the process, while being forced to watch his father burn to death. The companions who had ridden with Brandon, along with most of their fathers, were also executed by Aerys. The paranoid Aerys, convinced of a broader conspiracy, then demanded that Jon Arryn send the heads of his wards, Eddard Stark, now Lord of Winterfell, and Robert Baratheon. Jon refused, and rather than complying, he raised his banners, resulting in a full-scale rebellion beginning. At the beginning of Robert's rebellion, not all of Jon Arryn's bannermen supported him. In the Vale at Goldtown, loyalists to the crown moved to block the rebels by holding the key port city. While Jon and Robert moved to secure Goldtown through force, Eddard realized that they were unable to safely depart from the port. Instead, he crossed the Mountains of the Moon to the Fingers, where he secured passage on a fishing boat. The journey was extremely dangerous, as a storm struck during the crossing of the Bight, but they eventually made it to White Harbor. Once safely in the north, Eddard called his banners, assembling the strength of House Stark for the war to come. Meanwhile, Robert returned to the Stormlands to do the same, but like Jon Arryn, he faced disloyalty among his own vessels. Acting quickly on intelligence he had received, Robert rode ahead with a small force and engaged each army separately in a series of rapid engagements, defeating all three. With his position in the Stormlands secured, Robert set out to join Jon Arryn in the northern forces, leaving his younger brother Stannis in command of Storm's End. His resolve would soon be tested as the Reach, under Mace Tyrell and Paxter Redwyne, laid siege to Storm's End. Meanwhile, at the Battle of Ashford, Robert faced his first defeat. There, Randyll Tarly had struck Robert's forces hard before the main royalist army could arrive, forcing Robert to retreat northward. Aerys, recognizing Robert as the greatest threat to his rule, appointed a strong commander known as Jon Cunnington to the position of Hand of the King. Cunnington pursued Robert relentlessly, eventually cornering him at Stony Sept. Wounded and separated from his army, Robert was forced into hiding within the town, aided by the small folk who hid him. Cunnington's men searched every house, taking hostages and offering rewards, but failed to find him. Eddard and his forces, including support from House Tully, eventually arrived, triggering the Battle of the Bells, a chaotic and brutal fight through the streets of Stony Sept, named for the constant ringing of the town's bells, as Septons warned the small folk to take shelter. During the battle, Cunnington killed Jon Arryn's heir and wounded Hoster Tully, but when Robert emerged from hiding and engaged Cunnington, he nearly killed him. In the aftermath, Aerys exiled Cunnington for his failure and replaced him with Carlton Chelstead, only to later burn Chelstead alive when he protested the king's increasingly unhinged plans. Aerys had been stockpiling wildfire throughout King's Landing, intending to burn the entire city rather than let it fall to his enemies. This descent into madness was witnessed firsthand by Jaime Lannister, who, bound by his vows, was forced to stand guard even as Aerys committed atrocities, including the act of forcing non-consensual sex on his wife, who Jaime heard crying out in the process. When Jaime protested about this to another member of the Kingsguard, claiming that he has sworn to defend the queen, his sworn brother replied, "We are, but not from him." Meanwhile, to secure the support of House Tully, a double marriage was arranged at Riverrun. Eddard Stark would marry Catelyn Tully, who was originally betrothed to his brother Brandon, while Jon Arryn married Lysa Tully, who would later bring Jon Arryn a new heir. These marriages bound the Riverlands to the rebel cause. As the rebels left Riverrun to return to the war, Catelyn quickly found out that she was pregnant with her first child, Robb Stark. While these events unfolded, Rhaegar Targaryen remained absent for much of the early rebellion, widely believed to have been in the south with Lyanna Stark at the Tower of Joy in Dorne, guarded by members of the Kingsguard. including Arthur Dayne and Oswell Wint. Only after the Battle of the Bells did Rhaegar return, summoned by Sir Gerald Hightower, to take command of the royalist forces and attempt to restore order to a realm now fully engulfed in war. In Dorne, Prince Doran Martell, the brother of Elia, felt deeply insulted by Rhaegar's apparent abandonment of Elia. At the beginning of Robert's rebellion, Doran wasn't sure on sending forces to help either side, cautiously holding off. However, King Aerys held Elia and her children hostage in King's Landing, making it clear that their safety depended on Dornish support. Because of this, Doran agreed to send 10,000 Dornish soldiers to reinforce the royal army being assembled by Prince Rhaegar. Prince Lewin Martell, Doran's uncle and a member of the Kingsguard, was a part of this. Before departing the capital to meet the rebels, Rhaegar had a final interaction with Jaime Lannister. Jaime, eager to prove himself in battle and disillusioned with the madness of King Aerys, begged to accompany the prince to the front. Rhaegar refused, explaining that Aerys insisted Jaime remain behind as a hostage against his father Tywin, whose loyalties were still uncertain. Rhaegar promised Jaime that changes would be made upon his return, a statement that many interpreted as evidence that Rhaegar still intended to become king. Instead, he entrusted Jaime with the safety of Elia and their children. The two great armies finally met at the Trident, a crossing that would later be known as the Ruby Ford, named for the scattered red gemstones that fell into the river from Rhaegar's armor. The Loyalist force, numbering around 40,000 men, faced a smaller but battle-hardened rebel force led by Robert, Eddard, and Jon. The battle was chaotic, and eventually Robert and Rhaegar met in single combat during the fighting. Rhaegar fought skillfully and managed to wound Robert, but Robert's raw strength ultimately prevailed. With a crushing blow from his warhammer to Rhaegar's chest, he killed the prince, shattering the morale of the royal army. As Rhaegar fell, so too did the Loyalist forces, which broke and fled the field. Sir Barristan Selmy fought valiantly, cutting down numerous enemies, but ultimately suffered wounds from arrows, spears, and swords. When he was captured after the battle, Lord Roose Bolton advised Robert to have him executed, arguing that such a formidable knight should not be allowed to live. Robert, however, ordered his own maester to treat Barristan's wounds instead. This action won loyalty even from former enemies. Lewin Martell, leading the Dornish forces, was also slain during the battle, further weakening Dorne's position. Around this time, Robert openly declared his intention to claim the Iron Throne. Of the three primary rebel leaders, Robert had the strongest hereditary claim due to his grandmother, Princess Rhaelle Targaryen, the daughter of King Aegon V. While maesters would later use this blood connection to legitimize his rule, it was widely understood that conquest, not lineage, truly secured his crown. Robert was wounded in the battle by Rhaegar, and as a result, he did not immediately pursue the fleeing royalist forces. Instead, he entrusted that task to Eddard, who led the pursuit south toward King's Landing. Meanwhile, Lord Quelyn Greyjoy of the Iron Islands had initially remained neutral. However, after news of Rhaegar's death reached Pike, his sons Balon, Euron, and Victarion convinced him that remaining neutral would mean missing any opportunity for plundering and gaining an advantage. Reluctantly, Quelyn committed a limited force of 50 longships to raid the Reach. These efforts achieved little. The Ironborn captured some ships and raided coastal settlements, but were intercepted by the Shield Islands fleet at the mouth of the Mander. In the battle, Quelyn was killed, and his son Balon withdrew the remaining forces back to the Iron Islands, where he claimed the Seastone Chair. Back in King's Landing, after King Aerys learned of Rhaegar's death, he fell deeper into paranoia and fear. Recognizing the danger to his remaining family, he ordered his son Viserys and wife Queen Rhaella, who was pregnant with a girl named Daenerys, to be sent to Dragonstone under the protection of Sir Willem Darry. Rhaella wore a hood and safely departed. Aerys refused to send Elia and her children with them, choosing instead to keep them in King's Landing as hostages to ensure Dornish loyalty. Despite Lewin Martell's death and service to the crown, Aerys convinced himself that Lewin had somehow betrayed Rhaegar during the battle, further justifying in his mind the decision to hold Elia and her children as leverage. Before Eddard and his men could reach King's Landing, Tywin finally acted. With 12,000 men, he marched on the capital and presented himself at the gates, professing loyalty to Aerys. Despite warnings from Varys to keep the gates closed, Grand Maester Pycelle convinced Aerys to accept Tywin's forces. Once inside, the Lannister army began the sack of King's Landing. The city descended into chaos as soldiers looted, killed, and sexually forced themselves on women. While this unfolded, Aerys, now fully aware of his defeat, finally attempted to enact his wildfire plot. He commanded his hand to ignite the wildfire hidden throughout the city. He then ordered Jaime to kill his own father as proof of loyalty. Jaime, realizing what was about to occur, stopped the hand at a gate and killed him, preventing the plot from being executed. Knowing that Aerys would simply find another pyromancer, Jaime then entered the throne room. When Aerys demanded Tywin's head and attempted to flee, Jaime pulled him from the steps of the Iron Throne and cut his throat, killing the king and preventing the destruction of the city. Although this act saved hundreds of thousands of lives, it earned him the title Kingslayer, as the truth remained largely unknown. Meanwhile, within Maegor's holdfast, Sir Gregor Clegane and Sir Amory Lorch infiltrated the Red Keep to eliminate the remaining Targaryen heirs. Amory dragged young Princess Rhaenys from beneath her father's bed and stabbed her dozens of times. Gregor brutally killed the infant Prince Aegon by smashing his head against the wall in front of his mother, Princess Elia, before sexually forcing himself on her. According to Tywin, their deaths were intended to demonstrate his loyalty to Robert by ending the Targaryen line, though they would forever stain House Lannister and enrage House Martell. Rumors circulated that Aerys ordered the killings or that Elia acted herself, though most, including Oberyn Martell, believed Tywin was responsible. However, Tywin claims that he never ordered for Elia to be abused, and that her death was unnecessary as she didn't pose a threat to the line of succession. When Eddard finally arrived in the city, he found Jaime seated on the Iron Throne, with Aerys dead in front of him. Ned was disgusted by both the sack and the deaths of Elia's children. His outrage worsened when Robert later arrived and expressed satisfaction with the deaths, referring to the children as dragonspawn. This caused a severe rift between the two men. Ned left the city to put a definitive end to the war. In the days following the sack, Jaime completed his duty by hunting down and killing the remaining pyromancers, ensuring the wildfire plot could never be carried out. Despite Ned's insistence that Jaime be punished, Robert, guided by Jon Arryn, chose to pardon him, along with Varys and Pycelle. Tywin's actions, though brutal, secured his alliance with the new king. Robert's brother Stannis continued to hold Storm's End during the entire rebellion against the Tyrell forces. He and everyone there nearly starved to death until Davos, a known smuggler, brought food to help them hold the castle. After Eddard's forces came and put an end to the siege, Stannis knighted Davos and took him into his service. However, he also punished him for his crimes as a smuggler by removing parts of Davos's fingers. Eddard made his way south with only 6 Northmen to find his sister Lyanna, hoping he would be able to rescue her. They arrived at the Tower of Joy, a structure within the Red Mountains of Dorne. Upon their arrival, they found it guarded by 3 of the most formidable knights in Westeros: Arthur Dayne, Oswell Whent, and Gerald Hightower. Their presence made it clear that whatever is in the castle was of the highest importance of the now dead Rhaegar. A battle inevitably broke out, and by the end of it, only 2 men remained alive: Eddard Stark and his ally, Howland Reed. Stories later told across the realm often claim that Eddard killed Arthur Dayne in single combat, which would make him one of the greatest warriors of his age. However, Eddard would claim that was not the full truth. He admitted that thanks to Howland Reed's intervention, he was able to survive. After the fighting ended, Eddard entered the tower. Inside, he found his sister Lyanna dying in a bed soaked with blood, with the room smelling strongly of blood and roses. Lyanna was weak and had a fever, with fear in her eyes. She spoke to Ned and asked him for a promise. The exact nature of this promise remains a mystery, but he agreed, which made her fear leave her. She smiled, clutching his hand, before dying shortly after. Even after her death, Ned remained there, holding her body until Howland Reed gently separated his hand from hers. Afterward, Ned tore down the tower itself, using its stones to build burial mounds for the 8 fallen men. He then traveled to Starfall, the seat of House Dayne, to return Dawn, the ancestral sword of Arthur Dayne. At Starfall, he encountered Ashara Dayne, Arthur's sister. Not long after Ned's visit, Ashara threw herself into the sea and died, and the reason why she did this remains unclear. Finally, Ned returned north, bringing not only Lyanna's remains with him, but also a bastard son known as Jon Snow. This strained his relationship with his wife Catelyn, and he refused to speak to her about Jon's mother. When Catelyn heard rumors that the boy's mother was Ashara Dayne, she confronted Ned, but he told her she didn't need to know about it. Honoring Lyanna's wishes, he buried her in the crypts of Winterfell alongside their father, Rickard, and their brother Brandon. Though tradition dictated that only kings and lords of Winterfell receive statues in the crypts, Ned broke this custom, as he had statues made for both Lyanna and Brandon. In late 283 AC, Robert Baratheon was formally crowned king. He appointed Jon Arryn, the man who had raised him like a son, as his hand of the king. Following Jon's counsel, Robert pardoned many of his former enemies. Sir Barristan Selmy was not only forgiven, but also elevated to Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Unbeknownst to Robert, Sir Barristan didn't have very much love for the new king. After being severely wounded at the Battle of the Trident, he was not present in King's Landing during the sack. When he heard that Robert had smiled at the bodies of the dead Targaryen children, he said he would have killed Robert on the spot if he was present. Nonetheless, Sir Barristan accepted the position and served Robert for years to come. Robert also had the skulls of the dragons that had decorated the throne room removed, replacing them with banners depicting hunting scenes and battles, reflecting his own personality. Meanwhile, he began redistributing lands and titles. Storm's End, his ancestral seat, was granted to his youngest brother Renly, while Stannis, his older and more dutiful brother, was given Dragonstone, the traditional seat of the heir to the throne. However, Stannis viewed this as a slight, believing he had been denied the more prestigious seat. Robert tasked Stannis with building a new royal fleet and capturing Dragonstone, which still held Targaryen loyalists, including Queen Rhaella and her son Viserys. After months of staying on Dragonstone, Rhaella finally gave birth to Daenerys during a violent storm that nearly destroyed the island. She died shortly after childbirth, leaving her children, Viserys and Daenerys, as the last heirs of the Targaryen dynasty. With Stannis soon arriving to invade, Sir Willem Darry smuggled the children away to the free cities, where they would grow up in exile and poverty. While Stannis was successful in capturing Dragonstone, Robert blamed him for allowing the children to escape. To secure his rule, Robert followed Jon Arryn's advice and married Cersei Lannister in 284 AC, forming a political alliance with House Lannister. On the morning of the wedding, Jaime and Cersei had sex, and Jaime expressed that he was unhappy that Cersei was marrying Robert. The wedding was held in the Great Sept of Baelor and celebrated with a grand tourney. On their wedding night, Robert, drunk and still grieving Lyanna, called Cersei by Lyanna's name. This moment shattered any hope Cersei had for the marriage, and from that point on, their relationship deteriorated into resentment and hostility. Robert continued to drink heavily and was often abusive, while Cersei withdrew emotionally and resumed her incestuous relationship with her twin brother Jaime. Cersei bore 3 children, Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen, each publicly acknowledged as Robert's, but in truth fathered by Jaime. Robert remained oblivious, often absent during their births, preferring to hunt rather than attend to family matters. Cersei even became pregnant by Robert once, but chose to secretly abort the child, unwilling to bear his true heir. In Dorne, the deaths of Elia Martell and her children created deep resentment. Elia's brother Oberyn sought revenge and even attempted to raise support for King Aerys' son, Viserys, but Jon Arryn personally traveled to Sunspear, returning the bones of Prince Lewin Martell and negotiating peace with Prince Doran. Though open conflict was avoided, Doran and Oberyn began secretly plotting long-term vengeance, and even formed a hidden alliance involving a marriage pact between Viserys and Doran's daughter Arianne. At some point around 288 AC, a brother of the Night's Watch, Mance Rayder, accompanied the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch to Winterfell for a meeting with Eddard Stark. Some years later, while he was ranging beyond the wall, Mance was attacked by a Shadowcat. He survived but was badly wounded. A wildling woman found him and nursed him back to health, while also repairing his torn black cloak. After this moment, he abandoned the Watch and lived as a wildling. You see, he was born between a free folk woman and a man of the Watch many years ago, and he lived among the wildlings during his childhood. When brothers of the Watch killed the free folk and were watching over him, he was taken to the wall and raised among them. After living on the wall for years and training with them, when he eventually left them and joined the free folk, he had information no other wildling did. He would eventually rise as the king beyond the wall after living among the wildlings for years. Meanwhile, Jorah Mormont was elected as the 997th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Before joining the Watch, he was Lord of Bear Island, with his house being loyal to House Stark. He eventually passed this position to his son Ser Jorah and took the Black. Meanwhile, Jon Arryn continued governing the realm as hand, handling diplomacy, finances, and administration while Robert indulged in tournaments in excess. He arranged key political marriages, appointed officials, and even brought Peter Baelish into power, eventually making him Master of Coin. Under Peter's management, royal revenues increased significantly due to his complex web of loans and investments, but so too did the crown's debt due to Robert's spending. By 289 AC, the Lord of the Iron Island, Balon Greyjoy, had longed for a return of the old way, the brutal seafaring culture of raiding and conquest that had defined the Ironborn for centuries before Aegon the Conqueror brought them into the Seven Kingdoms. Because House Greyjoy had only joined Robert's rebellion near its end, they emerged from the war far less weakened than the other great houses, and Balon used this advantage wisely. Over the course of 5 years, he quietly built strength, overseeing the construction of a formidable naval force known as the Iron Fleet, 100 warships designed for speed and devastation. Balon convinced himself that Robert's hold on the throne was fragile, believing the new king lacked the loyalty of the realm and would be unable to respond effectively to a sudden uprising. The surprise attack on Lannisport was planned out by Balon's brother Euron and executed by his other brother Victarion, Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet. In the night, the Ironborn descended upon the harbor, setting the Lannister fleet ablaze while it sat at anchor. This early victory gave Balon control of the Sunset Sea and created the illusion that his rebellion might succeed. Balon's oldest son, Roderick, led an assault on Seaguard in the Riverlands. However, this campaign ended in disaster. Roderick was slain during the battle, and the Ironborn forces were driven back into Iron Man's Bay. Meanwhile, King Robert united allies such as Eddard Stark and Tywin Lannister. Stannis Baratheon created a naval force far larger than anything the Ironborn could imagine. In the Straits of Fair Isle, Stannis lured Victarion into a trap and annihilated much of the Iron Fleet. This defeat not only destroyed Balon's naval advantage, but also allowed royal forces to safely transport armies across the sea to the Iron Islands themselves. With the sea secured, Robert's forces began an invasion on the Iron Islands. Stannis subdued Great Wig in his brother's name, while Barristan Selmy led the assault on Old Wig. Other islands, including Harlaw and Orkmont, were also attacked and brought under royal control. With every island captured, the Ironborn forces were pushed back toward their stronghold on Pike. Robert and Eddard led the assault on Pike together, fighting side by side as they had during the rebellion against the Targaryens. During the chaos, Balon's second son, Meryn, was killed defending the castle. Toros of Myr became the first man through the breach, charging forward with a sword set on fire, and close behind him were warriors such as Lord Jorah Mormont. Their bravery earned them knighthoods from Robert after the battle, while countless others perished. With Pike fallen and his forces broken, Balon Greyjoy was brought before Robert in chains. Despite his rebellion, Robert chose mercy over execution. Balon was allowed to live and remain Lord of the Iron Islands, but only after bending the knee and swearing fealty once more to the Iron Throne. As a guarantee of his loyalty, his only surviving son, Theon, was taken as a ward and hostage by Eddard and brought to Winterfell. After the Greyjoy Rebellion, the realm entered a period of outward peace, but schemes started to take place that would eventually change everything. King Robert had grown to dislike the very crown he had fought so hard to win. Many close to him say that after he became king, he changed and not for the better. Matters of coin, crops, and justice bored him, and he rarely attended meetings of the Small Council. When he did, he was often drunk. In the Iron Islands, tensions continued even after the failed rebellion. In 297 AC, Balon Greyjoy's brother Euron was exiled for seducing, or possibly forcing himself on his brother Victarion's wife, an act that nearly led to bloodshed between the brothers. Victarion killed his own wife to preserve his honor, while Euron departed to roam the seas, claiming to have traveled a distant and forbidden land such as Asshai and the ruins of Valyria. King Robert's personal life was no more stable than his rule. Though he loved his supposed son and heir Prince Joffrey, he felt little genuine connection to the boy. Joffrey's nature disturbed him, where at one point the young prince cut open a pregnant cat to see the kittens inside, leading Robert to strike him so hard he knocked out 2 of his teeth. Meanwhile, Robert would constantly have sex with other women, fathering countless bastards across the realm. Stannis had grown increasingly suspicious of the royal children's true parentage, noting that all of Robert's known bastards shared his black hair and blue eyes, while Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen had the golden features of the Lannisters. Stannis began to suspect the truth. He expressed his concerns to Jon Arryn, and together they quietly investigated, visiting Robert's bastards and examining genealogical records. Eventually, Jon found out the truth, but before he could act on this discovery, he suddenly died from an illness, with Stannis believing that Cersei had killed him to prevent him from exposing the truth. In reality, Jon's wife, Lysa Arryn, manipulated by Petyr Baelish, had poisoned him herself. Petyr provided the poison and convinced Lysa not only to commit the act, but also to send a letter to her sister Catelyn falsely accusing the Lannisters, setting in motion a chain of events that would destabilize the realm. While these conspiracies unfolded in the south, life in the north continued in relative isolation at Winterfell, where Eddard Stark ruled with honor. Jon Snow was raised alongside his half-siblings, trained in arms by Sir Roderick Cassel, and educated by Maester Luwin. He formed especially close bonds with Robb and Arya, often playing and training together, though he remained aware of his status as a bastard. Jon idolized heroes of the past, such as Daeron the Young Dragon, and spent his childhood imagining himself as one of the great knights and kings of history. Robb, raised as heir to Winterfell, trained alongside Jon and later Theon Greyjoy, with the two of them eventually forming a close friendship. Sansa dreamed of knights and courtly life. Arya resisted traditional expectations. Bran explored the castle and climbed its towers, and Rickon was given lots of love. Ned remained very present in his children's lives, occasionally taking his sons hunting or involving Robb in matters of leadership, preparing him for the future. After thousands of years of bloodshed, ambition, prophecy, and power, everything led right to the beginning of a Game of Thrones. Without all of these events that came before, this world wouldn't feel as real as it does, and that's what makes it so special. The depth, the detail, the history, all brought together so seamlessly that it feels less like fiction and more like something that really happened. It's genuinely so mind-blowing. George R.R. Martin, thank you for creating not just a story, but a world people can truly lose themselves in. And to you, viewer, thank you for watching.